Arthur's breath caught in his throat. The moment the truth settled in, it struck him like a punch straight to the chest. Inside the dark sanctuary, every strange detail suddenly snapped into place. Sylvie wasn't just acting strange, she was being possessed. And not by just anyone. Agrona, the ruler of Alakreia himself. Before Arthur could even process the weight of that realization, Sylvie slowly lifted her head. But this wasn't Sylvie anymore. Her hair had turned a ghostly white, the color draining from it like life itself had been stripped away. Her eyes glowed with a terrifying crimson light, burning like embers in the darkness. Then came the smile, a slow, sinister curve that didn't belong to her. An eerie purple glow began spreading through the chamber, staining the air with unnatural mana. And then the sanctuary erupted. Magic exploded outward in a violent surge, and the massive doors slammed shut with a deafening boom. Arthur was trapped, alone, locked inside with the most dangerous being in the world. His hand shot up instantly. Mana gathered around his fingers as his voice cut through the tension. What did you do to Sylvie? His eyes sharpened. Is she safe? Agrona answered through Sylvie's body with unsettling calm. He assured Arthur that Sylvie was perfectly safe. What Arthur was seeing now was nothing more than a spell that had been planted inside her egg long ago. At the moment, Sylvie herself was merely asleep, buried deep within her own consciousness. Arthur didn't lower his guard. Instead, he raised it. With a flick of earth magic, stone rose from the floor, shaping itself into 2 chairs. One for him, one for the monster in front of him. Arthur sat down slowly, his gaze never leaving those glowing crimson eyes. Agrona chuckled. He actually thanked Arthur for the hospitality. Then, with casual amusement, he remarked that conversations always went more smoothly when the other person wasn't actively trying to kill him. Arthur's voice remained cold. Harming me while possessing my bond doesn't seem very effective. Agrona smirked. Hurting Arthur now, he said, would be pointless. With such a small body, he couldn't even use mana arts properly in this form. Then his expression changed. He leaned forward. The amusement faded from his eyes. This, he said, was an important conversation. Agrona admitted that he was glad Arthur was alone, for 2 reasons. First, he had no interest in dealing with Dicathen's leaders, though, he confessed, seeing the terror on their faces when they realized he could invade even the most secure place on the continent would have been entertaining. Arthur narrowed his eyes. And the second reason? Agrona suddenly laughed. Then he pointed directly at Arthur. You. Arthur froze. Out of the entire continent, Agrona found him interesting. The thought alone was enough to unsettle him. Why would someone like Agrona care about him? Agrona laughed again, clearly enjoying Arthur's discomfort. He told him to relax, joking that he had no intention of suddenly pinning him down, especially since it would look inappropriate in Sylvie's current form. Arthur's expression hardened. He admitted something. He had always imagined Agrona as some stereotypical tyrant, a dictator obsessed only with conquest and destruction. Agrona smirked. Arthur, he admitted, wasn't entirely wrong. But to his people, he had to appear far more dignified than that. Then the conversation shifted. Agrona began speaking about his past, and what he revealed was shocking. For generations, he had lived among humans in Alakreia. He had studied them, observed them, learned how lesser races changed. According to him, humans were fascinating because their morals shifted constantly. Hundreds of years ago, public executions had been treated as entertainment. Now, people considered them horrifying. Human ethics, right and wrong, justice and cruelty. All of it changed with time. And ruling humans, Agrona explained, meant adapting alongside those changes. Arthur's anger finally spilled over. He demanded to know what right and wrong meant to Agrona when his retainers had butchered Dicathen soldiers. But Agrona calmly countered. Dicathen had displayed Jagret's frozen corpse like a trophy. Neither side, he said, held the moral high ground. Arthur fell silent. A deeply disturbing realization began forming in his mind. Maybe Alakreia wasn't the slave empire he had always imagined. Agrona's smirk deepened. He had read Arthur's thoughts perfectly. Arthur found it strange that Agrona cared so much about lessers. After all, according to the Asuras, Agrona had been experimenting on humans long before his exile from Epheodus. Agrona's response was chilling. The best lies, he said, are half-truths. Arthur's heart pounded. Then Agrona asked a dangerous question. Had Lord Kezis ever told Arthur the real reason behind everything he had done? Arthur answered cautiously. Wasn't it to build an army powerful enough to defeat the Asuras? Agrona laughed. Did Arthur really believe he had simply woken up one day and decided to commit genocide against his own race? Arthur refused to accept it. No reason could justify such atrocities. Agrona sighed, disappointed. He said he should have expected Arthur to think exactly like Kezes. Then he asked Arthur to imagine something. What if he had been born without magic? How would everyone around him have treated him? He never would have entered Xyrus Academy, never stood among nobles, never become a lance. He would have been just another powerless laborer, ignored, forgotten. Agrona compared that to his own life. The Basilisk clan had been feared by other races, but among the Asuras themselves, they had been mocked, belittled, looked down upon. Even Lord Indrath, who had been willing to acknowledge a lesser like Arthur, had never truly acknowledged Agrona. Arthur immediately rejected the comparison. A tragic past did not justify experimenting on innocent lives. Agrona's response was ice cold. Do you cry for the ants you step on? For a moment, Arthur became certain this entire conversation was pointless. Then Agrona made an even more disturbing claim. His experiments had helped Alakria. Its people worshipped him, not out of fear, but as their savior. Arthur demanded proof. He accused Agrona of erasing history, wiping the memories of the people whose ancestors had been tortured and slaughtered. Agrona remained calm. He said those people should be grateful. Their sacrifices, according to him, had allowed future generations to prosper. And then Arthur understood something horrifying. Agrona truly believed he was right. Arthur asked him what exactly all those sacrifices had accomplished. Agrona finally revealed the answer. In Dicathen, only 1 in every 100 people could use magic. In Alakria, it was 1 in 5. Arthur froze. The difference was monstrous. The power gap between the two continents was far greater than he had imagined. Agrona smiled. At last, Arthur was beginning to understand. Arthur then asked the question that had been gnawing at him. What was Agrona's true goal? Was he trying to bring Arthur to his side? Agrona laughed softly. Then he began revealing even darker truths. He reminded Arthur of the attack on his parents at the wall. They had survived only because Agrona had allowed it. Arthur stood frozen. Then came another devastating revelation. The Asuras had abandoned Dicathen. Agrona explained that Aldir and Winsome had attempted to infiltrate his stronghold, but had been caught. Arthur immediately assumed that meant the treaty had been broken. But Agrona revealed the truth. A secret deal had been made. The Asuras would no longer interfere in this war. Winsome, Aldir, all of them, gone. Arthur felt his entire world begin to collapse. Then Agrona made his offer. Having Arthur willingly join him would be ideal. But for now, he only wanted one thing. Arthur needed to leave the war, disappear, hide. He could even live peacefully in Alakria. The only condition, he must never stand against Agrona's army. Agrona added that until now he had deliberately avoided unnecessary civilian casualties. And Arthur himself had barely survived what had already happened. This, he warned, was only the beginning. Then came the question that cut deepest. What were the odds that Arthur's side could actually win? And even if they somehow did, what guarantee was there that his loved ones would survive to see it? But if Arthur accepted the deal, his family would remain safe. Everyone he cared about would be protected. Agrona told him to think it over. He would leave a spell within Sylvie's body so Arthur could deliver his answer later. But he warned him to choose quickly. The war was moving into its next stage, and it would not benefit Arthur's side. Arthur's eyes narrowed. Then he asked the question that had haunted him from the beginning. Why had Agrona said that Arthur was the only person on the entire continent who interested him? A terrifying smile spread across Sylvie's face. Her crimson eyes glowed brighter. And then Agrona finally revealed the truth. He said he had enjoyed speaking with an old friend. The next words froze Arthur where he stood. King Grey. Arthur's mind went blank. His greatest secret. His past life. The truth he had never spoken aloud. The most dangerous being in the world knew everything. And with that, Agrona left. The crimson glow faded. The sinister aura vanished. And moments later, Sylvie awakened. The scene shifts to the battlefield. Massive footsteps thunder through the forest, each impact making the earth tremble beneath the soldiers' feet. Then, out of the suffocating darkness, a colossal beast emerges, its monstrous roar ripping through the night so violently that the very air seems to shake. It crashes headfirst into a wall of glowing green magic shields. Crack! The barrier splinters under the force. Behind it, the Alacrian army stands in formation, spears raised, bodies tense, every soldier prepared to die if ordered. At the front of the line stands their commander, a blond man clad in red and black armor, arrogance practically radiating from him. "For the great Vritra!" he shouts, voice booming across the chaos. "Hold the line." The ground trembles harder. Then suddenly, from the darkness behind the beast, an entire swarm of mutated monsters bursts forward like a living nightmare. The commander's expression sharpens. "Don't let a single one stray from the pack," he orders coldly. It was troublesome enough leading them all the way from the northern beast glades. Among the horde, a massive armored insect-like monster forces its way toward the front, its jagged shell gleaming beneath the dim light. But the commander only smirks. To him, this isn't a war. It's an opportunity. He glances back at the trembling subordinate behind him. "Ashton," he says, voice dripping with disdain. "Can you see anything inside the forest?" Ashton stammers, barely able to steady his voice. "Sir, the fog. It's blocking everything." A slow, cruel smile spreads across the commander's face. "Then you'll be coming in with us." Before Ashton can even protest, he's violently yanked forward by the collar. "You sentries always act like you're special because of your little voyeuristic tricks," the commander sneers. "Today you learn your place." Ashton freezes, completely powerless to resist. A mental link suddenly activates between them, glowing violet rings pulsing faintly as the connection locks in place. "Report only to me," the commander says coldly. "And try not to be useless." He tosses a small pouch into Ashton's chest. "Mask your scent with that powder, unless you'd rather let the beast tear you apart." And in the very next moment, boom, the earth shatters. The beast horde crashes through the outer edge of Elshire Forest. The invasion has begun. A pleased grin curls across the commander's face. If this mission succeeds, he'll finally earn entry into the Obsidian Vault and claim an emblem just like his father. His ambition burns hotter than the battlefield itself. Once he gets his hands on a true crest, a legendary Defilith, House Vale will rise above every bloodline in Alakria, even above his father. Move forward, he commands. Inside the forest, the elven soldiers stand their ground, silver armor glinting faintly through the thick fog. Then chaos erupts. A beast lunges out from the shadows and sinks its teeth straight into an elven soldier's neck. A scream tears through the forest. Blood sprays across the ground. In an instant, the battlefield descends into pure carnage. Steel clashes. Magic explodes. Bodies fall. From the rear lines, the blonde commander watches everything unfold with cold amusement. What catches his eye, however, is something unexpected. Even the weaker elven mages are using strangely versatile spells to hold the line. But he doesn't care. To him, this is still nothing more than a stepping stone, a chance to raise his status, his bloodline, his name. Then suddenly, dark arrows rain down from above. An elven commander steps into view, a female mage desperately holding the line with wind magic. The commander's eyes instantly lock onto her. There, that's the real target. Shields on me, he orders sharply. Everyone else fall back. Then his gaze cuts toward Ashton. You stay close. If I'm in danger, relay it immediately. A massive flaming sword erupts into his hand. In the next instant, he vanishes. The battlefield blurs behind him as he dashes forward at insane speed. His blade crashes down. The elf barely blocks in time with a windshield. Sparks explode on impact. He clicks his tongue in irritation. Too slow. He launches into a relentless assault, every strike faster and heavier than the last. Inside his mind, Ashton's voice trembles through the mental link. Her mana readings are strange, but she's only mid-tier. Wait, duck! The commander drops instantly. A massive green blast tears through the air above his head. His eyes widen. That would have killed him. Now he's irritated. This fight has gone on long enough. He raises his blade again. Ashton's panicked voice rings out once more. From the right, he dodges immediately and in the same motion hurls his flaming sword toward the elf. She barely avoids it. The blade slams into the ground, and then, boom, a violent explosion of fire engulfs the battlefield. In the very next second, the commander appears in front of her and drives a brutal strike into her stomach. She's blasted backward, crashing hard into the ground, completely defeated. The commander walks toward her slowly, sword resting on his shoulder, a smug grin spread across his face. Pathetically easy. Then everything stops. The air turns deathly still. The sounds of battle vanish. His body locks. His eyes widen. Fear. Pure, uncontrollable fear. Ashton? But this time, Ashton isn't calm. He's screaming inside the link. Stefan, run! Run now! Stefan's knees buckle. His body trembles violently. He can't breathe. It feels as if something invisible is crushing his very soul. I'm the heir of House Vale. I can't lose. Slowly he looks up and sees him. A figure standing silently amidst the burning forest, unmoving, terrifying. Arthur Leywin, dark red hair sways in the wind. A heavy cloak drapes over his shoulders, and his eyes, cold enough to freeze the world itself. Stefan's mind shatters. How is he my age? Arthur says nothing. He simply raises one hand. Ice mana erupts. In an instant, frost explodes across Stefan's body, freezing him alive where he stands. A scream of pure agony rips out of him as he collapses into the dirt, completely helpless, completely broken. This wasn't supposed to happen. Silence returns. The battlefield is over. Moments later, an elven commander approaches. Lena Amaris, leader of the eastern unit of Elenoir. She bows her head slightly. Thank you, General Arthur. You saved us. But Arthur doesn't smile. His expression remains cold. I was late. His eyes sweep across the battlefield. The dead, the wounded, the destruction. A shadow of regret flickers through him. All of this could have been avoided if he had arrived sooner. Then a voice echoes in his mind. Agrona's voice. The war is entering its next stage, and this time it won't favor you. Arthur's fist clenches. He understands now. This is only the beginning. Then his gaze sharpens, turning cold and ruthless. He points towards Stefan's frozen body. Take him. A brief pause. Make sure he doesn't die. His eyes darken. And make sure he doesn't kill himself. His voice turns ice cold. I need him alive. Deep within the forest, inside a glowing magical dome, the air felt heavy and suffocating, thick with tension and the lingering scent of blood and smoke. At the center of the tent, the blonde Alacrian captain was bound tightly to a wooden chair. The ropes dug cruelly into his wrists and shoulders as he thrashed violently, panic overtaking every trace of his former arrogance. Where is my arm? Stefan's voice cracked, his eyes wide with raw terror. Answer me! Someone answer me! The tent flap shifted. Arthur stepped inside. For a split second, Stefan froze. Then pride rushed back to fill the cracks fear had left behind. He lifted his chin, forcing arrogance into his trembling voice. I am Stefan Vale of the Bloodvale family, he snapped. If you know what's good for you, you'll untie me immediately. Arthur's hand whipped across Stefan's face with brutal force, snapping his head sideways. The sharp sound echoed through the tent. Stefan gasped, stunned, his cheek instantly burning. You slapped me? He slowly looked up, rage and fear shaking through his voice. What's your name? I'll make sure you... Arthur moved before he could finish. His hand clamped around Stefan's throat, cutting the words off. I don't think you understand where you are, Arthur said quietly. Yellow lightning began to crackle around his fingers. Stefan's confidence shattered instantly. Well, wait. What are you doing? Stop. Inside Arthur's mind, Agrona's voice echoed like poison. Do you feel pity for the ants you step on? Arthur's eyes turned completely cold. No hesitation, no mercy. Lightning exploded through Stefan's body. The tent was swallowed in blinding light as Stefan's scream tore through the air. Raw, desperate, and utterly broken. When the light faded, he slumped forward in the chair, smoke rising from his skin as his body trembled uncontrollably. Arthur looked down at him, expression unreadable. That, he said coldly, was nothing. His hand sparked again. Stefan's breathing collapsed into panicked gasps. No, wait, please, he cried. I'll tell you anything you want. Arthur grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him upright. I won't kill you if you cooperate, he said, voice flat and terrifyingly calm. How you are treated depends entirely on how honestly you answer. Stefan nodded frantically. Arthur began. Your name, Stefan Vale. Your family. Stefan swallowed hard. Lucia Vale, my sister. Isora Vale, my mother. Karnal Vale, my father. Arthur paused. Karnal Vale. The name stirred something from the memories he had seen through Uto. Then his eyes sharpened. What is the awakening process? Stefan answered quickly, desperate to avoid another shock. It unlocks a child's first mark, allows them to become a mage. Arthur's voice remained steady. What's the difference between a mark and a crest? Stefan hesitated. How did he know this much? A crest is stronger, he said carefully. It grants deeper control over a specific magic type. Arthur gave no reaction, though inwardly he understood the best way to get answers was to make Stefan believe this was merely confirmation. What comes after marks and crests? Emblems, and then regalias. Arthur's gaze hardened. How strong are regalia users compared to retainers? Stefan's face paled. I don't know. I swear on Vritra. My family only has an emblem holder. Arthur noticed the reverence in his voice. They truly worship the Vritra like gods. How many emblem and regalia holders are currently in Dicathen? Stefan swallowed. My commander is an emblem holder serving under a regalia bearer, but I don't know exact numbers. Arthur exhaled slowly. Too low level. Not useful enough. Stefan saw the shift in Arthur's eyes. Panic surged through him. Wait, he blurted out desperately. I know something else. Arthur stopped. We weren't the only force attacking, Stefan said, voice trembling. Other troops are moving north right now. Arthur's expression darkened. That mattered. Stefan's voice broke completely. I told you everything. You promised. Please, just let me go. Arthur slowly turned his head toward him. A faint, cold smile touched his lips. I said I wouldn't kill you. Outside the tent, several captured prisoners lay tied on the ground. One of the soldiers straightened and saluted. Arthur didn't even look back. Dispose of him however you want. Stefan's face drained of all color. Arthur stepped out into the forest, the shadows swallowing him whole. As he walked, his thoughts drifted. Should I have told the council about Agrona? No one knew, only him and Sylvie. And even with Sylvie, hiding his thoughts had become far more difficult now that their bond had deepened. He hoped she was adapting to her new body and abilities. For Arthur himself, even controlling his dragon's will had become far easier after reaching the White Core. Still, leaving her at the castle had been the right decision. For now. Then Agrona's words crept back into his mind. You need to choose soon. The next stage of this war won't favor your side. Arthur remained silent. Then, darkness. His thoughts slipped backward. Back to Gray. Gray found himself tied to a chair beneath a blinding light. A voice emerged from the darkness. What's the last thing you remember? Gray blinked against the light. I just won the tournament. What happened next? I accepted an offer to be mentored by someone powerful. Two figures stepped from the shadows. One of them leaned forward. What was the woman's name? What was your relationship with her? Gray's mind raced. The fact that they already knew it was a woman meant they were only confirming details. I know her as Lady Vera, he said cautiously. I only met her there. Lies. A second man shouted from behind him. The other stopped him with a raised hand. What happened after you won? I was heading back to my dorm room. Suddenly, the man from behind lunged forward. His hand clamped around Gray's throat and lifted him from the chair. Who sent you? He snarled. What organization sent you to protect the legacy? Gray stared at him in complete confusion. He knew nothing about any organization, nothing about a legacy. The man threw him violently aside. Gray slammed into the ground and blacked out. When he awoke again, he was back in the chair. This time, one of the men stood in front of him holding 2 glass flasks. His expression darkened. If you really are who we think you are, then you've prepared for this. He uncorked 1 flask. But if we have the wrong person, his lips curled. This is going to be very uncomfortable. He rubbed the phosphorus-like liquid across Gray's chest. Gray struggled against the ropes. What are you doing? Then, flame ignited. Pain exploded across his body. A scream ripped from his throat, louder than anything he had ever made before. Please stop! But it didn't stop. Again, and again, and again. Burning. Then a pause, false hope, then fire again. The pain looped endlessly until his mind began to crack. I'll tell you everything, Gray screamed. The man leaned closer. Good. His voice turned calm. I'm going to tell you a story. He began listing everything. The orphanage, Headmaster Wilbeck, the academy. Then he leaned closer. Which military institution trained you to be the legacy's protector? Gray gasped through the pain. I just finished my second year at Withholm Military Academy. I had no prior training. The man's expression twisted with anger. So you defeated 2 trained KI combatants without previous training? I had help from my friends, but he was cut off. Why did Wilbeck allow the legacy to walk around in public with 2 ordinary children? Gray stared at him. What is this legacy you keep talking about? I've never heard of it. The man's face darkened. There are only 2 things I want to know. He raised the lighter again. Which organization sent you? And how deeply is the country of Traden involved by publicly revealing Lady Vera as your mentor? Gray kept repeating the truth. I don't know anything. The flame moved closer to his face. Just as it was about to touch him, boom, the door exploded inward. In a single flash, blood sprayed across the room. Both men dropped before they could even react. Gray's eyes widened. Tears of relief spilled down his face. A familiar figure stepped through the doorway. Calm, composed, Lady Vera. She looked down at him softly. You're safe now. The scene snapped back to the present. High above the blood-soaked earth, Arthur cut through the sky like a blade. The sensation of flying still felt almost unreal, even now. The wind rushed past him in fierce currents, tearing at his cloak as he sliced through the clouds, sharp eyes scanning the horizon below. Far beneath him, the endless stretch of forest faded into mist and shadow. He had already left Lena and the elven forces behind, fully trusting General Aya to stabilize the situation in the beast glades. With the forest secured for now, there was no reason for him to remain. He should be heading back to the castle. By now, the transmission scroll should already be carrying the critical information he had extracted from the Alacrian prisoner. And yet, something felt off. The sky felt empty. Arthur exhaled slowly. Without Sylvie flying beside him, the silence felt heavier than it should have. He knew she would be worried. After everything that had happened, she would probably assume he had been dragged back into the nightmares of his past life again. For a moment, the image of the tortured prisoner flashed through his mind. Dark, brutal, unforgiving, the memory sat heavily in his chest. He forced it down. He would explain everything to Sylvie later. Right now, there was only one place he needed to be. Then suddenly, Arthur dropped. The clouds tore apart around him as he descended, revealing the chaos below, the wall, a massive fortress stretching across the landscape like an iron spine, standing between survival and complete annihilation. Below it, war raged. Explosions ripped across the battlefield. Steel clashed in relentless waves. The roars of mana beasts shook the air. Alacrian forces hammered endlessly against the defenses, like a tide that refused to break. Arthur's eyes narrowed. He had read the reports, but seeing it with his own eyes was something entirely different. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a storm. A stray arrow suddenly shot toward him from below. A soldier's voice shouted in alarm, mistaking him for an enemy descending from the sky. Arthur deflected the projectile effortlessly with a flick of wind mana. Without slowing, he dove. Like a meteor, flames wrapped around his body as he plummeted straight toward the fortress. Then, boom. He crashed into the courtyard in an eruption of fire and force. A massive shockwave blasted outward, kicking up smoke and dust across the stone ground. By the time the haze began to clear, a captain had already dropped to one knee before him. "Forgive us, General." His voice shook with panic. "I am Captain Albinth Kelris of the Bulwark Division. My archer mistook you for an enemy descending from above." Arthur stood calmly as the smoke settled around him. A faint smile touched his lips. "It's been a while since someone treated me like an enemy." The captain visibly paled. "Sir, I'll have him punished immediately." Arthur raised a hand, stopping him. "No need," he said evenly. "I came from the beast glades unannounced." It was a natural reaction. Then his gaze shifted toward the trembling archer standing nearby. "Good aim," Arthur said calmly. "But next time, report first." The soldier immediately snapped into a salute. "Yes, sir." Arthur turned back to the captain. "What's your name and rank?" "Captain Albinth Kelris, sir." Arthur nodded. "Good. Show me everything." Without delay, the captain led him deeper into the wall. They moved through massive stone corridors, wide enough for supply carts and troop formations. Albinth spoke as they walked. "The Bulwark Division is the backbone of the wall, sir. Blacksmiths, engineers, workers, repair crews, everyone here keeps the structure standing." Arthur glanced toward the passing workers hauling materials. "The stray attacks must keep you busy." The captain gave a tired nod. "Constantly. Repairs, reinforcements, supply checks. We file reports daily on structural damage, resource consumption, and defensive readiness." Arthur stepped out onto a high balcony and froze. Below him stretched something far beyond a simple fortress. A massive industrial system sprawled beneath the stone levels. Elevators moved up and down through enormous shafts. Chains groaned under the weight of cargo. Crates were hauled across platforms. Workers and soldiers moved in perfect coordination. Arthur stared. This is the wall? Even from above, it was staggering. This wasn't merely a fortress. It was an entire city built into the defense line. Captain Albinth gave a small smile. "Forgive the noise, sir. It can be overwhelming for those not used to it." Arthur let out a slow breath. "Overwhelming, yes," he admitted, "and impressive." A faint regret passed through him. "I should have visited sooner." The captain nodded. From this level onward, several floors are also accessible to civilians. As they continued, passing soldiers snapped into formal salutes. The moment they recognized him, many stiffened in visible panic. "General," Arthur chuckled lightly. "Relax. A normal salute is enough." Then a sudden wave of heat hit him. Arthur stopped mid-step. "Is there a fire somewhere?" Albinth smiled. "We're passing the main forge." Arthur looked down over the railing. His eyes widened. A gigantic molten chamber glowed beneath them. Massive metal pillars slammed rhythmically onto blazing steel. The sound thundered through the structure. Then he noticed something else. Mages. Several earth and gravity mages were lifting entire metal frames and machinery components with magic, dropping them with incredible force and precision. Arthur stared in stunned silence. It reminded him almost exactly of the old steam-powered hammers from Earth. A small smirk tugged at his lips. Even here, magic drove industry. Eventually, they exited the forge level and stepped into something Arthur hadn't expected at all. A marketplace. Loud, busy, alive. Merchants shouted prices. Soldiers bartered for gear. Civilians moved through the bustling streets. Arthur's eyes widened. This place is thriving. Captain Albinth nodded. There's no law-enforcing service here. Instead, the military pays adventurers to fight. He gestured toward the rows of shops. The merchants sell to them. Then the military taxes the merchants and cycles that revenue back into the war effort. Arthur looked around again. A self-sustaining war economy? A perfect loop. A faint smile appeared. Brilliant. They eventually reached the central courtyard. Ahead stood a massive command tent, heavily guarded and surrounded by armed officers. Captain Albinth stopped. "Perfect timing, sir. The strategy meeting is just beginning." He lowered his voice slightly. "The senior captain, division heads, and several commanders are already inside." Arthur gave a single nod, then stepped forward. The moment he entered, the room fell silent. A war room. Large maps spread across a central table. Colored markers indicating troop positions, supply routes, and enemy movement. Every eye in the tent turned toward him. At the head of the table stood a tall man with sharp features and piercing red eyes. His posture was composed, controlled. But there was something calculating in the way he looked at Arthur. The man spoke first. "Welcome, General Arthur Leywin." His voice carried calm authority. "It is an honor to finally have a lance here at the wall." He gestured toward an open seat, his gaze still cold and sharp. "I am Trotius Flamesworth." His expression remained unreadable. "Senior captain of the wall." High above the clouds, within the quiet stillness of the floating castle, a rare and fragile moment of peace unfolded, one untouched by the chaos consuming the world below. Ellie knelt on the smooth wooden floor, her hands stretched out in encouragement, a bright, patient smile on her face. "Come on, you can do it," she said softly. A few steps away stood Sylvie, still adjusting to her human form. Barefoot and unsteady, she wobbled slightly, her long white hair cascading over her shoulders. Frustration shimmered in her golden eyes as she shifted her weight, clearly struggling. "I can't," she muttered, her voice small but stubborn. Ellie didn't move any closer. "Just a few more steps," she urged again. "You have to try on your own." Sylvie frowned, puffing her cheeks in annoyance. "Then come closer," she complained. "No," Ellie replied, shaking her head gently. "You're doing great. Just keep going." After a moment, she tried again. One step, then another. Her movements were slow, careful, uncertain. But she was moving. Ellie's eyes lit up instantly. "That's it. You're doing really—" Before she could finish, Sylvie's foot slipped. She stumbled forward. Ellie lunged to catch her, but misjudged the distance. Both of them crashed onto the wooden floor with a heavy thud. For a brief second, they stared at each other in stunned silence. And then, without warning, burst into laughter. A simple moment, warm, carefree, a moment that felt impossibly distant from the war raging beyond the castle walls. Far away, that peace did not exist. Inside the war council at the wall, the air was thick with tension. Officers stood gathered around a massive circular map, voices low but urgent. Every movement carried weight, every word sharpened by the reality of war. At the head of the table stood Trotius Flamesworth, his sharp red eyes sweeping across the room with cold precision. A captain stepped forward, pointing toward marked positions. "Based on our latest reports, 5 units are stationed here, and 3 more advancing from the east." Trotius didn't nod. Instead, his gaze locked onto her. "Captain Kruer," he said flatly, "how accurate is your dungeon-clearing timeline?" Kruer hesitated slightly. "Fairly accurate, taking into account 1 week is too long." The interruption cut clean through the room. Arthur stood silently to the side, watching. Throughout the meeting, his attention never left Trotius. Every decision, every tone, every shift in posture, Arthur studied it all carefully. "The number of corrupted beasts is increasing," Trotius continued, voice steady and unforgiving. 4 days per dungeon. That's all we can allow." Kruer stiffened immediately. "Sir, rushing expeditions will increase casualties." Arthur could feel the tension tightening. He already carried a quiet bias against Trotius. From what he'd heard through Jasmine and Hester, from the reputation of the Flamesworth name, and seeing him now only made Arthur more wary. "Some of those dungeons have never been cleared," Kruer pressed. "Without proper caution, entire units could be wiped out." Arthur almost stepped in, but stopped himself. He wasn't here as Jasmine's friend. He was here as a lance. Trotius leaned forward slightly, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. The wall is our last line of defense. Silence settled over the room. If a soldier dies in the beast glades, their family remains safe. A pause. But if the wall falls, then the beasts and the Alacrian mages controlling them will move freely and slaughter everyone behind it. No one spoke. The order stands. 4 days. Arthur exhaled quietly. Cold. Ruthless. But not wrong. He didn't like the man, but he couldn't deny the strength in his leadership. The discussion shifted. Status of the Trailblazer Division? Trotius asked. Arthur's focus sharpened instantly. Tessia's division. A captain responded. They've secured a 4th tunnel, the longest so far. The entrance is hidden near a riverbank. Earth mages are reinforcing it. It should be ready for use within a week. Reduce the workforce by a quarter, Trotius ordered without hesitation. Begin night shifts. After losing a route last week, underground paths are our priority. Again, decisive, immediate. Teleportation gates? Trotius continued. Kruer answered, We've assigned only 1 scouting unit so far. Progress is slow. Arthur finally spoke. Teleportation gates? Trotius turned slightly toward him. The attacks are constant. Troops are deployed daily, he explained. Currently, the only way to reach the beast glades is through unstable underground tunnels. Slow, dangerous, and inefficient. He gestured toward the map. But with the new rail line connecting the wall to Blackbend City, we gain access to a teleportation gate. If we locate hidden gates within the beast glades, we can connect them, allowing instant troop movement. Arthur frowned slightly. And you're certain those gates exist? We're not, Trotius replied bluntly, which is why we're committing limited resources. Arthur's eyes drifted to the documents spread across the table. Ancient relics, teleportation gates, the floating castle, Zyrus City, remnants of an older age, massive stone arches carved with indecipherable runes, structures so advanced that entire cities had been built around them. Modern artificers could manipulate and connect them, but creating one from scratch was still far beyond reach. How are you tracking them? Arthur asked. Trotius answered without hesitation. They emit faint fluctuations of mana across all elements. Subtle enough to blend into the environment, difficult to detect. Arthur understood immediately. That wasn't just difficult. It was borderline impossible. Even with Realm Heart, isolating such faint deviations within the natural flow of ambient mana, while flying blindly across the beast glades, it could easily become a complete waste of time. Still, I understand, Arthur said calmly. Trotius inclined his head slightly. My apologies for making you sit through this, Lance Arthur. Arthur shook his head. Before we conclude, I'd like to share what I've learned about the enemy. Later, Arthur walked through the sprawling city built against the wall. On the surface, it looked alive. Merchants calling out, armor clanking, voices filling the air. But beneath it all, fear. It lingered in hurried footsteps, in guarded expressions, in forced conversations meant to feel normal. Everyone knew the truth. The war was right outside. A distant explosion shook the ground. No one reacted. They were used to it. Arthur moved through the crowd silently, his gaze scanning everything. A merchant called out, offering him boots, but Arthur ignored him. The fear was everywhere, and no one could hide it completely. His thoughts drifted back to the council. Alacrians. Their magic wasn't like Dicathen's. It was limited, but specialized, refined, dangerous in its own way. Assuming their limits could get people killed. He remembered Trotius's question. What stops a striker from forming a shield? And Kruer's concern. What if their abilities aren't truly limited? Arthur's answer had been simple. Don't rely on it blindly. Inform your commanders. Observe. Adapt. Understanding the enemy wasn't about certainty. It was about awareness. Even now, standing in the market, Arthur could tell they didn't fully believe him. Not yet. All he could do was hope the information would save lives when it mattered. A patrol marched past as civilians muttered complaints. They should send all soldiers to the beast glades. Arthur didn't react. He knew better. Concentrating all forces in one place was how wars were lost. He stepped away from the noise, slipping into the shadow of a massive stone archway. Darkness wrapped around him. His blue eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Cold, focused, unyielding. Time to get back to work. The freezing wind howled across an endless stretch of snow-covered wasteland, tearing through the caravan as if trying to rip it apart piece by piece. Heavy wagons creaked under their loads, wheels grinding against frozen earth as the convoy pushed forward through the blizzard. In the far distance, barely visible through the swirling haze, the massive silhouette of the wall loomed like a silent guardian. Inside one of the covered carts, Reynolds sat in tense silence beside Helen. The rattling of the wagon did little to mask the unease hanging between them. Every instinct honed through years of battle told them the same thing. Something wasn't right. Then it happened. The beast pulling their wagon shrieked, a sharp, panicked cry that cut through the storm. Reynolds moved instantly. Stay alert, he barked, but the warning came a second too late. A violent explosion tore through the snow ahead, flames erupting as the lead wagon was swallowed whole. Fire and debris scattered across the frozen ground. Another ambush, Reynolds roared, already drawing his weapon. As the smoke cleared, Angela's sharp eyes caught movement. There, in an instant, the twin horns snapped into formation. Angela raised her staff and a powerful green vortex spiraled outward, wind roaring as it formed a protective barrier around the caravan. The storm itself seemed to bend under her control. From within the blizzard, shadows descended. Alacrian assassins. They moved like phantoms, fast, precise, lethal. Protect the supplies, Reynolds shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Durden surged forward, slamming his foot into the ground as stone erupted upward, forming a defensive line that bought the others precious seconds. Helen moved next. With a swift motion, she leapt onto a rising pillar of ice, her bow already drawn, her eyes locked onto a target slicing through the air. Jasmine, moving with terrifying speed as glowing daggers spun from her hands like streaks of light. The assassin deflected them mid-air. Helen didn't hesitate. Arrows followed immediately, cutting through the storm. But before they could land, a massive shadow swallowed the battlefield. Another assassin descended from above, riding a monstrous winged beast. Before it could strike, Angela reacted. A sharp gust of wind sliced through the air, smashing into the creature's wings and sending it spiraling downward. It crashed violently into the snow. A jagged spike of stone erupted from beneath the beast, impaling it straight through the chest. Blood sprayed across the white snow. "Reynolds, stop him!" Helen shouted. Another assassin had already broken through, charging straight toward the supply wagons. Reynolds stepped forward without hesitation. His gauntlet ignited, flames roaring to life, wrapping around his arm like a blazing inferno. The assassin struck first, deflecting the attack and barking an order for Reynolds to move aside. Reynolds didn't budge. Above them, Helen's arrows rained down, forcing the assassin to raise a wind barrier. That moment was enough. Reynolds drew in all his strength. His fist burned brighter, like a falling star. Then he moved, a single devastating punch. The barrier shattered. The assassin was blasted backward, crashing into the snow as smoke rose from his chest. And just like that, silence. The storm howled again, but the battle was over. Reynolds stood there, breathing heavily, steam rising from his body. Then he looked up. A figure approached through the snow. Arthur, calm, unshaken, dragging a captured assassin by the collar as if it weighed nothing. "I left this one alive," Arthur said simply, "for questioning." He added almost casually that soldiers would be sent to retrieve the fallen beast for research. The veteran stared at him in stunned silence. Then Reynolds broke it, laughing loudly as he threw an arm around Arthur's shoulders. "Hard to believe sometimes," he said with a grin, "that you're a lance now." Not long after, the massive gates of the fortress groaned open. The caravan finally passed into safety. Arthur walked beside them, his gaze drifting toward his parents. Their movements flawless, every step, every reaction, perfectly in sync from years of fighting side by side. And yet, a quiet fear settled in his chest. How long can they keep this up? That night, warmth replaced the cold. Inside a crowded tavern, the tension melted into laughter, clinking mugs, and the comforting noise of life continuing despite the war. Reynolds leaned forward, studying Arthur carefully. "I can't even sense your core anymore," he admitted. "Just how strong did you get?" Arthur gave a small, calm smile. "I reached white core." For a moment, silence. Then the entire room erupted. Reynolds pulled him into a tight embrace, pride unmistakable in his voice as he laughed. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. Peace. Something he hadn't expected to feel again. They talked about Ellie, about home, about the letters that had grown fewer over time. That's when Arthur realized something. Ellie had barely been replying. Alice smiled softly, though there was a hint of concern behind it. "She's in that phase," she said gently. "Most of her replies are just, 'I'm okay,' or 'I'm alive.'" Arthur frowned slightly. He suggested visiting her, knowing that's what Ellie truly wanted. But Helen shook her head. "Security's tightened. Only high-ranking officials can use the teleportation gates now." Arthur immediately offered to take them himself. But Alice stopped him. "We don't want to burden you," she said. "A new transport system is being built. It'll be easier soon." Arthur didn't look convinced. His voice tightened. "The roads are getting worse. You were just attacked." Reynolds waved it off with a shrug. "No one got seriously hurt. And that was enough," Arthur snapped. "What about next time?" The room fell quiet. He reminded them. Jasmine, Durden. They had been knocked unconscious before. "I'm not the only one worried," Arthur said, his voice tightening. "Ellie is too." Silence settled heavily over the table. Angela stood abruptly. "I think I left something in the carriage." Helen followed her out without another word, giving them space. Alice looked at Arthur, calm but firm. "Our responsibilities may not be as great as yours," she said softly, "but we're still doing our part." Arthur shook his head, frustration bleeding through. "You're risking your lives." Alice's reply was gentle but unyielding. "So are you." "I can handle it," Arthur shot back. A sharp sound cut through the air. Reynolds slammed his hand against the table. His expression hardened. "Do you even hear yourself?" he said, voice burning. "You risk your life every day, but expect us to sit back and do nothing?" Arthur's voice cracked. "I'm fighting to protect you. What if you're not there next time?" he continued, emotion spilling over. "What if something happens? What if Ellie—" He stopped. Too late. Just like Adam, the name hung in the air like a blade. Reynolds' expression turned cold. "That's enough." His voice dropped, steady and sharp. "Protecting family matters," he said, locking eyes with Arthur. "But so does living with purpose." His tone hardened. "Dicathen might not be your only home, but it's ours." A pause. "And if fighting means dying so Ellie can live a better life, then so be it." Those words hit harder than any attack. Arthur had no response. None. His parents stood and walked away, leaving him alone at the table. His hands trembled. The wood beneath his grip cracked under the pressure. Everything inside him, fear, anger, helplessness, boiled over. In the next instant, he vanished. A massive shockwave tore through the tavern as Arthur shot into the sky, disappearing into the freezing darkness above. Arthur stood alone at the summit of a jagged mountain. The world stretched endlessly beneath him. Far in the distance, the city glowed like a sea of scattered stars, its lights flickering against the darkness of night. From up here, everything seemed quiet, distant, almost peaceful. But that peace didn't reach him. A sudden sound broke the silence. Stone shifted. Arthur's eyes narrowed as his gaze snapped toward the edge of the cliff behind him. A hand appeared, gripping the rock, fingers digging into the mountain's edge as someone pulled themselves upward. For a brief moment, Arthur tensed, caught off guard. Then a head peeked over the ledge. Seriously? It was Jasmine. She hauled herself up with a final push, brushing dust off her clothes as she straightened, clearly annoyed. "You could at least have some respect for people who can't fly," she said, exhaling sharply as she glanced around. "So this is where you ran off to last night?" Arthur blinked, slightly surprised. "We've been looking for you all day," she continued, crossing her arms. "And by the way, the inn owner is still panicking over the mess you left behind." Arthur let out a quiet breath, guilt flickering across his face. "I'll send something to make up for it," he said calmly. "A proper gift." Then after a pause, he looked at her. "How did you even find me?" Jasmine smirked faintly. "Don't underestimate your mentor." Arthur gave a small, knowing smile. "I never have." For a moment, the tension eased. Jasmine stepped closer, the wind tugging lightly at her hair as she studied him. "How long were you at the wall?" she asked. "I just arrived yesterday," Arthur replied. The air had grown colder, the mountain winds biting sharper as the night deepened. Without thinking, Arthur raised his hand slightly. A small flame flickered to life in his palm. The warmth spread subtly between them, pushing back the chill. Jasmine glanced at it, then back at him. "Did you meet my father?" Arthur nodded slightly. "I walked in on one of his meetings." He hesitated briefly. "Did you see him?" Jasmine let out a quiet, humorless breath. "No," she said. "Despite going back and forth to the wall so many times, I haven't even crossed paths with him once." There was no anger in her voice, just something quieter, more distant. She shook her head slightly, then looked back at Arthur. "I'm not going to pry into whatever happened at the inn," she said, her tone softening just a bit. "But there's something you need to understand." Arthur stayed silent, listening. "Your parents care about you. A lot," she continued. "About you and Ellie." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Every time your father meets someone new, he somehow finds a way to bring you up. Talks about his Lance son like it's the greatest achievement of his life." She rolled her eyes slightly. "It's kind of annoying, actually." Arthur couldn't help it. He smiled. "I know they care," he said quietly. Jasmine's expression shifted, her tone grew more serious. "That's not all." Arthur's smile faded slightly as he looked at her again. "No matter what they say, Reynolds and Alice still blame themselves," she said, "for Adam." The wind seemed colder now. "They feel guilty," Jasmine continued, "for not being there, for not being able to protect him." Arthur's gaze dropped slightly, his expression tightening. Jasmine didn't stop. "And don't forget what happened to your mother before you were born," she added. "What happened to Lenza? It broke her. She couldn't even use her magic properly for a long time. Not for anything beyond minor injuries." Arthur nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "That's exactly why I wanted them to stay at the castle, somewhere safe, away from all of this." His voice tightened, but instead, they chose to throw themselves right into the middle of it, traveling back and forth through dangerous territory like it's nothing. Jasmine watched him carefully. "What they're doing now," she said quietly, "it's not just for you and Ellie." Arthur looked at her again. "It's for themselves, too." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "They're trying to move past their mistakes, their fears. They want to become better, stronger, not just as fighters, but as parents." Arthur said nothing for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly. "I was being selfish," he admitted. The words didn't come easily, but they were honest. "Maybe," he continued, quieter now, "maybe all of us just need time to adjust." Jasmine gave a small nod. "Just don't let things end up like they did with me and my family," she said. Arthur frowned slightly. "There was a time we could have fixed things," she admitted, "but I kept running, and my father was too proud to reach out." Her gaze drifted briefly toward the distant city lights. "And now, that chance is gone." Silence settled between them. Then Arthur smiled faintly. "Thanks," he said sincerely. Jasmine snorted lightly. "You better be," she replied. "My jaw's starting to hurt from all this talking." Despite her words, neither of them moved. Instead, they stayed, and they talked about everything. Some stories were light, filled with laughter and old memories. Others were heavier, filled with things neither of them said out loud very often. Arthur told her about his time with the Asuras, about the battles he fought, about defeating a Vritra retainer. He even told her about Sylvie and her human form. Jasmine listened, occasionally reacting with disbelief or quiet amusement. Then she shared her own stories about the Twin Horns, their missions, their struggles. Time passed unnoticed. The night deepened. Eventually, Jasmine stood up, brushing herself off as she glanced toward the horizon. "I should head back," she said. Arthur nodded, rising slightly before stopping himself. "Jasmine?" She looked back. "Thanks for everything." For a moment, she just stared at him. Then she reached out and lightly patted his head. "Don't overthink it," she said. And with that, she turned and began making her way back down the mountain. Arthur watched her go until she disappeared into the darkness. Then he sat back down, alone once again. His eyes drifted upward toward the endless sky above. For the first time in a while, his thoughts felt quieter. Elsewhere within the castle, far removed from the tension of war councils and battlefield reports, the atmosphere was filled with warmth and sweetness. Inside the grand kitchen, a chief busily prepared an array of desserts for the evening meal. Plates of delicately crafted pastries lined the counters. Glazed tarts, layered cakes, and sugar-dusted confections that filled the room with an irresistible aroma. As he worked, carefully placing the finishing touches on a tray, something caught his attention. A faint movement. He paused. Slowly, he turned his head toward the side of the table. There, just barely visible, was a small head peeking out. Two black horns curved upward from it. Golden eyes shimmered with quiet fascination as they stared directly at the desserts. The chief blinked. The small figure froze. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it ducked out of sight. A little while later, Sylvie wandered through the castle halls, clutching a bag filled to the brim with stolen sweets. Her steps were uneven, slightly clumsy. "This is exhausting," she muttered under her breath. Her brows furrowed as she continued walking, clearly annoyed. Using mana just to walk? How does Arthur do this all the time? She adjusted her balance, taking another careful step, her movements still not entirely natural in her human form. As she turned a corner, voices drifted toward her from a nearby room. She slowed. "No, that sounds too desperate. Maybe something simpler." Sylvie tilted her head slightly, curiosity piqued. Quietly, she stepped closer and peeked inside. There, standing in the middle of the room, was Ellie. She was facing the empty doorway, posture stiff, clearly rehearsing something. "Welcome back, Arthur," Ellie said, trying to sound natural, only to immediately shake her head. No, that's weird." Sylvie stepped inside. "What are you doing?" Ellie jumped. Her entire body stiffened as she turned around, clearly flustered. "Nothing," she said quickly. Sylvie simply smiled, clearly unconvinced. "We should go," she said casually. "Arthur will be arriving soon." Ellie blinked. "Right." Not long after, the castle gates opened. Arthur stepped through, his presence immediately drawing the attention of the guards. They bowed respectfully as he passed. Standing off to the side, Ellie and Sylvie waited. The moment they saw him, they greeted him together. Arthur stopped in front of them, completely drenched. Water dripped from his clothes, his hair clinging to his face. Without hesitation, he spread his arms wide. Ellie immediately stepped back. "Nope," she said flatly. "You're soaked. We're skipping the hug." Arthur smiled and ignored her completely. He stepped forward and pulled her into a tight embrace anyway. Ellie protested, squirming slightly as she tried to push him away. Sylvie stood nearby, watching the interaction with quiet confusion. Arthur finally let go, turning his attention toward her. His eyes softened slightly. "You've grown," he said, studying her. "Looks like my fearsome dragon is turning into a healthy young girl." Sylvie didn't react to the compliment. Instead, she stared straight through him. "Did something happen?" Arthur paused for just a moment. Then he smiled. "We'll talk about it later." Before either of them could press further, he raised his hand. A gentle current of wind swirled around them. In seconds, the moisture evaporated. His clothes, and Ellie's as well, dried instantly. The three of them began walking toward the meeting room. Ellie, unable to hold back her excitement, immediately started talking. "I broke into the light red stage while you were gone," she said proudly. "I've been training with Boo every day." Arthur glanced at her, clearly impressed. "Even Commander Virion said I'm ahead of other conjurers my age," she added quickly. "At this rate, I might even skip the mandatory soldier training." Arthur listened quietly, but inside a thought lingered. She's getting bolder. The idea of Ellie wanting to join the war sat uneasily with him. What would Mom and Dad say? A faint sigh escaped him. He hadn't even gotten the chance to properly speak with them before leaving. Maybe, if they were here, she wouldn't be this eager. "Arthur!" Ellie's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. She continued excitedly. "Even Princess Kathleen has been helping me train. She spars with me and helps me with mana control." Arthur smiled faintly. "If you want, I can teach you myself," he said, "when I have time. I was a professor at Xyrus Academy, after all." Ellie frowned immediately. "Yeah, but only for a semester." Arthur blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ellie crossed her arms. "I feel like learning from you would just discourage me." "We're only 4 years apart," Ellie continued, "but you're already a white core mage with quadra-elemental magic." She looked away slightly. "If I trained under you, I'd just end up comparing myself." Sylvie suddenly chimed in. "Even among Asuras, Arthur's talent is considered abnormal," she said casually. "You shouldn't compare yourself to a freak like him." Arthur frowned. "Freak feels a bit harsh." Ellie shook her head. "No, that sounds about right." Arthur sighed quietly. After that, Ellie and Boo went their separate way, leaving Arthur and Sylvie to continue toward the meeting room. As they entered, a loud voice greeted them. Well, if it isn't the young Lance." Bund. Arthur glanced at him, noticing the exhaustion written all over his face. "The meeting took a toll on you," Arthur remarked. Bund let out a long groan. "I didn't even want to join this little club," he muttered. "But what can you do?" He shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable. "My backside hasn't hurt this much since my mother used to whip me as a child." Arthur almost smiled. One by one, the others arrived. Arthur greeted them as they took their seats. Queen Priscilla spoke first. "You You've arrived at a perfect time. King Glader followed. We've been waiting for your return. Your report requires discussion. Varian leaned back with a smirk. You didn't really think you'd get out of this meeting, did you? Arthur sighed. That's exactly why I sent a transmission scroll with all the details. Varian ignored the remark. The meeting began. Your report mentioned 2 separate but coordinated attacks near Elenoir, Varian said. Is that correct? Arthur nodded. It is. There's nothing further to add. King Blaine spoke next. Then we maintain current troop distribution and send reinforcements to Elshire Forest only when necessary. Queen Mariel immediately frowned. That implies you don't consider elven territory worth defending. Blaine's expression hardened. This was a minor incursion, he replied. Compare that to the daily assaults on the wall. Protecting Sapin takes priority. King Alduin's voice cut in. No one is arguing against defending Sapin, he said firmly. But elven soldiers are already stationed there. Shouldn't there be consistent defense for our own borders as well? Queen Priscilla spoke calmly. The forest itself is a defense. The mana fog has protected it for centuries. Those invaders would have gotten lost and died long before reaching any city. Alduin's restraint snapped. There are still tribes living outside the cities. His voice rose. By your logic, we should abandon Sapin's outer cities, too. Blaine slammed his hand down. That comparison is absurd. The tension in the room spiked instantly. Voices rising, arguments clashing, until... Enough! Varian's voice cut through everything like a blade. Silence fell. He looked at both sides, his expression sharp. We will not reduce ourselves to this. A pause. Then he spoke again, calm, controlled. Based on attack patterns, Sapin remains the primary target. The most direct path to major cities runs through the Grand Mountains and the Wall. He folded his hands. Maintaining priority there is the correct decision. Alduin said nothing. Even if it hurt, he understood. Varian continued. For Elenoir, we will reassign several Trailblazer units to southern dungeons. If another incursion occurs, they will surface and reinforce immediately. King Blaine gave a firm nod. The forest remains a natural defense. Alduin exhaled slowly and said nothing more, even if he wanted otherwise. This was the best decision for the continent. Deep within the veiled expanse of the Elshire Forest, where the fog twisted like a living maze and the air itself felt heavy with mana, a group of Alacrian soldiers moved with careful precision. At the center of the group, one soldier stood, with his palm pressed firmly against the bark of an ancient tree. His eyes were shut tight in concentration. Mana pulsed faintly from his body, seeping outward in controlled waves as he focused on something far more complex than a simple spell. Not far from him, another soldier shifted impatiently, glancing around at the dense fog that swallowed everything beyond a few meters. How much longer? He asked, his voice low but edged with tension. Your veiling barrier isn't going to hold forever. The soldier at the tree didn't respond immediately. His breathing grew heavier as he pushed more mana into the spell. The faint glow around his hand intensified, spreading slowly across the surface of the tree like creeping veins of light. Just a little more, he finally muttered, his voice strained. Covering this wide of an area? It's not easy. The others exchanged uneasy glances. They all understood the risk. The Elshire Forest wasn't just dangerous because of the beasts or the enemy. It was the forest itself. The mana-laden fog distorted perception, twisted direction, and drained even seasoned mages if they weren't careful. And yet, they were here, deliberately forcing their way through it. Suddenly, the glow surged. The mana coating the tree flared brightly for a brief moment, before settling into a steady, controlled pattern. Intricate lines of energy spread across the bark, forming a network that pulsed faintly. The soldier exhaled sharply, his knees nearly giving out as he pulled his hand away. It's done, he said, his voice hoarse but filled with relief. The process is complete. The moment the final surge of mana settled into the tree, one of the soldiers standing nearby let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Relief quickly turned into excitement, and a grin spread across his face. Finally, he said, almost laughing, now we can move on to the next phase. Not yet. The mage Circe cut him off instantly, his voice calm but firm. Though exhaustion weighed heavily on his body, his eyes remained sharp, focused. There's still one final point left to unlock. The brief spark of celebration died just as quickly as it had appeared. Without wasting another second, Circe stepped forward and crouched, pressing his palm flat against the cold, damp ground. His fingers dug slightly into the soil as he began channeling mana once more. This time, however, the flow was different, deeper, more concentrated. A low hum began to resonate beneath them. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable. Then it grew. Mana waves rippled outward from the point of contact, spreading through the earth like invisible shock waves. The ground beneath their feet trembled subtly, as if something ancient had been stirred awake. Suddenly, a sphere of shimmering mana burst into existence, enclosing the 3 soldiers within its boundary. At the same time, glowing lines etched themselves across the forest floor, connecting the points they had established earlier. One line, then another, and finally the last. A perfect triangle formed beneath them, each corner pulsing with faint, synchronized energy. Circe exhaled slowly, pulling his hand away as the structure stabilized. realized. The 3-point array is complete, he said, his voice quieter now but laced with satisfaction. One of the others let out a low whistle, clearly impressed. Not bad, he muttered. You actually pulled it off. Another quickly stepped in, his tone more urgent. Then we shouldn't waste time. If any elves pick up even a trace of this, we're finished. Cersei gave a small nod. He closed his eyes again, but this time, not to cast. Instead, he searched. His senses stretched outward, weaving through the dense, mana-saturated fog of the Elshire forest. Every fluctuation, every distortion in the ambient mana brushed against his awareness. It was like trying to read ripples in a storm-tossed ocean. Chaotic, unstable, and incredibly difficult to interpret. For a few tense seconds, no one spoke. Then slowly, Cersei lifted his hand and pointed. That way. The others didn't question him. They moved immediately. The deeper they traveled into the forest, the heavier the fog became. What had once been a hazy obstruction now thickened into something almost tangible, clinging to their skin, distorting their vision. Shapes warped at the edges. Sounds carried strangely, echoing from directions that didn't make sense. Time itself seemed to lose meaning. One of the soldiers exhaled quietly, his voice low, almost to himself. How long has it been since we started this mission? No one answered, because none of them knew. They continued forward, marking trees along the way, each one carefully etched with faint traces of mana, subtle enough to avoid detection, but strong enough to guide their return. But as they moved deeper, the forest began to change. The first body appeared without warning, a fallen soldier half buried beneath roots and leaves, his armor torn apart. Then another, and another. Corpses of their own forces littered the paths ahead, silent reminders of how many had already failed. The group didn't stop. They couldn't. Each step forward carried them past more of the dead, deeper into territory that felt increasingly hostile, increasingly alive. Then, stop. The command came sharp and immediate. All three froze. Just ahead of them, partially obscured by fog, the ground dropped away into a massive pit. Jagged spikes jutted upward from its depths, twisted into unnatural shapes. One of the soldiers stepped closer, narrowing his eyes. Those aren't natural, he said quietly. Those spikes, they've been shaped. Plant magic, another muttered. A tense silence followed. Then suddenly, you said this path was safe. The accusation snapped toward Cersei like a blade. He didn't react outwardly, but irritation flickered beneath his calm expression. There's no such thing as a completely safe path here, he replied evenly. We needed to move. Now we stop, and I find another route. The tension lingered, but no one argued further. They turned, shifting direction once again. As they moved, Cersei's thoughts grew heavier. Navigating the forest alone was already difficult, tracking mana fluctuations, maintaining hidden arrays, staying undetected, but doing it while being questioned, doubted. It made it harder to focus, more frustrating. Still, he pushed forward, because failure wasn't an option. Eventually, they came to a halt in a relatively open patch of ground. Rest, one of them said. No one argued this time. They sat pulling out rations, the silence between them filled only by the distant whisper of the forest. One of them broke the quiet. We didn't place as many arrays as planned today, he said, chewing slowly, but we've made it deeper than expected. Cersei nodded faintly. It's harder than it looks, he replied. Even the smallest mana leak, and the elves will detect it immediately. Every array has to be perfect. Still, another voice cut in, sharper this time. We could have gone further if you weren't so slow. Cersei didn't respond. Before the tension could rise again, a more energetic voice broke through. Hey, relax, Cole. He leaned forward with a grin, holding out a piece of food. Here, I saved the biggest piece for you. Cersei hesitated for a moment before taking it. Each of them treated him differently. Criticism, praise, encouragement, and somehow all of it irritated him. Cole turned toward another member of the group. Fane, you too, he said. Don't act like you don't need rest. Fane didn't even look up. I'd rather finish the mission, he replied coldly, than sit around wasting time. Cersei watched them quietly. He had only joined this team a few weeks ago. The others had trained together for years. Their coordination, their understanding of each other, it was built over time, through countless missions. He wasn't supposed to be here. If their previous sentry hadn't died, if he hadn't awakened his emblem at that exact moment, he would still be somewhere else. Not here, not carrying this burden. A soft voice cut through his thoughts. We can't go any deeper safely, said the purple-haired girl, her tone firm. Not until Cersei's emblem recovers. Her words settled heavily in the air, because everyone knew what that meant. The success of this mission depended on him. Cersei lowered his gaze slightly, the weight pressing down harder than before. One of the others exhaled, trying to ease the tension. We're not the only team out here, he said. Maybe another group has already secured a route. Maybe. But no one looked convinced, because deep down, they all knew. If they failed here, there might not be another chance. For a brief moment, silence settled over the group. No one spoke, and no one moved. Yet, despite the tension, one truth lingered clearly in all of their minds. Out of every team sent into the Elshire Forest, they were the ones most likely to succeed. Not because they were the strongest, not because they were the most experienced, but because of Cersei. Even with his lack of field experience, his emblem granted them an overwhelming advantage, something no other team possessed. It allowed them to navigate the impossible, to see through what others could not. The only problem was its limitation. After using it, Cersei would need nearly an entire day before he could activate it again. A single use, a single chance, and everything depended on how well he used it. Cersei exhaled slowly, steadying his thoughts. I'll do it now. The others immediately went quiet, their attention snapping toward him. Closing his eyes, Cersei reached inward, past the exhaustion, past the pressure, and activated his emblem. A faint glow pulsed from his body. Then, something separated. A ghostly figure, pale and translucent, slipped out from him like a shadow peeling away from its source. It hovered for a brief second before drifting forward, silent, undetectable. None of the others could see what it saw, but they could feel the shift in the air. Cersei's voice came low, controlled. The mastery of true sense allows me to perceive all 4 elemental mana particles, he explained. But for this, I only need wind. The spectral form surged forward. It moved through the forest like a whisper, gliding past trees, slipping through dense fog, crossing terrain that would have taken hours, no, days, for a physical body. Everything was laid bare before it, the flow of mana, the subtle disturbances, the faint trails left behind by life and death. Then, a structure, small, faint, but unmistakable, a town. The ghostly figure lingered for only a moment before retreating, racing back through the same path it had taken. Cersei's eyes snapped open. He inhaled sharply, his body tensing as the connection snapped back into place. For a brief second, the world seemed disoriented, blurred. Then it stabilized. Well? One of them asked immediately. Did you find anything? Cersei nodded, still catching his breath. The kingdom is still too far from here, he said. But I found something else. All eyes were on him now. A large area, dense with mana fluctuations, he continued. About a day's travel from our current position. Relief spread through the group almost instantly. So we're on the right path, someone muttered. All of this wasn't for nothing, another added quietly. For the first time since entering the forest, a sense of direction returned. Fane, the black-haired soldier, crossed his arms and gave a faint smirk. Well, he said, his tone laced with dry sarcasm. Looks like that Millview bloodline of yours isn't completely useless after all. His gaze sharpened slightly. I was starting to doubt it. Before Cersei could respond, the ground trembled. A sudden, violent shake rippled through the forest. All of them snapped into motion instantly, weapons drawn, mana rising. Cersei's senses expanded reflexively, scanning the surroundings. 3, he said quietly. The others tensed. Elves, he added. The air grew heavy. They weren't alone anymore. The scene shifted. Back inside the castle, within the War Council chamber, the atmosphere was just as tense, though far more controlled. Arthur stood before the gathered leaders, his expression calm but firm. Now that the matter of the Elenoir forest has been addressed, he began, I'd like to update the council on the information I've gathered from recent interrogations. The room quieted. All attention turned toward him. Arthur didn't hold back. He explained everything, from the rune-based systems of power to the structured hierarchy of marks, crests, emblems, and regalias, from their methods of awakening to their combat styles on the battlefield. When he finished, a brief silence followed. Virion was the first to speak. It seems, he said slowly, we've been underestimating the Alacrian mages until now. King Blaine frowned slightly at that. Underestimating, he questioned. Learning that their magic has limitations only proves we've been overestimating them. King Alduin nodded in agreement. It clearly exposes a weakness in their tactics, he added. But before the discussion could settle in that direction, Boone spoke. It's not that simple. His voice cut cleanly through the room. On the surface, it might seem like a weakness, he continued. But based on Arthur's findings, their methods of awakening and training are far more advanced than ours. The room stilled again. Bund leaned forward slightly. This is speculation, he admitted, but with their system of marks and crests, Alacrian mages appear to hyper-specialize. He paused briefly, letting the idea sink in. They dedicate their entire lives to a single spell, refining it, evolving it, perfecting it. A few expressions shifted. In contrast, Bund continued, Dicathen mages learn a variety of spells within their elemental affinities. He shook his head slightly. But on the battlefield, a soldier who is exceptional at one thing can be far more dangerous than one who is merely versatile. Far away, deep within the forest, Cersei's team proved that exact point. The moment the elves revealed themselves, the Alacrian soldiers moved in perfect synchronization. Each one used a single spell, but together they became deadly. One controlled the field, another disrupted movement, the third delivered the finishing blow. In mere seconds, it was over. The elven mages didn't stand a chance. Back in the council chamber, the weight of Boone's words settled heavily. Silence followed. Then, we need to distribute this information immediately, Boone said. To our captains, to the guilds, to the military academies. Arthur spoke calmly. I've already stopped by the wall, he said. The captains there have been informed. Virion nodded. Good, he said. Then we move to the next phase. Deployment strategy. Just as Arthur expected, The calm didn't last. The room erupted into debate once more. Voices rose. Arguments clashed. Each leader pushing for resources, for priority, for control. Bun made his position clear. He and his loyalists would take charge in Darv, he declared, and root out Alacrian supporters from within. But the situation was already escalating faster than expected. Reports continued to arrive. The Alacrians had begun using underground tunnels to move their forces toward the Darv-Sappan border. Their ships had been sighted along the western shores of Sappan. Cities like Telmore, Etistan, and Mayburn were now being forced to build defenses on both sides, east and west, because if the wall fell, there would be nothing left to stop the invasion. And for the first time, it became painfully clear. This war was no longer confined to a single front. It was spreading everywhere. A heavy silence lingered in the council chamber, but it didn't last. King Alduin rose once more, his expression tense, yet controlled, though the strain beneath it was impossible to miss. "We need to reconsider the situation in Elenoir," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "With the recent incursions from the Beast Glades, it's no longer unreasonable to assume that the Alacrian forces stationed in the north may begin shifting east toward our territory." His words settled heavily over the room. The possibility wasn't far-fetched. If the enemy truly intended to open multiple fronts, then Elenoir, protected for so long by its natural defenses, could soon become a primary target. After a brief exchange of glances and murmured discussion, the council reached a temporary decision. "Elder Camus and Aya will survey the southern borders first," Virion announced. "No full deployment until we confirm the scale of the threat." It was cautious, measured, but necessary. Virion then straightened slightly, attempting to steady the atmosphere. "This is only temporary," he reassured. "Once Lord Aldir and the Asuras re-establish contact, we'll have clearer direction." That was the moment Arthur's expression shifted. Subtly, but enough. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Agrona's voice, his words, his warning. Arthur inhaled slowly before speaking. "That won't happen." The room stilled. Every gaze turned toward him. Arthur met their eyes, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that immediately drew attention. "The Asuras won't be contacting us again," he said. "Not for this war." Confusion flickered across several faces. Then tension. Arthur continued. "They've made a pact," he explained. "They are no longer allowed to interfere in Dicathen, in any capacity." For a moment, no one reacted. Then, Virion's composure shattered. He rose abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "That's impossible," he snapped, anger flashing in his eyes. "It wasn't enough that they dragged us into their war, used us as pawns for their own purposes." His voice tightened. "And now, they break their own treaty to attack the Vritra, and fail?" The weight of that failure hung in the air. Virion's expression darkened further as he processed the implications. "They couldn't even succeed," he muttered. But it wasn't just that. Arthur had revealed more, far more. 1 in 5, Virion said slowly, almost to himself. 1 out of every 5 people in Alacria is a mage? The sheer scale of it was staggering. His gaze snapped back to Arthur. "What else did Agrona say?" he demanded. Before Arthur could answer, Queen Marial spoke, her voice sharp with suspicion. "And more importantly," she added, "how did you receive this message in the first place?" The question cut straight to the core. Arthur didn't hesitate, but inside his thoughts moved carefully. He couldn't tell them the truth. Not about Sylvie, not about Agrona taking control of her body. Not yet. Sylvie doesn't even fully understand what happened, he thought. And if the council learns the truth now, it will only complicate things further. Outwardly, his expression remained unchanged. Agrona temporarily possessed one of the captured Alacrian soldiers, Arthur said calmly. He used that connection to relay his message. The explanation was clean, believable, and most importantly, safe. No one questioned it immediately. Arthur continued before doubt could take root. "He used the failed assault by the Asuras as leverage," he said. "With that, he forced a condition that severed all communication between them and Dicathen." The room grew quieter, heavier. Bund exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "At least that explains something," he said. "Why he hasn't deployed more scythes or retainers." His gaze lifted slightly. "He's keeping his strongest forces close," he added, "preparing in case the Asuras try something again." The realization only deepened the unease. Queen Marial's voice broke the silence again, this time quieter, but far more dangerous. "Then what's stopping them now?" she asked. "If the Asuras are out of the equation?" Her eyes narrowed. "What if they've already come?" A ripple of tension spread through the room. "What if the scythes and retainers are already here?" she continued, using the hidden gates in the Beast Glades. Priscilla shook her head slightly. "There hasn't been any confirmed sighting of a teleportation gate in months," she replied. "The last one was destroyed." She paused briefly before adding, "One witness claimed to see an Alacrian mage halfway through a portal before it collapsed, but he died within seconds." Her gaze shifted toward the others. "Right now, the Trailblazer Division is focused on eliminating corrupted beasts and their controllers. Finding new gates isn't their priority." King Blaine leaned back slightly, his expression grim. "Then we should assume the worst," he said. "If they can't come through gates, they'll come by sea." The room grew still. "Through the western coast," he added. And if that happens, his voice hardened. No wall will be enough to stop them. Arthur felt a flicker of surprise at that. Even Blaine, who had always placed unwavering faith in Sapin's defenses, was beginning to doubt the wall. In Arthur's previous life, conflicts between nations rarely escalated into full-scale war. Kings settled disputes through paragon duels, controlled battles between chosen champions. Wars like this, total, relentless, unpredictable. They were something else entirely. Virion raised his hand sharply. Enough! The word cut through the rising tension. We're not making any clear decisions like this, he said firmly. Not with emotions running this high. He looked around the room, his expression steady once more. We'll take time to rest, he continued, then reconvene with clearer minds. A pause. The meeting resumes at sunrise. With that, he brought the session to an end. Chairs shifted, voices lowered. The council began to disperse. Boone stood slowly, stretching his back with a groan. Honestly, he muttered, half to himself, I'd rather throw myself onto the battlefield and face the enemy head-on than sit through another one of these meetings. Arthur couldn't help but understand. As the room emptied, his thoughts drifted back to another life, to endless hours spent under Lady Vera's guidance, to the countless strategy lessons, the intricate board games, the simulations of war. At the time, they had seemed overwhelming, demanding, exhausting. But now, standing in the middle of a real war, with real lives at stake, Arthur realized something. None of it, not a single lesson, had truly prepared him for this. Because this wasn't just strategy. This wasn't just war. This was the weight of an entire continent, resting on decisions that could never be undone. Arthur returned to his room completely drained from the endless council meeting. The silence felt almost unreal after hours of non-stop arguments, strategies, and tension. He let out a long breath and removed his heavy coat. The weight of everything still lingered in his mind. The thought of it all pressed heavily against his chest. Behind him, Sylvie quietly stepped into the room and closed the door. Her golden eyes followed him carefully as he dropped onto the edge of the bed with visible exhaustion. Sylvie tilted her head. Even without their mental connection fully active, she could easily tell what kind of mood he was in. For a moment, she simply watched him in silence, before suddenly walking closer, with a small smile spreading across her face. Do you want to see what I've been practicing? Arthur looked up curiously. Before he could answer, the surface of Sylvie's dress suddenly began to ripple. Arthur blinked. The dark fabric shifted like liquid, moving unnaturally across her body. The material folded inward before reshaping itself into an entirely different design. Arthur's eyes widened slightly. That's, he muttered. Sylvie gave a smug smile. It's not actually clothing. The surface of the dress shimmered again. My scales, she explained proudly. I can reshape them however I want now. Arthur stared at her with genuine fascination. That's actually incredible, Arthur admitted. Sylvie crossed her arms confidently. Obviously, Arthur chuckled softly for what felt like the first time all day. What else can you do? Sylvie walked casually around the room as she answered. For now, I've mostly been focused on functioning properly in this form, or as I prefer to call it, the bipedal form. Arthur laughed quietly. Sylvie continued grumbling. Honestly, I still don't understand how humans manage walking around like this all the time. These legs are horribly unstable. Still, she admitted, I can understand why the Asuras prefer humanoid forms. She slowly raised one hand in front of her. Mana manipulation is much easier like this. Even controlling Aether feels more natural. Arthur's expression shifted slightly at those words. That alone explained a lot. The Indrath clan almost always appeared in humanoid forms, despite being dragons. Arthur had once assumed it was simply preference or convenience. Now it made sense. Their bodies were simply better suited for manipulating higher forms of energy this way. The atmosphere inside the room gradually softened. It felt peaceful. Strangely peaceful. Arthur realized that although he and Sylvie constantly communicated mentally, actually talking like this, normally, casually, face-to-face, felt completely different, better, more human. Sylvie suddenly lifted her hand again. A sphere of white energy slowly formed above her palm. Arthur immediately stiffened. The mana inside the sphere was incredibly dense. Since the seal broke, Sylvia explained, carefully observing the glowing energy, my abilities have become a lot clearer. The white sphere crackled faintly. The Indrath clan specializes in ether, so most of my mana manipulation focuses on strengthening my body rather than using elemental spells. Arthur kept his eyes locked on the growing sphere. Most, he repeated carefully. Sylvie grinned mischievously. I can still release large amounts of mana when I want to. The sphere expanded further. The air inside the room immediately became heavier. Arthur's expression instantly changed. Sylvie, he said slowly, please don't destroy the room. The sphere continued growing. Or worse, Arthur added, staring at the ceiling nervously, the entire castle. Sylvie burst into laughter. Is the mighty Lance Arthur Leywin scared of a little girl now? Arthur folded his arms. The horns make the little girl act less convincing. Sylvie narrowed her eyes at him. Arthur continued with a smirk. Besides, you still trip over your own feet. Sylvie huffed dramatically before clapping her hands together. Instantly, the sphere of mana vanished. The room finally relaxed again. Arthur let out a relieved breath. Sylvie leaned back against the chair nearby and spoke more quietly this time. I'm glad the seal broke, she admitted. Arthur looked toward her. Sylvie's expression had softened. I'll finally be useful in battle again. There was excitement in her voice, but also uncertainty. She stared down at her own hands. At the same time, she continued slowly. There's a part of me that feels unfamiliar now. Arthur understood exactly what she meant. Ever since the seal shattered, her aura had changed. It was stronger, older, almost overwhelming at times. But Arthur smiled anyway. I'm sure you'll have plenty of opportunities to figure yourself out, he said confidently. Sylvie snorted lightly. That's not exactly comforting considering the current state of the world. Arthur sighed. She wasn't wrong. The meeting earlier had made one thing painfully clear. The war was escalating faster than anyone expected. The enemy was adapting, and Dicathen was slowly being cornered from every direction. Arthur leaned back onto the bed again, exhaustion finally catching up to him. Things are only going to get more chaotic from here, he muttered. Sylvie leaned back in her chair with complete confidence. At least we still have each other. Arthur glanced toward her. Sylvie grinned. And once I get better control over this form, she continued proudly. The idea of the two of us defeating a scythe together won't be impossible. Arthur laughed quietly. Won't be impossible? Sylvie shrugged smugly. That's my optimistic phrasing. Arthur shook his head with amusement before staring up at the ceiling. Honestly, she wasn't entirely wrong. The odds still weren't good, but compared to before, they were far better than they used to be. Sylvie eventually moved beside him, laying across the bed lazily. If we have time later, she said, I want to spar with you. Arthur raised an eyebrow. You just want an excuse to hit me. That too, Sylvie admitted shamelessly. But I also want to test the limits of my aether control in this form. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. At this point, he muttered tiredly, We'll be lucky if we even get one uninterrupted night of sleep. The instant those words left his mouth, a loud, urgent knocking exploded against the door. Arthur slowly opened one eye. Sylvie stared at him in complete disbelief, before groaning dramatically. You jinxed it. Arthur let out a tired sigh before pushing himself off the bed. Arthur walked toward the door while muttering under his breath, At least give me a minute. The moment he opened it, a soldier standing outside immediately straightened his posture and saluted sharply. My apologies for the disturbance, Lance Arthur, the soldier said quickly. Commander Varian has requested your immediate presence. Arthur's expression turned serious almost instantly. At this hour? The soldier hesitated briefly before answering. In the dungeon, sir. Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly. The dungeon? That alone was enough to tell him this wasn't ordinary business. Something had happened. Arthur glanced back toward Sylvie for only a moment before stepping out into the hallway. I'll be back later, he said quietly. The atmosphere changed the deeper they descended. The warm, candlelit halls of the castle slowly gave way to cold stone passageways beneath the fortress. The air became damp and heavy. Torches flickered weakly against the walls. Arthur could already sense several powerful mana signatures gathered ahead. By the time he reached the lower chambers, his suspicion had fully turned into concern. Every single member of the council was already there. The moment Arthur arrived, Varian glanced toward him. Good, Varian said grimly. Now that everyone's here, we can proceed. Boone frowned deeply, clearly irritated at being dragged down into the underground chambers in the middle of the night. What exactly is all this about? He demanded. King Alduin nodded in agreement, exhaustion visible on his face. Could this truly not have waited until morning? Varian looked toward Entei, who stepped forward slightly before speaking. Master Gentry requested that the council be gathered immediately, he explained. He claims one of the prisoners has finally started talking. That instantly drew everyone's attention. Queen Priscilla narrowed her eyes. The retainer? She asked sharply. Varian shook his head slowly. We're not certain yet. Arthur immediately looked toward Entei. Where's Gentry? And if someone's finally speaking, why are we standing out here? Entei opened his mouth to answer. But before he could respond, the heavy metal door beside them suddenly creaked open. A thick cloud of dark smoke slowly poured out from the chamber. Several council members visibly recoiled at the smell that followed. Then Gentry stepped out. The old torturer calmly wiped his blood-covered hands with a cloth, as if cleaning dirt from simple labor. His expression remained completely casual despite the horrifying atmosphere surrounding him. My apologies for the delay, Gentry said politely. I was performing maintenance on the retainer's restraint system when I sent for everyone. Arthur immediately noticed fresh blood splattered across Gentry's sleeves. Virion wasted no time. What did the retainer say? Did you finally break him? Gentry smiled faintly. No. Queen Marielle's expression immediately darkened with fury. "Then why?" she snapped. "Did you drag us into this god-forsaken dungeon in the middle of the night?" Gentry remained perfectly calm despite her anger. "I may not have broken the retainer yet," he admitted. "But thanks to him, the traitor Radius has finally decided to speak." The atmosphere instantly shifted. Arthur's eyes narrowed. Radius. After everything that happened, after betraying Dicathen, after dividing the Dwarven kingdom from within, now he wanted to talk? Gentry continued. However, he added carefully, "There is one condition." Everyone waited silently. "He will only speak to Arthur." Every eye in the chamber immediately turned toward him. Buin's face twisted with rage. "That traitor split my kingdom in half. He destroyed the reputation of Darv and left me to clean up the mess afterward. And now he thinks he's in a position to make demands?" King Blaine folded his arms thoughtfully. "Perhaps he's trying to negotiate. A deal, maybe." Queen Mariel immediately rejected the idea. "If he wanted a deal," she said sharply, "he would have asked for Virion or another council member, not Arthur." Virion remained silent for a moment before finally speaking. "Maybe this has something to do with Elijah." Arthur's thoughts froze. The name alone was enough to stir old memories. Elijah. Even now, they still didn't know where he was or what had truly happened to him. Arthur's mind drifted unwillingly into the past. Their first meeting, Elijah's awkward smile, the academy, their battles together, the countless moments that slowly turned friendship into something deeper, something closer to brotherhood. Arthur clenched his fist slightly. Too many questions still remained unanswered, and somehow Radius might finally hold some of those answers. Gentry's voice interrupted his thoughts. It was difficult enough getting the traitor to speak at all. "If I may offer my opinion, it would be wise to take advantage of his willingness while it lasts." Silence filled the dungeon. The council members all looked toward Arthur now, waiting. The final decision rested with him. Arthur slowly turned toward Virion. Virion held his gaze for a long moment before giving a small nod. That was all the confirmation Arthur needed. Without another word, Arthur stepped forward. "Take me to him," he said coldly. Gentry smiled faintly before turning toward the dark corridor ahead. "This way, Lance Arthur," and together they disappeared deeper into the dungeon. Elsewhere, deep within the endless maze of the Eleanor Forest, Cersei sat quietly beside a small lake hidden beneath the dense canopy of ancient trees. Moonlight barely pierced through the thick fog hanging over the forest, but the still water reflected enough pale light to illuminate the exhausted Alacrian mage. For the first time in days, there was silence. No fighting, no arguing, no constant pressure from the mission. Only the soft sound of water shifting against the rocks and the distant whisper of wind moving through the trees. Cersei exhaled slowly as he removed part of his damaged armor and dipped a cloth into the lake water. Carefully, he began wiping dried blood and dirt from the cuts along his arms. He winced slightly. Still, it felt better than remaining covered in sweat, grime, and blood for another day. As he cleaned one of the deeper wounds near his shoulder, he leaned back against a nearby stone and closed his eyes briefly. Honestly, sneaking away from camp had absolutely been worth it. Cersei knew the others would complain if they found out, especially Fane, but after days of wandering through the cursed forest non-stop, he was starting to lose his mind. Of course, he hadn't been careless. Before coming here, he had carefully placed several concealment arrays nearby and checked the surroundings multiple times. Maeve's constant paranoia about being discovered was understandable, but so far their team had successfully avoided every elven patrol they encountered. Still, how was he supposed to complete this mission properly while feeling disgusting every second of the day? Cersei splashed water across his face with another tired sigh. Then, suddenly, Russell, his body, instantly froze. The bushes behind him shifted slightly. In the next instant, Cersei's entire expression sharpened. Mana surged quietly through his body as he immediately reached for his weapon, eyes locking onto the darkness behind him. The forest went silent. Another movement. Cersei stood up immediately, ready for an attack, but instead of an enemy, a familiar figure stepped awkwardly out from the bushes. "Relax," Cole whispered quickly while raising both hands. "It's just me." Cersei let out an annoyed breath. "Why did you follow me?" Cole shrugged his back of the head casually. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Cersei stared at him for a moment before shaking his head in disbelief. "You left the barrier?" Cole shrugged. "I can't maintain it properly from this far anyway." Cersei immediately frowned. That answer only irritated him more. He quickly grabbed his mask from the ground and secured it back over his face before standing up fully. "We shouldn't be here," Cersei said firmly. "If Fane finds out both of us left our positions, he'll probably skin us alive." Cersei turned toward the forest, preparing to head back. But then, something changed. His body stiffened instantly. A cold sensation crawled down his spine. Someone was there. Cersei's eyes widened slightly as his mana sense spread outward through the fog. Behind them, Fast. Cole, before he could finish, two glowing green lights suddenly appeared within the darkness of the bushes. Eyes. Immediately after, several arrows exploded out of the fog at terrifying speed. Move. Cersei shouted. The two Alacrian instantly jumped apart as the arrows slammed into the ground where they had been standing moments earlier. Cole reacted quickly, swinging his hand outward. A burst of mana distorted the air around them, slightly altering the arrow's trajectory just enough for them to miss. The forest instantly erupted into chaos. Cersei's senses expanded desperately through the fog. 3 enemies, he said quickly. Elven scouts. More arrows cut through the trees toward them. We need to head back to camp now, Cersei warned. It's risky, but Fane and Maeve will be ready. Cole nodded immediately. The two sprinted through the forest as arrows continued chasing them through the fog. The elves were fast, far faster than normal soldiers. The distance between them was shrinking rapidly. Then suddenly, a blur shot past Cersei. Slash! One of the pursuing elves froze mid-step. A spear had pierced directly through his chest. Blood sprayed across the trees as the body collapsed instantly onto the forest floor. Fane stood there calmly, spear in hand. Without hesitation, he lunged toward the second elf. The remaining scout reacted quickly, drawing dual blades while trying to counterattack, but Cole immediately raised the defensive barrier between them. Several arrows slammed harmlessly into the shield as Fane closed the distance. The black-haired Alacrian moved with terrifying precision. In one smooth motion, he twisted his spear and drove it straight through the elf's torso. The blade burst out from the other side. The elf coughed blood before collapsing lifelessly. But the final scout was already moving. Instead of targeting Fane, the surviving elf instantly rushed toward Cole, recognizing the support mage as the easier target. His swing swung downward with deadly speed. Clang. The blade stopped inches from Cole's neck. The elf's eyes widened. Fane had intercepted the strike. His spear blocked the sword mid-swing with overwhelming force. Before the elf could react, move. Maeve's voice echoed through the forest. A barrage of blazing fireballs exploded through the trees. The flames slammed directly into the elf's body, one after another. The surrounding forest lit up orange as the explosions engulfed him completely. The scout screamed briefly before collapsing to the ground. His armor blackened and body burned beyond movement. Silence returned. Only the crackling flames remained. Fane turned immediately towards Cersei and Cole, fury already visible on his face. What the hell was that? He snapped. Cersei opened his mouth to explain, but Maeve interrupted instantly. Not now, she warned sharply while scanning the forest nervously. We need to move. Her expression was serious, far more serious than before. Explanations can wait. The group immediately began retreating toward camp together. But after several steps, Cersei stopped moving. The others quickly noticed. Fane turned back irritably. What now? Cersei stood completely still at the rear of the group. His body was trembling, not from exhaustion, not from fear, from what he was sensing. Maeve's expression slowly darkened. Cersei? Cersei's eyes remained locked on the darkness ahead. His face had gone pale beneath the mask. Then finally he spoke. There are more coming. Fane tightened his grip on his spear. How many? Cersei swallowed hard. When he answered, even his voice sounded shaken. A lot. Inside the cold dungeon cell, deep beneath the floating castle, Radia sat alone in silence. Chains rattled softly whenever he shifted, and the dim torchlight painted long shadows across the cracked stone walls. Then the heavy metal door creaked open. Arthur stepped inside. Despite the bruises covering his body and the exhaustion in his eyes, there was still an unsettling calmness about him. Ah, Lance Arthur Leywin, Radia said softly, almost warmly. Thank you for granting me your time. Arthur didn't return the greeting. His expression remained cold and unreadable. Radia slowly straightened himself against the wall and folded his hands together. Now then, allow me to begin. Arthur frowned immediately. Begin? Before Arthur could question him, Radia started speaking again, his voice rising like a storyteller reciting an old legend. There once was a lad, Radius began dramatically, born in a poor little town, wrapped in rags and raised among ordinary folk. A humble beginning, the sort that the world quickly forgets. Arthur's brows narrowed slightly, but within the boy, Radius continued, burned something far greater. He was born not for obscurity, but for greatness, born for renown. The prisoner's voice echoed throughout the dungeon cell as though he were performing on a grand stage rather than rotting inside a prison. And like all heroes destined for greatness, the lad possessed both talent and strength. His mother taught him about the world, while his father taught him how to fight. Arthur's eyes sharpened slightly. The story felt familiar, too familiar. Radia's continued without pause. His parents knew, eventually, that the small town could no longer contain the fire raging inside him. A fire burning as fiercely as a king's funeral pyre. The prisoner slowly lifted his head, staring directly into Arthur's eyes now. And so the day came when the boy realized there was a far larger stage awaiting him beyond the borders of his tiny home. Together they pack their belongings and bid farewell to the little town that raised them. Arthur's heartbeat slowed. Ashbur. The image of his childhood village flashed briefly through his mind, but Rhodeus said quietly, as all stories go, tragedy struck. Arthur's expression darkened. Now the similarities were impossible to ignore. The story mirrored his own life far too closely. But before Arthur could interrupt, Rhodeus continued speaking, his tone becoming deeper. Heroes do not simply disappear. They endure. They grow stronger through heartache, through death, through shattered dreams and broken thrones. The air inside the dungeon suddenly felt heavier. Arthur remained silent, listening carefully. But tell me, Rhodeus continued, what becomes of a hero when the enemy standing before him has crossed both time and space, and yet still shines brighter than he does? Arthur's eyes narrowed instantly. A strange chill crawled down his spine. Perhaps, Rhodeus murmured, the shining knight meant to save the world is merely another man's greatest light. The torches flickered violently. Arthur could feel questions piling up in his mind faster than he could process them. Rhodeus slowly spread his arms and finished the poem like tale, with one final line. In the end, perhaps light and darkness are only decided by whichever side survives the final battle. Silence filled the dungeon. Then suddenly, Rhodeus grabbed Arthur's sleeve tightly. What do you think? He asked desperately. Tell me, Lance Arthur, who decides what is truly light and what is truly dark? Arthur instantly shoved him away. Rhodeus crashed onto the stone floor with a grunt. Arthur stared down at him coldly, irritation flashing across his face. But instead of fear, Rhodeus laughed weakly. Good, he muttered while coughing. That confirms it. You're real. Arthur frowned. Rhodeus slowly pushed himself upright against the wall again. For a while he admitted quietly, I feared I was speaking to illusions, hallucinations. But no, this was real, which means my performance wasn't wasted after all. Arthur's expression hardened. It seems your time in this dungeon has damaged your mind. Rhodeus chuckled softly. Damaged? He repeated with amusement. Not insane? Not broken? Not cracked? He laughed again. No, you called me unbalanced. That's much kinder. Arthur remained silent. Rhodeus tilted his head slightly. You may choose to dismiss my words as nonsense, he said casually. Call them poetry. Call them madness. Ignore them entirely if you wish. What you do with them is no concern of mine. Arthur stepped closer. Explain the poem. Rhodeus smiled faintly. I thought a normal conversation would have been terribly boring, he admitted. And unfortunately, I'm not particularly gifted in poetry. Still, I had to find some way to pass the time down here. Then his expression shifted slightly as he stared directly into Arthur's eyes. Or perhaps, he whispered, these are simply the ramblings of an unbalanced man. Arthur's jaw tightened. Every instinct inside him screamed that Rhodeus knew something important, something he wasn't saying directly. But the way he spoke, the riddles, the vague symbolism, it was infuriating. And Rhodeus only made it worse. You must admit, he added casually, the rhyming was somewhat catchy. That was enough. Arthur snapped. In an instant, he grabbed Rhodeus by the collar and slammed him violently against the wall. The dungeon trembled from the impact. You don't seem to understand your situation, Arthur growled coldly. You betrayed Dicathen. You divided kingdoms. You worked with the enemy. Rhodeus winced, but still smiled faintly through the pain. Arthur's grip tightened. You're going to spend a very long time in this prison, Arthur continued, his voice low and dangerous. And how unpleasant that time becomes depends entirely on how cooperative you are. Arthur shoved him away again. Rhodeus collapsed to the floor, coughing violently. Arthur looked down at him with icy frustration. Now is not the time to worry about whether your poems sound catchy. Rhodeus coughed once more before laughing weakly. Oh, trust me, he muttered. I know exactly what kind of prison I'm in. Slowly, he looked back up at Arthur. And I already told you exactly what I wish to say. Whether you understand it is no longer my concern. Later that night, Arthur returned to his room completely exhausted. The castle halls were quiet now, but his mind was louder than ever. He sat heavily at the desk near his bed and began writing down everything Rhodeus had said, carefully reconstructing every line from memory. The poem, the metaphors, the strange references. Arthur stared at the paper for what felt like hours. At its core, the story was clearly about a hero, but something about it disturbed him deeply, because it felt personal. Too personal. Rhodeus had somehow described details from Arthur's childhood with unsettling accuracy. Ashbur, his parents, leaving the town behind, even the feeling of tragedy waiting ahead. Arthur's fingers tightened around the pen. How could Rhodeus possibly know those things? A simple background investigation through the council couldn't explain all of it. Not even close. Arthur leaned back slowly, exhausted. His thoughts drifted toward one particular line. What becomes of a hero when his enemy shines brighter than he does? Did Rhodeus mean Agrona or someone else entirely? And what did he mean by the shining knight becoming another man's blight? Arthur rubbed his forehead in frustration. Nothing connected properly. Every answer only created more questions. Suddenly, Arthur slammed both hands against the desk and stood up violently. The chair scraped backward across the floor. This makes no sense. Frustrated and mentally drained, Arthur finally collapsed onto his bed, staring blankly at the ceiling above him. Maybe the poem truly was meaningless. Maybe Radius only wanted attention. Maybe it was all just an elaborate attempt to confuse him. But even then, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that hidden somewhere inside those strange words was a warning. And deep down, he feared Radius wasn't finished yet. He feared this was only the beginning of the story. The story shifted back once again to Arthur's previous life. Far from the war in Dicathen, far from mana, dragons, and floating castles, a younger Gray stood inside an enormous training hall. Then, crack, a wooden staff struck sharply against Gray's shoulder. Gray stumbled backward with a groan, rubbing the sore spot while trying not to lose his balance. I almost dodged that one, he muttered defensively. Standing a few feet away from him, Lady Vera calmly lowered the wooden training stick in her hand. Her posture remained elegant and relaxed, yet there was something overwhelmingly oppressive about her presence. You almost dodged it, Vera repeated calmly, because you're still focusing too much on the weapon itself. Gray frowned slightly. Your vision is too narrow, she explained. You're watching my hands, my weapon, my movements. But a true fighter doesn't focus on isolated actions. She suddenly stopped directly in front of him. Your vision should encompass your opponent as a whole. Gray carefully adjusted his stance again, still wary of another sudden strike. Then Vera asked, "So tell me, Gray, what do you see now? What's different about me?" Gray looked at her carefully for a moment. Then, with the faintest hint of a smirk, he answered cautiously, "Aside from the obvious?" For a second, Vera simply stared at him. Then her eyes narrowed slightly in annoyance. "Don't get smart with me." But despite the scolding tone, a faint smile still appeared at the corner of her lips. Gray had become a difficult student, but also an incredibly promising one. Several months had passed since Vera rescued him from captivity. After his injuries healed, his real training had finally begun. And once it started, Vera wasted absolutely no time. She was ruthless as a teacher. Every mistake became a lesson. Every hesitation became punishment. Every weakness was exposed immediately. Yet strangely enough, Gray never hated it, because for the first time in his life, someone genuinely seemed invested in making him stronger. And everything around Vera reflected her overwhelming influence and wealth. The massive estate, the luxurious halls, the countless servants, the private training grounds, even the quiet elegance of her home spoke of immense power. Later that afternoon, Gray stood beside one of the estate's decorative pools, staring into the crystal-clear water below. His eyes widened slightly. Fish, real fish, living creatures swimming peacefully beneath the surface. Gray crouched down closer, completely fascinated. He had heard about fish before, of course, but growing up in poverty meant he had never actually seen one alive. Lady Vera stood nearby with her arms crossed. "So," she said calmly, "how do you plan to get better?" Gray glanced back at her. Then she pointed toward the pool. "Catch one." Gray blinked. "With my hands?" "Yes." Gray frowned slightly, but before he could move, Vera added another condition, a no key. That immediately caught him off guard. "No key?" Gray repeated. "Wouldn't they die if I pulled them out of the water? And these things probably cost more than my entire hometown." Vera waved dismissively. "Don't concern yourself with that. Just try." Gray reluctantly sighed before kneeling beside the pool. Then he struck. Splash. The fish darted away instantly. Gray tried again and again. Every single attempt failed miserably. The fish moved far too quickly, slipping through his fingers effortlessly each time. Soon, Gray's sleeves were soaked, his hair damp, and frustration written all over his face. Finally, he looked back toward Vera. "What's the point of this?" he asked tiredly. "Catching one barehanded is basically impossible." Without saying a word, Vera calmly stepped forward. Then, splash. Her hand entered the water once, and when she pulled it back out, a fish wriggled calmly in her grasp. Gray's eyes widened immediately. Vera casually released the fish back into the water. Gray stared at her suspiciously. "No, do it again." Vera raised an eyebrow. Then she reached down once more. Splash! Another fish, perfectly caught, slowly, effortlessly. Gray was completely stunned. "That makes no sense," he muttered. "Did you train the fish to swim into your hands or something?" For the first time all day, Vera actually looked offended. "Do I truly look like someone who would waste time doing something so pointless?" Gray immediately shook his head. "No, definitely not." Vera nodded once. Then her expression became serious again. "I showed you this because you and those fish are similar." Gray blinked in confusion. The moment the word left his mouth, Vera suddenly attacked him. Gray dodged purely on instinct. The strike missed him by inches. "There," she said calmly. "That speed of yours is remarkable. Frighteningly fast, actually. But it's wild. Untamed. Gray frowned. Untamed? Vera walked slowly around him again as she explained. The moment your opponent's muscles tense before an attack, your brain immediately sends signals to react. Your body moves before you consciously think. Gray listened carefully. If your opponent is inexperienced, Vera continued, that ability gives you a massive advantage. Then her tone sharpened. But against stronger enemies, your movements become predictable. Gray's eyes narrowed slightly. Vera gestured toward the pool. Just like those fish. I knew exactly how they would move once I reached for them. Gray slowly began understanding. A little. So, how do I fix it? Vera smiled faintly. By learning to respond instead of react. Gray frowned again. Aren't those basically the same thing? No, Vera said immediately. One is instinctual, the other is intentional. Until now, your training has focused mostly on conditioning your body. But I believe you're finally ready to learn proper combat awareness. Gray's eyes lit up slightly. Vera gently patted his head. We begin tomorrow. Gray groaned dramatically. Vera turned and began walking away. Oh, it'll be fun, she answered calmly. Then she glanced back at him with the faintest smile. For me, and you're late for school, Vera replied immediately. Your classes resume tomorrow. Just then, footsteps echoed nearby. One of the estate servants hurried toward them, clearly nervous. Lady Vera, young Master Gray. Gray looked up. What is it? The servant bowed quickly. There's an urgent call for you, sir, from someone named Nico. Gray's expression changed instantly. Nico? The servant nodded. There was apparently some kind of explosion at Whitholm Academy. The enforcers have locked down the entire campus and instructed students and staff to stay away until further notice. Gray froze. An explosion? At Whitholm, his mind immediately raced toward the worst possibilities. Nico, was he hurt? Without another word, Gray immediately turned toward the exit. But before he could leave, Vera's calm voice stopped him. Go, check on your friend, Vera said quietly. Then, return afterward. Gray nodded immediately. But before he rushed out completely, Vera added one final piece of advice. A panicked man may drown in a puddle, she said calmly, while a calm man may swim across an ocean. Gray paused briefly. Then Vera smirked faintly. And since your classes are apparently canceled for today, we'll continue your reaction training later. Without wasting another second, he sprinted toward the doors of the estate, desperate to reach Nico as quickly as possible. Behind him, Lady Vera quietly watched him leave. For the first time that day, a faint trace of concern appeared in her eyes. She only hoped everything was already not too late. Gray rushed through the halls. A strange sense of dread tightened around his chest as he sprinted toward the communication room. Without slowing down, Gray grabbed the communication receiver the instant he reached it. Nico? He called out immediately. Nico, are you there? For a brief moment, only static answered him. Then finally, Gray. Nico's trembling voice came through the line. The fear in his voice immediately made Gray's stomach sink. Nico, what happened? Gray asked quickly. Are you okay? On the other side of the call, Nico sounded completely panicked. I don't know what's happening, he stammered. I checked it a few days ago and everything was fine. It was working perfectly. Gray frowned in confusion. What are you talking about? Then Nico's breathing became uneven. The key restrainer, he whispered. It must have malfunctioned. Gray's eyes widened slightly, and then Nico said the words that made his chest tighten. This is all my fault. Gray immediately tried calming him down. Slow down, he said firmly. What are you blaming yourself for? You're not making any sense. There was another pause. Then finally, Nico spoke again. It's Cecilia. The moment Gray heard her name, his expression hardened. What happened to Cecilia? Nico inhaled shakily before answering. She had another accident. Gray's grip on the receiver tightened. His mind instantly went back to all the previous incidents. Cecilia's uncontrollable power, the strange surges of ki, the dangerous outbursts she could barely suppress. But from Nico's terrified voice alone, Gray already knew this incident had to be far worse than the others. Gray, Nico said desperately. Can you come to the academy right now? Gray stayed silent for a moment. The enforcers are here, Nico continued nervously. They've been questioning everyone, conducting interviews, asking all kinds of things. His breathing became more frantic. I'm scared, Gray. That single sentence hit harder than anything else. I think they're going to take her away. Gray's eyes narrowed immediately. Please, Nico begged quietly. Come as soon as you can. For several seconds, Gray said nothing. Then finally, he asked the question he was most afraid to hear the answer to. Is Cecilia alive? Nico answered immediately. Yes, she's alive. Gray let out a quiet breath of relief. But Nico continued. She's okay physically, I think. But they locked her up. Gray closed his eyes for a moment. This time was really bad, Nico whispered. She destroyed part of the administration building. Silence filled the room around Gray. Inside his mind, thoughts immediately began clashing against one another. If he asked Lady Vera for permission to leave, would she allow it? Probably not. Vera would likely tell him to stay focused on his future, to avoid unnecessary distractions, to let the enforcers handle the situation. And, honestly, part of Gray knew she would probably be right. Still, hearing Nico sound this terrified made something inside him twist painfully. Gray tried finding a way out of the situation without directly refusing. The enforcers told everyone to stay away from the academy, he said carefully. Even if I came, they probably wouldn't let me inside. He forced his voice to sound convincing. I want to help, but there's not much I can do right now. On the other end, Nico stayed silent briefly before speaking again. Then maybe we can meet somewhere else, he suggested quickly. We need to figure out what to do if they really try to take Cecilia away. Gray's chest tightened. He could hear the desperation in Nico's voice, the fear, the helplessness. And yet, Gray panicked internally. He didn't want to get dragged into this situation. Not now. Not when his future was finally beginning to change. Not when Vera had already started shaping him into something greater. Gray swallowed hard before trying to calm Nico down instead. Nico, listen to me, he said firmly. We don't even know what's going to happen yet. Panicking won't help anyone. Then, almost unconsciously, he repeated the same words Vera had told him earlier that day. A panicked man can drown in a puddle, Gray said slowly, trying to remember the exact quote, but a calm man can swim across an ocean, or something like that. He rubbed his forehead awkwardly. The point is, we need to stay calm. Nico took a shaky breath. Yeah. For a moment, it sounded like he was trying to steady himself. But then he asked again quietly, so, where should we meet? Gray froze. The guilt hit him immediately. But instead of agreeing, he shut the idea down completely. I can't come, Gray said flatly. I have lessons. The moment the words left his mouth, the atmosphere changed. Gray quickly continued before Nico could respond. Don't worry so much. Everything's going to be fine. Even as he said it, the words sounded hollow. Still, he kept going. You just need to keep your head down and avoid causing trouble. Then Gray tried justifying it further, both to Nico and to himself. Maybe this could actually help Cecilia in the long run. If important people notice her condition, maybe she'll finally get proper treatment. He lowered his voice slightly. Then she won't have to rely only on your inventions anymore. The line became quiet. When Nico finally spoke again, his voice sounded smaller somehow. Okay, there was disappointment there. Gray could hear it clearly, but Nico still tried holding himself together. Sorry, Nico said softly. I know you already have a lot on your plate trying to become king and all. Gray immediately felt worse hearing that. So, I'll let you go now. Gray tightened his grip on the receiver. Call me once you know what the enforcers decide to do, he said. Nico nodded weakly on the other end. Sure. And then the call ended. The room fell silent. Gray slowly lowered the receiver back into place while staring blankly ahead. Everything's going to be fine, he whispered quietly to himself. Back in the present, Arthur sat silently in his room. That memory still haunted him, because now he understood the truth. That was how both Gray and Arthur survived painful moments, by telling themselves things would somehow work out, by repeating comforting lies until they started believing them. Arthur closed his eyes slowly. It was a memory he would never forget. Dream or not, far below the floating castle, deep within the underground dungeon, the night remained cold and quiet. Gentry sighed tiredly. Tonight certainly turned out more eventful than expected. Gentry stretched slightly before turning away. Make sure you finish wrapping things up early tonight, he said casually. I'd rather not spend another sleepless evening down here. With that, Gentry began walking off down the corridor. But then, a sound echoed from inside the retainer's prison cell. Ento froze instantly. The noise had been subtle. Then suddenly, something moved. Fast. Far too fast. A dark blur shot toward Ento from inside the cell. Ento's eyes widened in terror. The bucket slipped from his hands while metal instruments clattered loudly throughout the dungeon corridor. And before Ento could even scream, the shadow was already upon him. Arthur descended the cold stone staircase toward the underground prison, adjusting the collar of his formal coat with visible discomfort. The neatly pressed black uniform felt stiff around his shoulders, and the polished boots echoed sharply against the dungeon steps. He hated wearing these formal clothes. They were restrictive, impractical, and far too rigid for someone constantly moving between battlefields. But after arriving late and underdressed to one too many council meetings, Virion had made his opinion painfully clear. If Arthur showed up looking like a wandering mercenary again, the commander would personally lecture him for an hour straight. So despite the irritation crawling under his skin, Arthur endured it. Only a few days had passed since his last dream of Gray's past life, yet the memory still lingered vividly in his mind. The strange conversation with Rodius refused to leave him alone. Ever since hearing that bizarre poem, fragments of Gray's old memories had begun surfacing more frequently, almost as if the words themselves had stirred something buried deep inside him. Arthur clenched his jaw slightly. Maybe the poem truly was connected somehow. Maybe Radius knew something impossible. Or maybe the old traitor was simply insane. Arthur exhaled slowly as he continued down the dim corridor, illuminated by flickering mana lamps. He hoped that this time, Radius would stop speaking in riddles and finally explain himself directly. As he reached the final turn of the staircase, he noticed the guard stationed outside the prison corridor. The elf was seated lazily beside the cell entrance, head tilted slightly downward, sleeping. Arthur stared at him for a moment before sighing quietly. This guy really drifts off on duty a lot, he thought. A faint smirk tugged at Arthur's lips. Deciding to test him a little, Arthur carefully concealed his mana presence and silently stepped forward, using the same stealth technique he once used to sneak past the hypersensitive raptor squirrels in Epheotis, creatures capable of sensing even the slightest disturbance in the air. Arthur moved without a sound, but the moment he came within reach, a blade instantly pressed against his neck. Arthur froze. The elf guard stood before him with frightening speed, sword drawn and eyes razor-sharp. His sleepy appearance had vanished completely. Pure instinct radiated from him. Then recognition struck. The guard's eyes widened in horror. He immediately lowered his weapon and stepped back, bowing apologetically. "My apologies. I sensed someone sneaking up behind me and reacted before thinking." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "You reacted while asleep." The elf's face flushed with embarrassment. "Please don't tell Commander Virion," he pleaded quickly. "I only have a few more days of guard duty left. If I stay down here any longer, I'll have to start running laps on the wall, just to stop my muscles from wasting away." Arthur couldn't help letting out a small chuckle. "Relax, I'm not reporting you." The guard sighed in relief. "Honestly, though," Arthur admitted, "I'm impressed. Virion was right about your senses being exceptional." The elf grinned proudly at the compliment. "These senses saved my life more times than I can count." The guard sheathed his sword before asking, "Are you here to visit another prisoner?" Arthur shook his head. "Same one." Then he glanced toward the deeper part of the corridor. "Is Gentry inside?" The elf snorted. "There hasn't been a single moment where he hasn't been inside." Arthur blinked. "Wait, he sleeps down here too?" The elf nodded immediately. With all the smell and blood and screaming, apparently, both of them grimaced at the same time. "That's disgusting," Arthur muttered. "It really is." They continued their conversation as Arthur asked whether the elf at least had his own room, and hopefully somewhere far away from these depths of despair. The elf let out a tired laugh and said that he did, but he still couldn't wait to finish his assignment there and finally return home. Arthur glanced at him curiously. "You're not returning to the battlefield?" The elf shook his head. "I'm being reassigned to the Elshire Forest." Then a faint smile crossed his face. "That's what I meant by home." Arthur paused slightly. The Elshire Forest, the memory resurfaced immediately. The towering trees, the thick mana fog, the strange silence hidden beneath the forest's beauty. The first time Arthur entered Elshire, he had only been a child, and it had been entirely by accident. The elf stopped walking for a second, clearly surprised. "You?" Arthur nodded. "When I was younger." The guard stared at him in disbelief. "Not many humans enter the Elshire Forest and come back alive," he muttered, "much less a child." Arthur smiled faintly. "I'll tell you the story someday if you tell me why you're getting demoted to guard duty." The elf instantly replied without hesitation. "I guess we'll both never know." Arthur laughed quietly under his breath. Eventually, they reached a cluttered side room near the deepest cells of the prison. The elf pointed toward a hunched figure buried beneath papers, restraints, and scattered tools. "There," he said. "That's where he sleeps." Gentry suddenly jolted awake at the sound of footsteps. What's going on?" He fumbled around for his glasses before finally spotting Arthur standing at the doorway. The old torturer blinked. "Well now," he muttered, "to what do I owe the pleasure of the general disturbing my rest?" Arthur crossed his arms. "I was simply returning the favor from last night." Gentry let out a dry laugh. "Fair enough." Arthur's expression quickly turned serious. "I need you to open Radius's cell. There's something I want to ask him." Gentry nodded immediately as he stood up. "Of course." As they walked through the corridor, Gentry spoke again. "And, my apologies for dragging the entire council down here last night." Arthur glanced at him. "You thought Radius was finally going to reveal something important. I still think he might." Arthur remained silent for a moment. "That's why I'm here." The deeper they walked, the colder the air became. Eventually, they arrived outside Uto's reinforced containment chamber. Arthur frowned slightly. Something felt wrong. Gentry reached for the mechanism and slowly opened the chamber door. The moment the door creaked open, dark smoke spilled into the hallway. Arthur's eyes narrowed instantly. Gentry froze. The elf guard immediately stepped forward with his sword drawn. As the smoke slowly cleared, the horrifying scene inside became visible. Ento lay collapsed on the floor. Blood seeped through the gaps in his suit as broken tools and overturned buckets scattered across the room. The entire chamber looked devastated. Black spikes of corrupted mana erupted violently from the ground, and walls like twisted spears, tearing apart the prison floor. And in the middle of it all, Uto sat slumped against the wall, barely conscious. Yet despite his condition, a twisted grin stretched across the retainer's face the moment he saw Arthur. Arthur's eyes widened slightly. That's impossible. The restraints were still active. Uto's mana should have been completely sealed. Gentry immediately rushed toward the retainer, while the elf guard focused his senses outward. There's nobody else here, the elf reported sharply. I can't sense any intruders. Arthur stepped cautiously into the chamber, confusion growing rapidly. Did he somehow break free? Arthur muttered. But something felt off. Uto wasn't escaping. He wasn't even moving properly. And then Arthur realized something far worse. Radius. Arthur instantly turned and rushed toward the neighboring cell. The metal door stood partially open. Arthur reached it in seconds and stopped cold. Radius lay sprawled across the prison floor. Dark spikes had pierced completely through his body. Blood spread beneath him in thick crimson pools. His eyes were empty, dead. For a brief moment, silence consumed the entire corridor. Arthur stared at the corpse in shock, his mind racing violently. Then Uto laughed weakly from behind him. A slow, broken laugh filled with cruel amusement. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the floating castle felt far heavier than usual. The bright halls that once carried the quiet comfort of safety now felt tense and suffocating. Inside the grand meeting room, every member of the council had gathered once again. Virion stood at the head of the chamber with a grim expression etched across his face. The exhaustion in his eyes was impossible to hide. Beside him stood Gentry, the usually composed torturer looking pale and visibly shaken. The memory of what happened in the dungeon clearly hadn't left him. Virion looked toward him and spoke in a firm but controlled tone. Describe everything exactly as it happened. Leave out no details. Gentry swallowed hard. Before he could answer, Queen Priscilla spoke gently from her seat. We understand your distress, she said calmly. But if we fully understand the incident, perhaps we can determine what truly happened and prevent it from occurring again. Gentry nodded weakly, trying to compose himself. His voice faltered slightly. I could have stopped it. The room remained silent. Gentry lowered his head. But I was asleep. King Blaine narrowed his eyes. You didn't hear anything at all? Before Gentry could answer, the elf guard Albald stepped forward. I can personally assure the council, he said confidently, that if there had been any struggle or intrusion, I would have heard it, even from the first floor of the dungeon. Arthur glanced briefly toward the elf. After witnessing his senses firsthand earlier that morning, Arthur knew the man wasn't exaggerating. Then Arthur himself spoke. As I mentioned before, he said steadily, by the time we arrived, they were already dead. Queen Mariel turned toward him immediately. Then explain exactly what you saw. Arthur nodded once before recounting the scene carefully. When we entered the chamber, the room was already covered in black spikes. Ento was still barely alive at the time. Albald continued from there. Uto was leaning halfway outside his cell, the elf explained. One of the spikes had pierced directly through his mana core. We couldn't determine whether he escaped on his own or whether someone helped him. He paused briefly before continuing. I intended to investigate the chamber further while General Arthur. I went to Radaeus' cell. Arthur finished for him. The room grew even quieter. I wanted answers regarding the poem he recited the previous night, Arthur explained. But when I reached the cell, Radaeus was already dead. Arthur's eyes hardened slightly as the image resurfaced again in his mind. His body had been pierced straight through the heart by the same black spikes. Several council members grimly exchanged looks. Arthur continued calmly. Gentry had been sleeping near the chamber, and Albald was guarding the main entrance. Earlier this morning, Albald was capable of detecting me even after I completely concealed my mana presence. Arthur looked toward the council directly, and between the prison levels and the upper floors, there were numerous guards stationed throughout the castle. If someone truly infiltrated this place, Arthur paused slightly. They left absolutely no traces behind. Silence settled heavily across the room. The situation made no sense. Virion eventually spoke. Since every witness account aligns perfectly, he announced, the council has concluded that none of you were involved in the deaths. Gentry visibly relaxed slightly at those words, though the guilt still remained written across his face. Arthur remained silent, but internally his thoughts continued racing. The deaths of Radaeus and Uto were catastrophic. Not only had Dicathen lost 2 major prisoners, but one of them had been a retainer living proof that the enemy could bleed. Keeping Uto imprisoned had given the people of Dicathen a sense of control, a symbol that the war was still manageable. Now even that illusion was gone. As for Radaeus, the council didn't mourn the traitor himself. But the information buried with him was another matter entirely. Virion eventually turned toward Gentry. You are granted temporary bereavement leave until the council requires your services again. Gentry bowed deeply. Understood. Virion then looked toward Albald. You will return to the Elshire Forest immediately and assist the forces stationed there. The elf stood straight and saluted sharply. Yes, Commander. Arthur quietly observed the council members as the meeting continued. Despite their composed expressions, he could tell every single one of them understood the danger of the situation. If word spread that enemy prisoners had somehow died inside the most secure location in Dicathen, panic would spread instantly. So, the council made the same choice countless rulers throughout history had made when faced with fear and uncertainty. They buried the truth. The incident would be covered up completely. No public announcement, no rumors, no mention of infiltration. Virion finally turned toward Arthur. Until further notice, you will remain on standby. Arthur bowed slightly. Understood. The meeting eventually ended, and one by one, the council members departed the chamber in exhausted silence. Later, Arthur found Virion standing alone beside one of the massive castle windows. The old commander stared quietly at the floating city below. Far beneath the castle, children ran through the streets laughing while merchants opened their shops for the day. Families walked together peacefully. To them, the floating castle still represented safety. Arthur stepped beside Virion. You must be worried about everyone's safety, Arthur said quietly. 3 people were killed inside the most secure location in Dicathen, most likely by enemy forces. Virion didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued looking outside. After a long pause, he finally spoke. Do you really think I'd allow civilians to remain here if I believed they were in danger? Arthur stayed silent. But inwardly, he admitted Virion had a point. If an enemy infiltrator truly possessed the ability to enter the castle unnoticed, then why target prisoners? Why not assassinate council members? Or the lances? Why kill Radaeus and Uto specifically? The more Arthur thought about it, the less sense it made. And yet, Agrona's words continued echoing in his mind. Arthur remembered the conversation clearly, Agrona speaking through Sylvie's body, calmly discussing the war as though human lives were nothing more than pieces on a board. What do you suppose the statistics are in Alakria? Agrona had asked him. Arthur remembered the cold certainty in his voice. And then the warning. We are progressing into the next stage of the war. It will not benefit your side. Agrona didn't want to destroy Dicathen. He wanted its resources, its people. He intended to use the continent itself as fuel for his future war against Ephiodus. Arthur's thoughts shifted back toward Radaeus. The poem, the strange wording, the hidden meanings. Was Radaeus truly trying to warn him? Had he deliberately hidden the truth within poetry to avoid triggering some kind of curse? Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly. Cynthia had died under mysterious circumstances too. Was it the same curse? The same invisible force, silencing anyone who learned too much? Arthur's thoughts were interrupted when Virion spoke again. To be honest, the commander admitted quietly, I'm at a complete loss. Arthur looked at him in surprise. Virion rarely admitted uncertainty. The scale of this war, Virion continued while staring out at the sky, is unlike anything this continent has ever faced. Arthur slowly nodded. Things have been quiet lately, he admitted. Too quiet. A heavy tension settled between them. Arthur looked out over the floating castle, toward the endless horizon beyond the clouds. I can feel it, he said quietly. Something big is about to happen. His expression darkened, but I still don't know what. As Arthur walked through the long hallways of the floating castle, his mind remained tangled in restless thoughts. The polished marble floors reflected the soft glow of the mana lamps above, but even the calm atmosphere of the castle couldn't ease the tension building inside him. Everything was happening too fast. Every day brought new threats, new discoveries, and new uncertainty. The war that once felt distant had now spread across the entire continent like an unstoppable storm. Arthur let out a quiet breath as he continued walking toward his room. Part of him still couldn't understand why Virion had ordered him to remain on standby, while the other lances were scattered across Dicathen, handling critical missions. Aya had already been deployed to Eleanor, monitoring the southern borders after the recent Alacrian incursions through the forest. Mika was deep within Darv, hunting down the radical dwarven groups and Alacrian sympathizers, destabilizing the kingdom from within. Varwe had stationed herself along the western coastline, personally overseeing the fortification of major cities in preparation for a possible naval assault. Byron was scouting the northern range of the Grand Mountains, searching relentlessly for any sign of scythes or retainers entering Dicathen. Everyone was moving. Everyone was fighting. Yet Arthur remained in the castle. He frowned slightly. Still, he trusted Virion. The old commander wasn't the type to make meaningless decisions. If Virion wanted him here, then there had to be a reason for it. Arthur simply hadn't figured it out yet. As he reached the door to his room, he suddenly heard muffled voices coming from inside. "You have to help me. Promise?" Arthur paused, then slowly opened the door. The moment he stepped inside, Ellie instantly turned toward him with a bright smile, while Sylvie sat suspiciously close beside her on the couch. Boo rested lazily on the floor nearby. Arthur narrowed his eyes immediately. "That doesn't look suspicious at all." Sylvie crossed her arms innocently. "You're overthinking it." Arthur wasn't convinced for even a second. Ellie quickly changed the subject before he could question them further. "What happened? Why did it take you so long?" Arthur sighed tiredly as he loosened the collar of his coat. Another council meeting, then a faint smile crossed his face. "But I'm free now." Ellie's eyes lit up instantly. "Does that mean you're finally ready to spend time with your precious little sister?" Arthur chuckled softly. "Sure, as long as you don't mind spending that time at the training grounds." He glanced toward Sylvie. "She and I still need to test a few things before we end up in a real fight." Sylvie nodded immediately. As the three of them began walking through the castle halls together, Arthur glanced sideways at Sylvie. "So," he said casually, "what exactly were you two talking about before I came in?" Sylvie immediately looked away. "I'm sworn to secrecy." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "That makes it sound even more suspicious." Ellie quickly avoided eye contact. Arthur shook his head with a helpless smile as they continued toward the training grounds. Despite everything happening around them, seeing Ellie and Sylvie getting along so naturally genuinely made him happy. Eventually, they arrived at the massive indoor training hall. The moment Arthur pushed the heavy doors open, the familiar scent of stone, metal, and burned mana filled the air. Arthur stepped into the center of the room before stretching his arms casually. "We should warm up first." Ellie immediately began stretching beside him. Arthur glanced toward Sylvie. "You joining us?" Sylvie stared at them blankly. "Why?" Ellie giggled. "To loosen your body before training." Sylvie hesitated before awkwardly attempting to copy their movements. Her human form still clearly felt unnatural to her. Every stretch looked stiff and unbalanced, and several times she nearly lost her footing. Arthur tried not to laugh. Eventually, Sylvie leaned too far sideways and nearly toppled over completely, but Ellie quickly caught her before she could hit the floor. Sylvie blinked in surprise. Ellie smiled proudly. "See? You're getting better already." Arthur shook his head in amusement. "All right, let's start the real training before one of you breaks something just by stretching." Sylvie straightened herself before walking toward the center of the arena. "How do you want to do this?" Arthur asked. Sylvie raised a hand. "Just stand still for a moment." Almost immediately, a glowing sphere of white energy began forming around her palm. The mana condensed rapidly into a dense, shining projectile. Then, whoosh, she fired it directly toward Arthur like an arrow. Arthur instantly swatted the projectile aside with the back of his hand, but despite casually deflecting it, his expression shifted slightly in surprise when he noticed a faint burn mark left behind on his skin. Arthur blinked. "When did you learn to use mana arrows?" Sylvie looked mildly pleased with herself. Watching Ellie manipulate elemental mana gave me a few ideas. Then several more glowing arrows rapidly formed around her hands. Including how to better take advantage of my own traits, the arrows shot toward Arthur one after another. This time Arthur caught the projectiles directly in his hands before they could explode. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Interesting. He examined the dense mana carefully. Compared to Ellie's arrows, these are much more compact, almost solid. He looked back towards Sylvie. The raw destructive output isn't especially high, but the mana density is absurd. They don't dissipate immediately after impact either. Arthur quickly realized that although Sylvie drew inspiration from Ellie's techniques, the composition of the spell itself was completely different. Ellie manipulated elemental mana. Sylvie manipulated pure mana itself. Sylvie folded her arms confidently. Dragons can only manipulate ether and pure mana. Arthur glanced at the glowing energy still lingering around her hands. Then what exactly is this arrow? Sylvie hesitated slightly. "I'm not entirely sure." That answer immediately caught Arthur's attention. Sylvie looked down at her hands thoughtfully. "Ever since I started spending more time in my human form, I've gotten a much better understanding of my core." Her expression slowly became more uncertain, but there's still a part of it I can't fully access. Arthur smirked slightly. "Maybe you'll unlock it once you get stronger." Then dozens of fireballs suddenly materialized around him. The temperature inside the training room instantly rose. "For now," Arthur continued, "let's test how versatile your control over pure mana really is." The fireballs launched simultaneously. The arena exploded into flames. Ellie quickly shielded herself from the heat while Boo growled uneasily. But when the fire finally cleared, Sylvie stood completely unharmed. A translucent white mana barrier surrounded her body flawlessly. Not even a scratch reached her. Arthur immediately followed with another attack, this time summoning sharp, flaming arrows. Create separate panels, he instructed calmly. Block each projectile individually. The arrows shot forward. Sylvie reacted instantly. Several floating mana shields materialized around her body, intercepting every single arrow with perfect timing. Arthur nodded approvingly, then vanished. In the next instant, he appeared directly behind Sylvie in her blind spot. Arthur swung his blade toward her side, attempting to catch her off guard. But before the strike could land, black and violet dragon scales instantly spread across Sylvie's arm, hardening into armor. Clang! Arthur's attack bounced harmlessly away. Sylvie turned toward him smugly. Arthur couldn't help smiling. Your mana control is impressive, he admitted honestly, and your reserves are massive. He studied the scales covering her arm. Your natural defenses are strong too, even if this form slows your physical movement slightly. Then his expression became more serious. But your attacks still aren't strong enough to threaten a retainer or scythe yet. Sylvie nodded without arguing. My defenses are weaker in this form too, she admitted, and you definitely held back just now. She glanced toward Dawn's ballad resting in Arthur's hand. If you actually swung seriously with that sword, I probably would have lost an arm. Arthur smiled slightly but didn't deny it. Sylvie continued explaining. My mana control is far better in this form, but my dragon form allows me to release much larger amounts of mana at once. Arthur nodded thoughtfully. Less refined, but more destructive. Exactly. Arthur then raised a hand again. One more test. Sylvie tilted her head curiously. Create a square mana panel in front of me, Arthur instructed, and keep it stable. A glowing shield appeared instantly before him. Arthur took a stance, then struck it. The impact shook the entire arena floor. But the shield didn't break. Arthur's eyes widened slightly in genuine surprise. Good. Then he pointed toward the opposite side of the room. How far can you maintain control? Sylvie sent the shield floating across the arena, while Arthur observed carefully. Keep moving it. The shield twisted, rotated, accelerated, and shifted direction rapidly through the air while Sylvie maintained full control over it. Arthur watched closely, then suddenly spoke again. Now converted into an arrow, the shield instantly collapsed inward before reshaping itself into a glowing projectile. Sylvie fired it forward immediately. Arthur smiled. Not bad at all. At this point, Arthur finally began understanding how they could properly coordinate during battle. Sylvie's control, defense, and adaptability could complement his combat style perfectly. And as the two of them resumed sparring, Ellie stood quietly near the sidelines beside Boo, watching the overwhelming exchange of power unfold before her eyes. Explosions shook the arena. Mana clashed violently. Arthur and Sylvie moved at speeds Ellie could barely follow. And for the first time in a long while, Ellie truly realized just how massive the gap between her and them had become. As Arthur and Sylvie finally wrapped up their training session, the lengthy sparring session had given Arthur a much clearer understanding of Sylvie's current abilities in her human form, as well as the strengths and limitations they would need to account for in future battles. Sylvie, however, looked completely exhausted. Her shoulders slumped as she walked away from the training area. The two exchanged a playful high five, as if one fighter was tagging out while the next stepped into the arena. Your turn, Sylvie muttered, and the moment she reached Boo, she practically collapsed onto the giant bear's soft fur. Boo let out a low grunt of surprise, but didn't move, allowing the tired dragon to use him as a living pillow. Arthur couldn't help but chuckle. Get some rest. At that moment, Ellie stepped forward with obvious excitement shining in her eyes. She tightened her grip on her bow and practically bounced on her feet as she approached the center of the training field. Through their mental connection, Sylvie immediately spoke to Arthur. Don't go too hard on her. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Why? Because she's been looking forward to this all day, Sylvie replied, and she really wants to impress you. Arthur glanced toward Ellie, who was already drawing her bowstring with an eager expression. A small smile appeared on his face. There won't be any fun in that, he answered. Ellie planted her feet firmly and raised her bow. I'm ready. Arthur nodded. Let's see what you've got. Without warning, he stomped lightly against the ground. Several chunks of stone erupted upward and shot toward Ellie like cannonballs. The attack wasn't particularly powerful, but it was fast enough to test her reactions. Ellie's eyes sharpened instantly. She pulled back her bowstring. Thwip! A mana arrow streaked forward. The first stone shattered. Another arrow followed. Within moments, every incoming projectile exploded into fragments before they could even reach her. Stone dust scattered through the air. Ellie lowered her bow slightly and smirked. You're going to have to do better than that. Arthur blinked, then laughed. Confident, he lifted a hand. Dozens of fireballs instantly materialized around him. The glowing spheres floated in the air like miniature suns, filling the training grounds with heat. Arthur glanced toward Sylvie. At this rate, he said, I might not even get the chance to go easy on her. Arthur smiled. This should be good practice for both of us. The fireballs launched forward. Ellie immediately sprang into motion. She moved across the field with surprising agility, weaving between the incoming attacks while continuously firing arrows. One fireball exploded behind her, another passed inches from her shoulder, a third detonated where she had been standing only moments before. Yet throughout the entire barrage, her aim never wavered. Mana arrows flew from her bow one after another. Arthur watched carefully. Her draw speed had improved significantly. More importantly, her movement was becoming increasingly natural during combat. But Arthur wasn't finished. Cold mana gathered around him. The temperature dropped instantly. A moment later, dozens of icebergs formed around his body. Each construct looked almost alive. With a flick of his wrist, the frozen birds surged toward Ellie. The attack came from multiple angles simultaneously. Ellie immediately jumped backward while continuing to fire. Arrow after arrow shot through the air. Every single iceberg shattered before reaching her. Not one survived. Arthur's eyes widened slightly. Her accuracy had become frightening. The instant the final ice construct exploded, Arthur switched elements again. Fire mana erupted from the ground. Massive flames spiraled upward. The inferno twisted and condensed until it formed a gigantic beast made entirely of fire. The blazing creature towered over Ellie, radiating enough heat to distort the air around it. Even Boo lifted his head. Sylvie sat upright. The creature let out a roar that shook the training grounds. Arthur folded his arms. "Your offense is impressive," he admitted. "But what happens when you face a spell that can't simply be shot down?" Ellie stared at the towering monster. Then she smiled. Slowly, she reached into her quiver. This time she withdrew a different arrow. Its surface shimmered with concentrated mana. Arthur noticed immediately. The atmosphere around the projectile felt different, much denser, much more powerful. Without hesitation, Ellie drew her bowstring. The mana around her surged. Then she released. The arrow shot forward like a beam of light. Arthur expected it to punch through the construct. Instead, boom, the entire fire beast exploded. The massive spell collapsed instantly. Flames scattered in every direction before vanishing completely. The attack Arthur had spent far more mana creating was erased in a single shot. Silence filled the training grounds. Arthur stared. Ellie stood confidently with her bow lowered. A smug smile slowly appeared on her face. Arthur blinked, then laughed. "That was impressive?" Ellie interrupted. Arthur opened his mouth. "Maybe superb?" Arthur snorted. Ellie grinned wider. Jaw dropping? Arthur shook his head. "It wasn't bad." Ellie's expression immediately flattened. "Not bad?" Arthur ignored her protest. "Your arrows are made entirely from pure mana. Your reload speed is significantly faster than a traditional archer's, and your accuracy has improved dramatically." Ellie crossed her arms. "Those compliments seem a little dull." Before Arthur could answer, Sylvie jumped in. "What your brother means to say is that he's very proud of you." Arthur immediately pointed at her. "Do not verbally express my thoughts." Sylvie burst out laughing. Ellie smiled despite herself. Arthur eventually sighed. "Your stamina still needs work, and your overall experience is lacking. But those things will improve with time." Ellie nodded slowly. Then her expression became noticeably more serious. "There was actually something I wanted to ask." Arthur immediately noticed the change. "What is it?" Ellie hesitated. For a moment it looked like she might back down. "Never mind." Sylvie immediately sat up. "Nope, you're asking now." Arthur narrowed his eyes. "Does this have anything to do with whatever you two were secretly discussing earlier?" Ellie took a deep breath. Then she finally said it. "I want to fight in the war." The words hung heavily in the air. Arthur froze. Even though part of him had expected it, hearing her say it aloud still caught him off guard. Ellie stepped forward. "You said it yourself. I've improved a lot." Arthur remained silent. Ellie continued. "I'm confident I'm stronger than a lot of soldiers who have already been assigned to combat units. And I'm not asking to be put on the front lines." She tightened her grip on her bow. "I'd be fine serving in reserve forces. I'm an archer anyway." Arthur stared at her. For a moment, he saw the little sister he had always tried to protect. But he also saw someone who had worked tirelessly to grow stronger. Someone who refused to remain helpless. Slowly, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "I can see how hard you've been working." Ellie's eyes brightened slightly. "I'm not saying no." Her face immediately lit up. But Arthur continued, "I'm also not sure this is a decision I can make alone." The excitement faded slightly. Arthur sighed. "Mom and Dad aren't here, and to be honest, he looked away. We haven't exactly been seeing eye to eye lately." Ellie blinked. "You still haven't made up after last time?" Arthur looked at her in surprise. "How did you know?" Ellie rolled her eyes. "I'm young, Arthur, not dumb." Arthur couldn't even argue with that. For a few moments, he thought carefully. Then an idea came to him. "How about this?" Ellie leaned forward immediately. Arthur smiled. "Come on a mission with me." Ellie's eyes widened. If you perform well, he continued, then you'll have my blessing. But I still can't speak for Mom and Dad. For a moment, Ellie simply stared. Then really? She practically launched herself at him. Arthur barely had time to react before she wrapped her arms around him in an excited hug. Thank you. Arthur laughed despite himself. Nearby, Sylvie smiled knowingly. That was surprisingly fair of you. Arthur glanced toward her. Maybe it was. Or maybe he simply knew that trying to stop Ellie entirely would never work. Just as the training session was winding down, the doors to the training grounds opened once again. Arthur turned and was surprised to see Queen Mariel entering the arena. The Queen of Eleanor moved gracefully through the spacious hall, her elegant robes flowing behind her as she approached. A gentle smile rested on her face as her eyes swept across the scene before her. It looks like another Leywin is preparing to help save the continent. Ellie immediately straightened, while Arthur offered a respectful nod. Your Majesty. Mariel waved her hand dismissively. Please, don't stop on my account. Continue your training. Arthur relaxed slightly. What brings you to the training grounds this late in the evening? The Queen glanced around the room before answering. I occasionally check on the children and young mages training here. Many of them are good kids, and quite a few happen to be citizens of Eleanor. Arthur smiled faintly. The royal couple of Eleanor had always been unusually involved with their people. Unlike many rulers who remained isolated behind palace walls, both Alduin and Mariel genuinely cared about the well-being of their citizens. Mariel looked around the nearly empty training grounds. I didn't expect the room to be completely cleared out. Her eyes briefly shifted toward Arthur, Ellie, and Sylvie, and I apologize if I interrupted what appeared to be a family conversation. Arthur shook his head. Don't worry about it. It wasn't anything serious. The Queen raised an eyebrow. Really? A knowing smile appeared on her face, because it sounded rather serious from where I was standing. Arthur coughed awkwardly. Mariel chuckled softly. Everyone is doing what they can to help in this war. Her gaze settled on Ellie. And Ellie is quite brave. The young girl straightened proudly. I imagine she takes after her brother. Meanwhile, Ellie had already moved back beside Sylvie and was helping the dragon girl stretch her aching arms after their training. As Mariel watched them, her expression softened. You know, she smiled wistfully. Ellie reminds me a little of Tessia. Arthur blinked. The mention of Tessia immediately brought back countless memories. Mariel laughed quietly. Do you remember the incident when Tessia overheard the castle chefs complaining about missing meat? Arthur immediately laughed. How could I forget? The memory was still vivid. Tess practically dragged me into an investigation. His smile widened. She was convinced some kind of criminal mastermind was operating inside the castle. Mariel covered her mouth as she laughed. And after all that effort, Arthur shook his head. We caught Virion stealing food, red-handed, Mariel added. The two shared a brief laugh. Arthur still remembered the sight of Virion sneaking around, despite supposedly being on a strict diet. Mariel's smile gradually faded into something more nostalgic. Tessia invited me to join her investigation at the time. Her gaze drifted toward the distance. But I was too busy dealing with tri-union meetings. She sighed softly. Back then, I thought those meetings were the most exhausting part of my life. A trace of sadness entered her voice. The endless debates, the politics, the disagreements. Her eyes lowered slightly. But honestly, she paused. Those were some of the most peaceful days we've ever had. Silence filled the room. Arthur understood exactly what she meant. Back then, the continent's biggest problems had been political disputes and trade negotiations. Now they were fighting for survival. Mariel smiled sadly. We should have appreciated those days more. For a moment, nobody spoke. Eventually, Mariel straightened herself and turned toward the exit. I should let you all get some rest. She offered them a final smile. Good night. As she began walking away, Arthur suddenly called out, Your Majesty. Mariel stopped and looked back. Arthur met her eyes. With the council's guidance, his voice carried a quiet determination. The Lances and I will do everything we can to make sure those peaceful days return. For a brief moment, Mariel simply stared at him. Then she smiled. A genuine smile. One filled with hope. I believe you will. With that, she left the training grounds. The doors closed behind her. Arthur, Ellie, and Sylvie stood in silence for several moments afterward. Each of them understood what was truly at stake. They weren't just fighting for victory. They were fighting for the chance to return to simpler days. The next 4 days passed quickly. Arthur spent nearly every waking hour training alongside both Ellie and Sylvie. Whenever he wasn't attending meetings or studying reports, he was in the training grounds helping them improve while simultaneously refining his own abilities. Despite already being a white core mage, Arthur continued pushing himself further. One of the areas he focused on was earth magic. Specifically, golem creation. Large stone constructs rose from the ground under his command, but controlling them properly proved far more difficult than he had expected. The larger the construct became, the harder it was to maintain precise control. Arthur couldn't help but think about Ulfrid. The dwarf had manipulated stone golems effortlessly. Then, his thoughts drifted toward Ren Kane. The eccentric Acheron inventor likely could have explained the process in minutes. Unfortunately, neither of them were here, and even if they were, Arthur doubted they would willingly give him lessons. Meanwhile, Ellie and Sylvie pushed themselves just as hard. By the end of each training day, both girls were usually physically and mentally exhausted. Ellie's control over pure mana continued improving steadily. She became increasingly efficient at creating and manipulating mana arrows without unnecessarily draining her core. Her precision improved. Her speed improved. Even her instincts during combat became sharper. Sylvie also continued making progress. Although she still hadn't unlocked any new abilities hidden within the depths of her core, her confidence in her human form grew significantly. Her movements became smoother, her balance improved, and controlling pure mana became almost second nature. Unfortunately, they still hadn't discovered whatever mysterious power remained dormant within her. Still, progress was progress. The three of them also spent time discussing battlefield coordination. While they never fully practiced fighting together as a unit, Arthur began forming strategies in his mind based on Sylvie's defensive abilities and Ellie's ranged attacks. Both girls were clearly becoming stronger. On the fourth day, after another exhausting session, Ellie and Sylvie collapsed onto the training ground floor simultaneously. Neither had enough energy left to stand. Arthur looked down at them and laughed. That was fun. Sylvie groaned. Maybe for you. Ellie nodded immediately. Definitely only for him. After resting for several minutes, Ellie looked towards Sylvie. Your pure mana attacks are getting way more versatile. She sat up slightly. And your shields are ridiculous. They hold up even against Arthur's elemental spells. Arthur immediately flicked her forehead. You shouldn't compare yourself to Sylvie. Ellie rubbed her head. Why not? Arthur pointed toward the dragon girl. Because she's a dragon. Sylvie proudly nodded. A very important detail. Arthur continued. Pure mana is practically all dragons can manipulate. And Aether, Sylvie added. He sat down beside them. For human mages, pure mana works differently. Ellie listened carefully. Arthur explained. Pure mana comes directly from a mage's core. It takes time to gather and purify. Elemental magic also draws from your core, but it additionally utilizes ambient mana from the environment. The small sphere floated above his hand. Pure mana spells are harder because they originate entirely from the caster. And once they're released, they're usually more difficult to control. Arthur looked directly at Ellie. That's why your ability to detonate mana arrows after firing them is genuinely impressive. Ellie's eyes widened. Really? Arthur nodded. A huge smile immediately spread across her face. The compliment clearly meant more to her than she wanted to admit. Then Ellie suddenly turned towards Sylvie, a spark of excitement lighting up her eyes. Can you make those moving panels again? I want to practice hitting them. Sylvie glanced over at her and smirked, clearly amused by the challenge. Then I should probably practice reacting to your arrows too. But then the doors to the training ground suddenly burst open. All three immediately turned. A soldier rushed into the room. His breathing was uneven, and his expression was tense. The moment Arthur saw his face, his own expression hardened. Something was wrong. The soldier quickly approached and saluted. Arthur stepped forward. What happened? The soldier swallowed. News has arrived from the wall. The atmosphere instantly changed. Every trace of relaxation vanished. Arthur's eyes narrowed. The soldier continued. A massive horde of corrupted beasts has been sighted. His voice grew even more serious. They're moving directly toward the wall. Silence fell over the training grounds. Now, the reality of war had come crashing back. The moment the soldier delivered the report, Arthur immediately understood what it meant. The smaller attacks and scattered skirmishes that had been occurring across the continent suddenly made sense. They had never been intended to achieve anything significant on their own. They had been probes, carefully planned tests meant to gauge Dicathen's defenses and reactions before the enemy committed to something far larger. A full-scale assault was coming. Arthur's expression hardened. Has the council been informed? He asked without hesitation. The soldier nodded immediately. Yes, Lance Arthur. The council has already been notified. Preparations are underway as we speak. Arthur gave a firm nod. Good, I'll report directly to Commander Virion. He turned to leave, but before he could take more than a few steps, Ellie suddenly called out. Wait. Arthur glanced back. Ellie stepped forward, determination written all over her face. I'm coming with you. Arthur immediately knew where this was going. You said you'd take me on the next mission. The excitement in her voice was genuine, but Arthur couldn't share it. This isn't some routine assignment, he said firmly. This is a massive horde of corrupted mana beasts. People could die. His gaze softened slightly. You could get seriously hurt. Then his voice dropped even lower. Or worse. For a brief moment, Ellie hesitated, but only for a moment. "You'll be there," she said. Arthur frowned. "And I'll be behind the wall." She crossed her arms stubbornly. "I won't be charging into the beast glades. I'll be fighting from one of the safest places on the battlefield." Arthur opened his mouth to argue again, but Sylvie stepped forward. "I think she has a point." Arthur looked toward her. Sylvie shrugged. "This is probably the safest opportunity she'll get to prove herself." She gestured toward Ellie. "She'll be standing on top of the wall firing arrows. That's basically target practice for an archer." Arthur wasn't convinced. "And if the beasts break through?" Sylvie's eyes met his. "They won't." There wasn't even a hint of doubt in her voice. "You won't let that happen." The confidence caught Arthur off guard. Before he could respond, the soldier cleared his throat. "The council is waiting." Lance Arthur. Arthur sighed. Part of him wanted to refuse outright. Another part knew that Ellie wasn't a child anymore. She had trained relentlessly. She had earned the right to at least be considered. Still conflicted, Arthur turned and began walking toward the door alongside Sylvie. Ellie remained where she was, watching silently. Then Arthur stopped. A few seconds passed. Finally, he glanced over his shoulder. "What are you waiting for?" Ellie's eyes widened. A grin spread across Arthur's face. "Let's go." The excitement on Ellie's face exploded instantly. She nearly tripped over herself rushing after them. "Really?" Arthur simply shook his head. "Don't make me regret it." The soldier led the group through the castle corridors before eventually bringing them to a military officer waiting nearby. Stopping before the man, the soldier saluted. "Officer Strajan will brief you on the situation at the wall." The officer stepped forward. "Officer Julor Strajan." He offered a respectful bow before continuing. "A member of my reconnaissance squad stationed near the Beastglades was responsible for spotting the approaching horde." Arthur folded his arms. "How bad is it?" Julor's expression darkened. "Large." That single word was enough to tell Arthur everything. Still, he allowed the officer to continue. "Based on the scouts' observations, this horde is unlike the smaller groups we've encountered recently. The numbers are significant." Sylvie crossed her arms. "They're still mana beasts. Even corrupted mana beasts were fundamentally different from retainers and scythes." Arthur agreed, but numbers could still be dangerous. "How long before they reach the wall?" Julor answered immediately. "At their current pace, no more than 2 days." Arthur nodded slowly. "Not much time. Not nearly enough. Anything else?" Julor shook his head. "That's all the information currently available." He straightened. "The commander has already been informed. The departure groups will be assembled at the teleportation docks within the hour." Arthur nodded. "Thank you, officer." Julor saluted before departing. Once he was gone, Arthur turned toward Ellie and Sylvie. "You two head down to the teleportation gate." Both looked at him. "I need to speak with Commander Virion first." Sylvie nodded. "We'll meet you there." Arthur watched them leave before making his way toward Virion's office. When Arthur entered the room, Virion was already waiting. "I assume Officer Strajan filled you in." Arthur nodded. "He did." Arthur crossed his arms. No sightings of retainers or scythes. Then his expression grew more serious. "But I'll keep my guard up regardless." Virion gave an approving nod. "A wise decision." The old commander stood from his desk. "Before you leave, though, I have something for you." Arthur raised an eyebrow. Virion moved toward a nearby stand where a carefully prepared set of armor rested. Arthur stared at it. The armor was impressive. Intricate engravings covered the metal plates, while finely crafted trimmings decorated the edges. A heavy fur mantle rested across the shoulders, giving it the appearance of something worthy of a king. Arthur immediately suspected Virion's involvement. Virion chuckled. "I know." Arthur didn't even need to say anything. "It's a little flashy." "A little?" Arthur asked. Virion ignored him. "But appearances matter." His expression softened slightly. "The soldiers at the wall need symbols right now." He gestured toward the armor. "They need to see their lance standing with them." Arthur stepped closer. Upon closer inspection, he realized the armor wasn't merely decorative. Every piece had been designed with combat in mind. The plates protected vital areas without restricting movement. The weight distribution was balanced perfectly. Unlike ceremonial armor, this was something he could actually fight in. Virion had clearly put a great deal of thought into it. A short time later, Arthur emerged fully equipped. The silver armor fit perfectly. The engraved plating reflected the room's light. The fur mantle draped across his shoulders completed the look. Virion stepped back and examined his work. A satisfied smile spread across his face. "Much better." Arthur looked down at the outfit. Then he glanced at the massive amount of fur covering it. He couldn't help himself. "You really like fur, don't you?" Virion burst into laughter. "I really do." He adjusted the mantle slightly. "That mantle is actually an old piece of mine." Arthur looked surprised. Virion nodded proudly. "I wore it when I was younger." His eyes sparkled with nostalgia. "Although, if I'm being honest, it looked better on me." Arthur laughed. Virion smirked. "But I'll let you borrow it anyway." For a moment, silence settled between them. Arthur looked at the old commander. Memories flooded back, their training sessions, Virion's lessons, the countless times the old man had guided him through impossible situations. The man had become far more than just a commander. He had become family. Arthur bowed his head sincerely. Thank you. Virion raised an eyebrow. For the armor? Arthur shook his head. For everything. For a brief moment, Virion's expression softened. Then the old commander smiled. If you really want to thank me, his eyes sharpened. Keep the wall from falling. Arthur straightened. The seriousness of the mission settled heavily upon his shoulders. He placed a fist over his chest. You have my word. And with that, fully armored and ready for war, Arthur turned toward the door and prepared to leave for the wall. As Arthur followed Virion down the grand staircase of the floating castle, he was surprised to see a large gathering waiting below. The entire council was there. Kings, queens, elders, commanders, and advisors stood gathered near the departure platform. Arthur raised an eyebrow. I wasn't expecting this many people. Virion chuckled beside him. Of course they're here. The old commander gestured toward the assembled leaders. They wanted to see you off. Arthur shook his head slightly, but couldn't deny the gesture was appreciated. Before he could say anything else, Virion motioned toward two waiting mages standing nearby. There are a few people I'd like you to meet. The two mages stepped forward immediately. This is Gavik Lund. The first man bowed respectfully. It is an honor to serve under you, Lance Arthur. Virion then gestured toward the second mage. And this is Callum Hembrel. Callum offered the same respectful bow. We'll be providing support at the wall. Arthur returned the greeting before his gaze shifted toward the massive flying mounts gathered near the edge of the platform. Several wind-attributed beasts waited patiently, while soldiers loaded supplies onto their backs. I assume we're traveling by air? Arthur asked. Virion nodded. Yes, he folded his hands behind his back. The closest teleportation gate is located in Blackbend City, and the train line still hasn't completed construction. His eyes drifted toward the horizon. Fortunately, the floating castle isn't too far from the wall. Arthur nodded in understanding. Then his attention shifted toward Sylvie, Ellie, and Boo. He looked at the dragon girl thoughtfully. Sylvie, will you be all right carrying Ellie while holding Boo? Sylvie crossed her arms confidently. If the trip isn't too long, I'll manage. Before Arthur could respond, Gavik stared at Sylvie and Ellie in disbelief. The little girl and her pet cub are coming too? His eyes widened. We're heading toward a horde of corrupted mana beasts. Arthur's expression immediately hardened. She's an adept conjurer. His voice carried enough authority to silence the mage instantly. She'll be valuable. Then, Arthur raised an eyebrow. And since when is it acceptable to refer to a general's sister as the little girl? Gavik froze. Realization dawned on his face. Oh, his expression immediately turned pale. My apologies, Lance Arthur. He bowed repeatedly. I didn't realize she was your sister. Before the situation could become any more awkward, Bund burst into laughter. The dwarf elder slapped Gavik on the shoulder hard enough to nearly knock him over. Relax, he grinned broadly. Gavik has a daughter around Ellie's age. His expression softened. He's just worried. Gavik nodded sheepishly. That's true. The tension quickly disappeared. Nearby, Queen Priscilla stepped toward Ellie. The queen's regal expression softened slightly. You possess remarkable talent for someone your age. Ellie immediately straightened her posture. Priscilla smiled. Your abilities will provide valuable support to the troops stationed at the wall. Ellie's face brightened. Thank you, Your Majesty. King Blaine then stepped forward. Unlike the others, his expression remained serious. He looked directly at Arthur. Take care of our soldiers out there. The weight behind those words wasn't lost on Arthur. Thousands of lives depended on what happened over the next few days. Arthur met the king's gaze. I will. His answer carried absolute certainty. Virion nodded approvingly. Then it's time. The commander raised his voice. Prepare for departure. Soldiers immediately began moving. Flying mounts were secured. Equipment was checked. Final preparations began. Arthur was about to head toward Sylvie when another voice called out behind him. Arthur, he turned. King Alduin and Queen Mariel stood nearby. Mariel held a small cloth bag in her hands. She offered it to him. Tessia isn't stationed at the wall right now. Arthur accepted the bag. Mariel smiled gently. But if, by some chance, you happen to run into her, she glanced toward the bag. I made her favorite candy. Arthur looked down before smiling. I'll make sure she gets it. Mariel laughed softly. You don't need to go searching for her. Then her eyes sparkled with amusement. You two always seem to find your way back to each other eventually. Arthur couldn't argue with that. At that moment, Sylvie moved forward. A brilliant flash of light erupted around her. Mana surged outward. Her body rapidly expanded. In only a few seconds, the small girl vanished. In her place stood a magnificent black dragon. Massive wings unfurled across the platform. Dark scales shimmered beneath the sunlight. The gathered council members watched in awe. Even after seeing her transformation before, it was difficult not to be impressed. Hun grinned broadly. "Good luck, boy," Arthur nodded. Then his eyes drifted toward Virion one last time. The old commander simply smiled. No further words were necessary. Everything that needed to be said already had been. Moments later, as they moved toward the edge of the platform, Arthur glanced downward. Clouds stretched endlessly beneath the floating castle. The ground was completely hidden from view. Sometimes he forgot just how high in the sky the castle truly was. The sight was enough to make even experienced mages uneasy. Arthur looked toward Ellie. "This is your last chance." Ellie immediately rolled her eyes. Arthur smirked. "You can still stay behind and enjoy all this comfort." He gestured toward the castle. The warm beds, the good food, the complete lack of giant corrupted monsters trying to eat you. Ellie crossed her arms. "You can't convince me now." Her expression remained completely determined. "I've already made up my mind." Then she glanced downward through the clouds. A nervous look appeared on her face. Although Arthur raised an eyebrow, Ellie swallowed. "I might be a little nervous about flying for the first time." Arthur laughed. "Just hold on tight." Sylvie turned her massive head slightly. "I won't drop you." Then her golden eyes shifted toward Boo. The bear cub was clinging to her scales with absolute terror. "And I won't drop you either." Boo let out a miserable whimper. That didn't seem to reassure him at all. Arthur couldn't help smiling. Then he looked toward the horizon. His expression hardened. "All right," Mana surged around him. "Let's move out." With a powerful beat of her wings, Sylvie launched into the sky. The group soared away from the floating castle and raced toward the wall. Hours passed. The sky gradually shifted from bright afternoon sunlight into the golden hues of evening. The journey was long. Eventually, both Ellie and Boo fell asleep. Ellie leaned against Sylvie's neck while Boo had practically wrapped himself around one of her scales. Arthur looked toward Sylvie. "It's been a few hours. How are you holding up?" Sylvie groaned dramatically. "It turns out that despite all my magical abilities and physical strength," she flapped her wings again, "I was not designed to be an efficient means of transportation." Arthur laughed. "We're almost there. You'll get some rest once we land." Sylvie huffed but continued flying. After a brief silence, she asked another question. "Are you ready?" Arthur looked toward her. "For what?" "The battlefield." Her voice became quieter. "You haven't fought in a real battle for a while." Arthur considered the question carefully. Then he answered honestly. "I'm not sure." His eyes drifted toward the distant horizon. "For the last 2 months, I've mostly been sparring against the same 5 mages." A faint smile crossed his face. In a strange way, his gaze sharpened. "Mana beasts are a lot more unpredictable than people." Sylvie laughed. "That's one way to look at it." A short while later, they approached the coastline. Suddenly, a massive splash erupted from the ocean below. The noise startled both Ellie and Boo awake instantly. Ellie nearly fell off Sylvie's back. Boo squealed in panic. Sylvie ignored them. "Arthur," her voice had become serious. "Look." Arthur followed her gaze downward. His eyes widened. Hundreds, no, thousands. The coastline below was overflowing with movement. An endless sea of mana beasts raced toward the wall. The sight stretched so far into the distance that Arthur couldn't immediately determine where the horde began or ended. The soldier's report echoed in his mind. The estimated size of the horde was close to 20,000 corrupted mana beasts. Most of them were between D-class and B-class. Dangerous in large numbers. But that wasn't the true threat. The report had included another detail. Several A-class beasts had been identified among the horde. And even worse, at least a dozen S-class mana beasts had been spotted. The scouts hadn't been able to get close enough for an exact count due to interference from Alacrian mages. But they were certain there were no fewer than 12. Ellie stared downward. Her face had gone pale. 20,000, even Sylvie looked shocked. A dozen S-class beasts. The scale of the attack was enormous. But when she looked toward Arthur, her surprise deepened. He wasn't worried. He wasn't frightened. He wasn't nervous. Arthur was smiling. His eyes burned with excitement. For the first time in months, he was about to face truly formidable opponents. And despite the danger waiting below, the Lance of Dicathen looked more ready than ever. Life atop the wall continued much as it always had, despite the looming threat approaching from the Beastglades. To an outsider, it might have appeared to be an ordinary day. Yet beneath the routine, tension lingered in the air. Everyone knew that a massive battle was coming. As preparations continued across the wall, the division captains made their way through the bustling streets and pathways built atop the enormous structure, passing rows of shops and military outposts. They eventually arrived at the outer edge of the wall and stopped. Their eyes turned skyward. They were waiting for Arthur's arrival. Moments later, a group of figures appeared in the distance. Flying swiftly through the air, Arthur and his companions approached the fortress before descending toward the landing area near the captains. As soon as they landed, Captain Trotius Flamesworth stepped forward to greet them. "General Arthur," he said with a polite nod. Arthur returned the greeting before acknowledging the other captains gathered nearby. Arthur offered the captains a faint smile as he stepped forward. "I didn't think I'd have the pleasure of meeting all of you again so soon." Behind Arthur, Sylvie landed gracefully before allowing her draconic form to dissolve. Her massive dragon body shimmered with mana before shrinking, transforming back into the small horned girl everyone had grown familiar with. Arthur glanced at her. "You should have stayed in your dragon form." Sylvie crossed her arms. "Why?" She gestured toward the crowd surrounding them. "Everyone is looking at you, not me." Arthur followed her gaze. People had already begun whispering amongst themselves. "Is that really the lance they sent? He looks younger than I expected." "That's General Arthur?" Arthur could hear every word. For a moment, he simply sighed. Then he stepped forward. Taking a deep breath, Arthur activated his aether-enhanced state. Instantly, pale energy began to surround him. The atmosphere changed. The pressure radiating from his body caused conversations throughout the area to gradually die down. Soon, hundreds of eyes were fixed solely on him. Arthur raised his voice. "The wall itself is an incredible fortress." His words echoed across the surrounding streets. "It was built for a single purpose: to protect our homes, our families, and our people." The crowd listened attentively. Arthur continued. "But while this structure is impressive, the soldiers defending it are even more remarkable." Many of the soldiers straightened instinctively at his praise. "My presence here may ultimately prove unnecessary," Arthur admitted. "However, I hope that I can help secure our victory while ensuring as few of our soldiers are lost as possible." Silence lingered for only a brief moment. Then cheers erupted from every direction. The tension that had been weighing on the soldiers seemed to ease. People smiled. Weapons were raised into the air. Confidence began spreading through the crowd. Arthur quietly released a breath. At least morale seemed to be improving. Turning away from the crowd, Arthur approached Captain Albanth. "There is something else," Arthur said. He motioned toward Ellie. "My sister would like to contribute to this battle. Her skills as a magical archer should be useful to the Bulwark Division." Captain Albanth studied Ellie for a moment. Arthur continued, "If you'd like, you can test her strength. There won't be any need for that." Captain Albanth shook his head. "A lance's word is more than enough for me and my men." He glanced toward Ellie. "If General Arthur believes she is capable, then I have no reason to doubt her." Ellie's face brightened. However, Albanth wasn't finished. "I'll also assign one of my most capable soldiers to accompany her." Ellie's expression immediately soured. "I don't need a babysitter." She crossed her arms. "I still have the pendant Arthur gave me." Arthur smiled faintly. "Extra precautions won't hurt." Ellie muttered something under her breath, but didn't argue further. Captain Albanth raised a hand. Stella, a female soldier, immediately stepped forward from the nearby ranks. "Yes, Captain?" Albanth gestured toward Ellie. "This is General Arthur's younger sister. Make sure she's properly equipped and escort her to the upper defensive positions." Stella saluted immediately. "Understood, Captain." She then turned toward Ellie. "Please follow me." Although Ellie still looked mildly annoyed, she obeyed. Once Ellie and Stella departed, Arthur turned back toward Captain Albanth. "My apologies." The captain raised an eyebrow. Arthur continued, "I didn't intend to burden one of your soldiers like this." His gaze drifted toward the towering fortress around them. "I thought the wall would be one of the safest places for her to begin serving." Captain Albanth's expression softened slightly. "Under normal circumstances, I'd agree with you." His eyes shifted toward the distant horizon beyond the wall. The approaching enemy remained far away, but everyone could feel its presence. However, Albanth said grimly, "Considering the size and strength of the army approaching us," he paused, "I can't honestly say anywhere here is completely safe anymore." For a moment, neither man spoke. The reality of what was coming settled heavily between them. Then Captain Trotius Flamesworth stepped forward. "The strategy meeting is about to begin." Following behind Trotius, the group headed toward the command room where the fate of the upcoming battle would soon be decided. As the captains gathered within the war room atop the wall, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. Outside, thousands of soldiers hurried through their duties, preparing for the largest battle many of them would ever witness. Inside, however, every decision carried the weight of countless lives. Captain Trotius Flamesworth stood at the head of the strategy table, his expression stern and businesslike as he reviewed the troop deployments laid out before them. The massive map spread across the table was covered with markers representing military units stationed throughout the wall's defenses. "Let's review our current troop distribution before we move on to battle strategy and tactical planning," Trotius announced. He pointed toward the map. Each large marker represents 1,000 troops. The smaller markers represent 100. These numbers do not include the freelance adventurers currently mobilized by the Bulwark Division. We estimate their numbers at roughly 2,000. The officers around the table studied the battlefield layout carefully. Captain Jesmaya spoke next. One of my scouting units returned only a few minutes before General Arthur arrived. Their commander will be joining us shortly to provide an updated report on the horde's movements. Trotius nodded. I expect more adventurers will continue arriving as word of the incoming horde spreads across the continent. However, those numbers won't significantly alter any plans we establish here today. His eyes shifted toward Arthur. Commander Virion has often praised your strategic judgment, General Arthur. Would you care to offer a plan of action? Several captains looked toward Arthur expectantly. Arthur remained calm. He had participated in countless strategy discussions since becoming a lance, but he knew better than to assume authority over a battlefield he barely understood. I'm still unfamiliar with many of the Wall's internal operations and the strengths of its divisions, Arthur replied honestly. It would be best if Captain Flamesworth led the discussion. I may offer suggestions where appropriate, but this battlefield is yours. Trotius inclined his head slightly, a small gesture, but one that revealed his approval. With that, the captain continued. As the meeting progressed, Arthur listened carefully. Though he still held little affection for Trotius Flamesworth after everything that had happened with Jasmine, he couldn't deny the man's competence. Trotius was efficient, cold, practical, at times, ruthlessly so, but those qualities made him exceptionally effective in a position of command. Arthur found himself reluctantly acknowledging that fact. Trotius moved several markers across the map. The fundamental objective is simple, he explained. We must kill as many corrupted beasts as possible before they reach the wall. His finger traced several paths across the battlefield. To accomplish that, multiple advance units will be deployed outside the wall's protective range. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. Those soldiers would be exposed. Some would never return. Trotius continued without hesitation. Several of these units will function primarily as delaying forces. Their purpose is to slow the enemy's advance and thin their numbers before the main engagement. Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly. Cannon fodder. Trotius hadn't used the phrase aloud, but the meaning was obvious. Lives would be spent to buy time, to buy positioning, to buy victory. It was the kind of decision commanders were forced to make during war, and it was exactly the kind of decision Arthur hated, yet even he couldn't immediately find a better alternative. Trotius pointed toward the advancing horde's projected path. Our greatest advantage is that the enemy appears to possess no real battlefield strategy. His finger tapped repeatedly against the map. The corrupted beasts are relying almost entirely on overwhelming numbers. Aside from a small number of Alacrian mages directing their movements, there appears to be little coordination among them. Captain Albanth nodded. That matches the scouting reports. Trotius continued. Because of that, we can exploit their lack of organization. He moved two groups of markers to opposite sides of the map. While a steady stream of soldiers and augmenters from the Bulwark Division engage the front lines and impede enemy movement, two Trailblazer Division units will move out ahead of time. His finger indicated both flanks. They will establish positions on either side of the approaching horde. Several captains leaned forward. Now the strategy was becoming clear. Trotius allowed himself a thin smile. When the battle begins, our forces will attack from three directions simultaneously. He pointed to the center. The Bulwark Division will engage the enemy head-on. Then to the left, one Trailblazer unit will strike from the western flank. Then to the right, the second Trailblazer unit will attack from the east. The beasts will be trapped in overlapping kill zones. The officers around the table exchanged approving looks. It was a brutal plan, but an effective one. Trotius continued his explanation. By forcing the horde to divide its attention and absorb attacks from multiple directions, we can drastically reduce their numbers before they ever reach the wall. His gaze shifted toward Arthur. And once the surviving beasts finally enter range, a slight smile crossed his face. The wall's conjurers, supported by General Arthur himself, should be more than capable of eradicating whatever remains. Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As Captain Trotius Flamesworth continued outlining the battle plan, Arthur's eyes remained fixed on the map spread across the table. The strategy was logical. It accounted for the wall's strengths, the enemy's weaknesses, and the overwhelming numbers of corrupted beasts advancing toward them. Yet despite all of that, A persistent sense of unease lingered in the back of his mind. Through their mental connection, Sylvie sensed his discomfort. While the lives of the soldiers being sent outside the wall certainly aren't cheap, she remarked thoughtfully, the plan seems fairly reasonable. Arthur shook his head slightly. No, it's not about that. Across the table, Trotius noticed Arthur's expression. The captain narrowed his eyes. Is something the matter, General Arthur? Arthur blinked before looking up. My apologies, he replied. I was simply thinking. Trotius folded his arms. Are you dissatisfied with the strategy I've proposed? Arthur paused. He wasn't certain how to explain the feeling. I'm not entirely sure whether this is a good strategy or a bad one yet, he admitted. However, his gaze drifted toward the battlefield map. I have a feeling this attack may be the enemy's last offensive on this front. Several captains exchanged confused looks. Captain Albanth frowned. What exactly do you mean by that? Arthur leaned forward. The Alacrians have been sending a steady stream of corrupted mana beasts toward the wall for quite some time now. He pointed toward the beast glades on the map. While effective, it's not a sustainable long-term strategy. His eyes shifted toward Captain Jesmia. You mentioned earlier that your Trailblazer division has cleared out most of the dungeons the Alacrians were using to conceal their teleportation gates, correct? Jesmia nodded immediately. That's correct. Arthur continued. We learned very quickly that the Alacrian teleportation gates hidden throughout the Beastglades have severe limitations. He tapped a finger against the table. Many of them can only be used a handful of times before becoming unstable. The room listened attentively. Even some of the more stable gates discovered by the Trailblazer division were deemed too dangerous for safe travel. Arthur's expression darkened. The fact that Alacria repeatedly gambled with the lives of its own soldiers just to move troops into Dicathen tells us quite a bit about their leadership. A few grim nods spread throughout the room. Agrona's ruthlessness was hardly a secret anymore. Arthur continued, with only a limited number of functioning gates available. Any Alacrian forces already inside the Beastglades would struggle to receive reinforcements or supplies. One of the officers spoke up. And with how dangerous the Beastglades are, they'd be lucky just to survive once those supplies run out. Exactly, Arthur said. He straightened, which is why I believe they may be committing everything they have left into this assault. The room grew quiet. Trotius studied him carefully. Even if I agree with that assessment, he said, how does it change our current situation? Arthur met his gaze. It changes the value of what we're sacrificing. Several officers leaned forward. Now they had his full attention. Arthur continued. If this truly is their final push, then we may need to reconsider our willingness to sacrifice soldiers simply to keep the wall perfectly intact. Captain Alban's eyes widened slightly. If there's a way to avoid sending my men into a single-file death march, then I'm listening. Captain Jesmia nodded immediately. So am I. Before either could continue, Trotius raised a hand. Hold on. The room fell silent. The captain looked directly at Arthur. While I'm certainly interested in preserving as many soldiers as possible, I'd prefer a strategy based on more than a feeling. Arthur nodded. Fair. He wasn't offended by the criticism. Trotius was doing exactly what a commander should do. This is partly speculation, Arthur admitted. But regardless of whether my theory is correct, my position remains the same. He looked around the room. Keeping our soldiers alive must remain our highest priority. The words carried weight, not because they were revolutionary, but because everyone present understood how difficult they were to uphold during war. Arthur continued, we need flexibility. His finger moved across the map. Soldiers can be reassigned. Another movement, they can reinforce weak points. Another, they can respond to new threats. He looked back at Trotius. A wall can't do any of those things. Trotius crossed his arms, and if the wall is severely damaged, Arthur waited. The captain continued, we would be risking one of the most important defensive structures protecting both Sapin and Eleanor. His voice hardened. If the wall ends up in ruins and an Alacrian army attacks immediately afterward, what then? Arthur stared at him for a moment. Then he asked a simple question. Would a fortified wall stop enemy mages more effectively than living mages would? The room went silent. Trotius didn't answer immediately. Arthur continued, I'm not suggesting we abandon the wall. He pointed toward sections of the massive fortress. I'm suggesting that we sacrifice portions of the structure instead of sacrificing the people defending it. Several captains exchanged surprised glances. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then Trotius slowly nodded. Go on. Arthur stepped forward. And for the next several minutes, he carefully outlined the strategy that had begun taking shape in his mind. Far away from the wall, deep within the fog-covered depths of the Elshire forest, another battle was unfolding. The clash was brief, brutal, and deadly. An Alacrian blade sliced through an elven soldier's chest. The elf froze. For a moment he remained standing. Then his body collapsed lifelessly onto the forest floor. Silence followed. The remaining members of the Alacrian team stood among the fallen elves, breathing heavily. Their armor was damaged, their bodies were exhausted, and their mission was far from over. As the group finally paused to catch their breath, Maeve immediately shattered any hope of rest. There isn't time for that. Her sharp voice cut through the silence. Put up the widest barrier you can manage. Then she gestured toward a nearby ditch. And once that's done, help me move these bodies. Without waiting for a response, she tossed a first aid pouch towards Cersei. Patch up Fane. Cersei caught the bag. Nearby, Fane grabbed the arrow protruding from his shoulder. Without hesitation, he ripped it free. Blood splattered across the ground. Cersei winced. Slow down. Fane barely reacted. While Cersei wrapped fresh bandages around the wound, the black-haired warrior stared down at him. Hurry up. His voice remained cold. Before I bleed to death. Cersei rolled his eyes but continued working. Then, Fane's expression darkened. This situation is your fault. Cersei paused. Fane pointed toward the forest. Ever since your little trip to that stream, we've been running non-stop. The accusation hung heavily between them. You realize what you've done? Fane asked. Every elf searching for us lowers our chances of completing this mission. Meanwhile, Maeve and Cole dragged the elven bodies toward the ditch. Fane continued, You're not the only one who's exhausted. His voice grew quieter. We all want to go home. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Cersei suddenly froze. His eyes widened. Maeve immediately noticed. What is it? Cersei's gaze shifted toward the forest. His senses stretched outward. Then his expression changed. Two more. Everyone tensed. Maeve reached for her weapon. They're approaching carefully. Cole cursed. The barrier won't hide us if they've already detected our magic. The situation had just become significantly worse. Fane immediately stepped forward. His spear tightened in his grip. He looked toward Maeve. Go. Maeve understood instantly. Without arguing, she motioned for the others to follow. Cersei stared at Fane. What are you doing? Before Fane could answer, Maeve spoke instead. Fane is the only one fast enough. Her expression remained grim. He's going to draw them away. Cersei's eyes widened. Maeve looked back toward the forest, then toward Fane. He's buying us time. The realization settled heavily over the group. Fane wasn't staying behind because he wanted to fight. He was staying behind because someone had to, and if the rest of them were going to survive long enough to complete their mission, someone needed to lead the pursuing elves away, even if it meant facing them alone. The scene shifted to Cersei, Maeve, and Cole, narrowly escaping yet another encounter. After putting some distance between themselves and the pursuing elves, the trio climbed high into the branches of a towering tree, concealing themselves beneath the thick canopy. As Cersei carefully stepped onto one of the branches, his exhausted body betrayed him. His foot suddenly slipped. For a split second, he lost his balance and began falling toward the forest floor. Maeve reacted instantly. Without hesitation, she lunged forward and caught his wrist in midair before he could make a sound. With surprising strength, she pulled him back onto the branch and steadied him before quietly signaling him to stay still. Once they were safely hidden again, Cole looked toward Cersei. Can you use true sense now? Cersei gave a quick nod. Closing his eyes, he activated his emblem. A ghostly spiritual figure slowly emerged from his body, slipping silently through the dense forest. Invisible to anyone around it, the spectral form drifted between the towering trees, searching every path ahead without leaving even the slightest trace of its presence. Several tense moments later, the spirit returned. Cersei's eyes snapped open, and for the first time in days, genuine excitement spread across his face. We're almost there, he whispered. It'll only take another couple of days. The news immediately lifted everyone's spirits. Maeve let out a long sigh of relief. She opened her mouth, ready to say something, but Cersei suddenly raised his hand. Someone was nearby. Down below, two elven soldiers slowly moved through the forest, carefully inspecting the surroundings. One of them looked frustrated. We should head back, he muttered. We've already strayed far enough from our survey route. We're miles away from the last reported sighting. He glanced toward his companion. Are you sure you heard something? The other elf was none other than Albald. He shook his head slightly. It wasn't exactly a sound. He narrowed his eyes while scanning the trees. It was more of an inkling. The other soldier sighed heavily. If you weren't a choffer, I would have left you behind already. He gestured toward the signal flare at his waist. We should notify General Aya. But Albald immediately shook his head. No, we just need to catch that one damned Alacrian. Once we have him, we'll learn where the others are hiding. Hidden above them, Cersei, Maeve, and Cole exchanged silent glances. A wave of relief washed over them. If the elves were still searching for only one Alacrian, then Fane had survived. The second elf clicked his tongue in annoyance. I still don't understand how that Alacrian managed to make it this far north. Cersei silently prayed. Just keep walking, please. Just walk past us. But fate had other plans. Albald suddenly stopped walking. His instincts screamed at him. His eyes slowly drifted upward. For one brief moment, his gaze locked directly onto Cersei's. They had been discovered. Cersei immediately sprang from the tree and bolted through the forest at full speed. Without needing a single word, Maeve and Cole stayed behind. Their job was clear. They would stop the pursuing elves long enough for Cersei to escape. As branches whipped past his face, Cersei forced himself to keep running. Please, make it out safely, after putting enough distance between himself and the others. Cersei finally stopped. Breathing heavily, he immediately began preparing the spell. I'm doing great, I just have to survive. For Seth. Without hesitation, he bit into his own hand. Blood dripped onto the magical array beneath him, serving as the catalyst that amplified the spell's power. The crimson markings began glowing. Then, a sudden sound echoed behind him. Cersei spun around. Nothing. The forest stood completely silent. He forced himself to calm down. If someone was really there, they would have killed me already. Taking another deep breath, he resumed running, carving magical marks onto passing trees as he moved. It's almost over. He reminded himself of his role. He wasn't a striker like Fane. He wasn't a caster like Maeve. He wasn't a shield like Cole. He was a sentry. Respected, valuable, but nearly defenseless in direct combat. As he continued maintaining the spell, darker thoughts began creeping into his mind. Had they already gone ahead without him? Had they already entered the afterlife? Cole would have protected Maeve and Fane first. He always would. Which meant Cole was probably the first to fall, and without him, Maeve would have been next. Cersei desperately pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the spell. His blood continued feeding the glowing array as he quietly repeated the words like a prayer. Blood, honor me. Light, guide me. Vritra, protect me. The spell finally completed. Just then, movement. Cersei instantly hid behind a nearby tree. A figure emerged from the bushes. For one terrifying moment, he prepared himself for another enemy, but then he recognized the familiar silhouette. It was Fane. His body was drenched in blood. Deep wounds covered him from head to toe, yet somehow he was still standing. The moment he saw Cersei, he gave him a tired look before speaking. You look like shit. Cersei opened his mouth to ask what had happened, but Fane immediately cut him off. Quiet, we don't have time. He looked Cersei directly in the eyes. Can you still run? Cersei nodded. I can. Without another word, Fane shoved him backward. Then run. I'll hold him off. Before Cersei could even react, a figure burst from the forest. Albald had caught up. Fane didn't hesitate for even a second. With a powerful burst of mana, he lunged straight toward the elven warrior, driving his spear forward with lethal force. But Albald remained perfectly composed. With flawless timing, he intercepted the attack, blocking Fane's spear head-on as the clash echoed through the forest. Meanwhile, atop the wall, Arthur spent the quiet hours before the battle sparring with the soldiers stationed there. Rather than simply drilling them through repetitive exercises, he corrected their mistakes one by one, refining their techniques with every exchange. Another duel came to an end as a soldier's sword was knocked from his grasp, the weapon clattering loudly against the stone floor. Arthur lowered his blade and calmly pointed out the flaw. Your movements are too stiff. Keep your shoulders and wrists relaxed until the very last moment of your swing. If you can't do that, then the sword you're using is simply too heavy for you. The soldier bowed gratefully. Thank you for the guidance, General. Arthur gave him a nod before looking toward the gathered crowd. Next, before another soldier could step forward, a familiar voice called out behind him. I thought you said you were going to try getting some rest before setting out. Arthur turned to find Sylvie walking toward him in her human form. He smiled faintly. I tried. He shrugged. But I couldn't fall asleep, so I figured I'd warm up instead. Might as well help train a few soldiers while I'm at it. Sylvie folded her arms, amused. I should have known. She glanced toward the towering battlements before asking, So, how was your trip to the top of the wall? And how's Ellie doing? Arthur looked up toward the fortress above them. She's adjusting surprisingly well. Captain Albinth has her practicing alongside the other archers. She's already shooting from the top of the wall. And it looks like quite a few of the soldiers stationed up there aren't much older than she is. He paused, watching groups of young soldiers preparing for war. Soldiers really are getting younger and younger. Just then, another soldier hurried over and saluted. General Arthur. Arthur acknowledged him. What is it? The soldier began his report. Captain Albinth and the Bulwark Division have already begun tearing down most of the support beams beneath the underground passages, just as you instructed. Arthur nodded. And Captain Jesmia, she's currently repositioning her Trailblazer division around both ends of the wall. Arthur gave another approving nod. The soldier hesitated before speaking again. General, Arthur noticed the uncertainty in his expression. What is it? The soldier looked toward Sylvie before asking carefully, Is it really necessary for just you and Lady Sylvie to leave the wall by yourselves? Arthur immediately understood what he meant. The two mages Commander Virion had assigned to accompany him, Gavik Lund and Callum Hembrel, had both volunteered to fight beside him outside the wall. Arthur smiled reassuringly. I know Commander Virion sent the two of you here to assist me in defending the wall, but that doesn't mean you have to stand beside me on the battlefield. He gestured toward the fortress behind them. I need capable mages protecting this place just as much. So stay here and defend the wall. The soldier still looked reluctant, but eventually straightened his posture. Understood, General. After the soldier departed, Sylvie looked sideways at Arthur. We could have used their help. She smiled knowingly. They seemed pretty determined to come with us. Arthur's expression softened. I noticed something while we were flying here. He glanced toward the wall. Gavik was carrying a pendant. There was a picture inside. It looked recent. He paused. The little girl in it couldn't have been much older than Ellie. Sylvie gave him a sarcastic smile, and here I was, thinking my bond had become awfully cold toward these poor soldiers. Arthur chuckled. I'd rather send fathers back home to their children than drag them into unnecessary danger. Sylvie raised an eyebrow. It seems you've gotten better at keeping your thoughts from leaking into mine. Arthur smirked. A man's got to keep a few secrets. The two shared a quiet laugh. Then another familiar voice interrupted them. Mind if I have a go? Arthur froze for a brief moment. He recognized that voice instantly. Turning around, he found Tessia standing only a few steps away, smiling warmly at him. She looked just as graceful as he remembered. Before Arthur could even speak, Sylvie's eyes lit up. Tess. She rushed forward and wrapped Tessia in a tight hug. We really missed you. Tessia blinked in surprise before laughing softly. It took her a second to realize who she was looking at. Sylvie? She stared at the young girl in disbelief. This was the first time she had ever seen Sylvie's human form. Arthur couldn't help smiling. Sylvie had always adored Tessia. There had even been a time when his bond had innocently called Tessia Mama, much to everyone's embarrassment. Sylvie stepped back and tilted her head. You recognized me? Tessia smiled gently. I would have recognized you anywhere. Arthur could tell Tessia was still trying to process the impossible sight before her. The little fox she had once carried around was now standing before her as a young girl. Tessia explained that her squad had reached the wall only about an hour earlier. They had been withdrawn from the beast glades ahead of the approaching corrupted beast horde. Sylvie smiled warmly. I'm really happy to see you. She glanced toward the distant battlefield beyond the wall. I just wish it were under better circumstances. Tessia nodded. I feel the same. She looked Sylvie up and down with an affectionate grin. But I still can't get over how cute, and honestly, how pretty you look in this form. Sylvie placed her hands proudly on her hips. Back in Ephiodus, grandmother always said I'd grow into a very beautiful dragon. Arthur blinked. He wasn't entirely convinced. A 20-foot-long pitch-black dragon covered in obsidian scales with glowing golden eyes and dagger-like horns wasn't exactly what most people imagined when they heard the word pretty. Tessia couldn't help laughing. Is this really how you two talk inside your heads all day? Sylvie immediately answered. We've actually been having very mature conversations. Then she glanced sideways at Arthur with a teasing smile. But now that you've shown up, your presence must be affecting him. Arthur sighed before reaching over and pinching Sylvie's cheek. And there's the snarky little attitude I've missed so much. Sylvie pouted while rubbing her cheek, causing Tessia to giggle. After the laughter settled, Tessia turned back toward Sylvie. As much as I've enjoyed catching up with you, her emerald eyes shifted to Arthur. Would you mind if I borrowed Arthur for a little while? Sylvie looked back and forth between Arthur and Tessia before smiling knowingly. I'll leave you two alone for a while. Without waiting for either of them to object, she waved goodbye and casually walked off, disappearing into the lively streets built atop the wall. As she left, her voice echoed inside Arthur's mind through their bond. Try to enjoy yourself while you're with her. She paused before adding in a softer tone. Stop thinking about the war, just for a little while. Arthur smiled to himself, but didn't respond. For once, Sylvie wasn't wrong. Meanwhile, Arthur and Tessia began walking side by side through the bustling marketplace that stretched across the top of the wall. After stealing another glance at Sylvie disappearing into the crowd, Tessia smiled. It's surprisingly easy to get used to seeing Sylvie in that form. She let out a small laugh before turning toward Arthur. So, she gracefully gestured down the street. Shall we? Arthur smiled politely before extending an arm toward the road ahead. After you, Princess. Tessia rolled her eyes playfully before walking ahead, while Arthur followed beside her. The marketplace was as lively as ever. Merchants called out to passing customers. Children ran between stalls. The scent of freshly cooked food drifted through the air. For a brief moment, it almost felt impossible to believe that an army of nearly 20,000 corrupted mana beasts was marching toward the wall. As the two walked together, one of the merchants suddenly looked up from his stall. His eyes widened in surprise. Princess Tessia. He immediately greeted her with a respectful smile. What a pleasant surprise. He looked apologetically toward his empty shelves. My stall's already closed for the day, but I'd love to have you visit again sometime. Tessia smiled warmly. Of course. She pointed toward his display. I'll stop by again after the battle. Then, with a grin, she added, so make sure you save some of those fish snacks for me. The merchant laughed. It would be my honor. Arthur quietly observed the exchange. It felt strange, walking peacefully through a marketplace beside Tessia, laughing with merchants, watching ordinary people go about their lives. It almost made him forget that tomorrow they would all be fighting for their survival against thousands of monstrous beasts. Before he could dwell on the thought, an excited voice suddenly called out, Princess Tessia. A young girl came running through the crowd as fast as her little legs could carry her. She stopped in front of Tessia, slightly out of breath. Now that you're finally here, my master finished your new armor. She's been working on it this whole time. Arthur watched the interaction quietly. Standing beside Tessia filled him with an unfamiliar sense of comfort. She was someone who had been part of his life for years, someone who had remained beside him through countless memories. It was a feeling he hadn't realized he had been missing. Tessia smiled at the little girl. Thanks for letting me know, Nat, she nodded. Tell Senor I'll come by later tonight, and thank her for the message. Nat beamed happily. I will. The young girl waved enthusiastically before running back toward her master. Arthur and Tessia both waved goodbye until she disappeared into the crowd. As they continued walking, Arthur found himself lost in thought. For the first time in what felt like forever, his responsibilities as a lance, his duties as a general, the countless decisions that carried the weight of thousands of lives. None of them occupied his mind. Instead, he simply enjoyed walking beside someone important to him. Still, that peace only made another realization grow stronger. Ever since accepting the responsibilities of protecting Dicathen, he had slowly begun turning back into the person he had once been in his previous life. The cold, calculating duty-bound King Grey. The difference was that this world had given him something his previous life never had. People he genuinely loved. People he wanted to protect, and somehow that made everything even harder, because every decision now carried the fear of losing someone precious. He felt as though he had to become perfect. He couldn't afford mistakes, not if he wanted to keep everyone alive. While Arthur remained lost in those thoughts, Tessia glanced toward him. She caught him staring. A teasing smile slowly spread across her face. What? She tilted her head mischievously. Have we really been apart for so long that you've finally realized how pretty your childhood best friend is? Arthur blinked. Normally, he would have brushed the comment aside. Instead, he smiled. Actually, yes. The answer caught Tessia completely off guard. Color immediately rushed into her cheeks. She looked away, suddenly flustered. It's good that you finally noticed. Trying to hide her embarrassment, she quickly pointed farther down the street. There's a place over there I've always wanted to try. It looks like they're still open. Without waiting for an answer, she reached over and grabbed Arthur's hand. Come on. She pulled him through the marketplace toward the small food stall. A few minutes later, Tessia took her first bite. Her eyes instantly sparkled. This is amazing. She happily took another bite. It's way better than the food they serve back at Xyrus. Arthur couldn't help laughing. As Tessia continued eating enthusiastically, a small smear of sauce found its way onto her cheek. Arthur quietly pulled out a handkerchief and gently wiped it away. She barely even noticed. Her eyes were already locked onto the untouched plate sitting in front of Arthur. You aren't eating that. She slowly reached toward his plate. Are you? Arthur immediately slid the plate just out of reach. Tessia pouted dramatically, as expected of a lance. Arthur grinned. Of course. It's imperative for every lance to master the sacred art of defending their food from treacherous allies. Tessia laughed. You make it sound like battlefield training. Arthur chuckled before finally sliding the plate toward her. Go ahead. Tessia didn't hesitate for even a second. She happily claimed the food for herself. After finishing their meal, the two stepped back into the lively streets. Arthur smiled. I'll have to bring Ellie here sometime. Tessia looked genuinely surprised. Ellie's here? Arthur nodded. She's on the highest level of the wall, getting in some last-minute training. He looked toward the towering battlements. She should be safe up there. Then he added, and Mom and Dad are in Blackbend right now, so at least I don't have to worry about them. Tessia smiled softly. You've really thought of everything. Before Arthur could respond, Tessia suddenly noticed something displayed in a nearby shop. Her eyes lit up. Karia would absolutely love those. She turned back toward Arthur. Wait here. I'll only be a minute. Arthur smiled. Take your time. As Tessia disappeared into another shop, Arthur wandered toward a nearby merchant's stall. An elderly shopkeeper welcomed him with a warm smile. Feel free to look around, General. Arthur quietly browsed the small collection of handmade items before eventually stopping. His eyes settled on one particular piece. I'd like to buy this. The elderly woman looked at him with surprise before recognizing who he was. General Arthur? She smiled kindly. Please, take it. It's on the house. Arthur gently shook his head. I appreciate the offer. But this is a gift. I'd feel much better paying for it myself. Before the elderly woman could respond, the young boy helping around the shop suddenly blurted out. Is it for the pretty lady with the silver hair over there? The old woman immediately gave him a gentle tap on the shoulder. That's enough. She turned back toward Arthur with an apologetic smile. We're honored to have your business, General. Arthur thanked her, paid for the gift, and walked away. Only after he had disappeared into the crowd did the old woman finally look down at the coins he had left behind. Her eyes widened. Arthur hadn't paid the item's price. He had left behind a single gold coin worth many times more than the gift itself. Tessia happily stuffed another donut into her mouth before holding the bag out toward Arthur. Want one? Arthur looked at her with an amused smile. What happened to buying those for Karya? Tessia blinked innocently before swallowing. I did. Hers are safely stored inside my dimension ring. Arthur couldn't help chuckling. He slowly raised a hand. Actually, I have something for you. Tessia tilted her head curiously. Arthur reached into his own dimension ring and pulled out a small cloth pouch. Holding it out to her, he smiled. Your mother asked me to give this to you if I happened to see you. He handed her the bag. She said it's your favorite. Tessia's emerald eyes lit up. She quickly accepted the pouch and eagerly opened it. The moment she looked inside, an even brighter smile spread across her face. It's my favorite candy. She looked back at Arthur. Thank you for bringing it. Arthur simply smiled. I'm just the messenger. After watching her happily tuck the candy away, Arthur asked, So, when do you leave for your next mission? Tessia's cheerful expression softened. Later tonight. There was a brief silence. Arthur hesitated before awkwardly scratching the back of his head. He looked away for a second before meeting her eyes again. There's somewhere I'd like to show you before you leave. Tessia quietly stared at him for a moment. Then, without saying a word, she smiled gently and reached out, taking his hand. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. Together, the two walked away from the marketplace, leaving behind the noise of merchants and soldiers, until they finally reached one of the highest overlooks along the wall. From there, the view stretched endlessly across the horizon. Towering mountain ranges rose proudly in the distance. Beyond them lay the vast expanse of the Beastglades, bathed in the warm colors of the setting sun. Arthur looked toward the breathtaking landscape. The view from here, he smiled softly, is even better than the one from the floating castle. Tessia slowly walked toward the edge. The wind gently carried her silver hair behind her as she gazed across the distant mountains. For a long moment, she simply admired the scenery in silence. Then, she turned toward Arthur. A warm smile appeared on her face. I wanted to say this earlier. She paused briefly. It's been a while. Art, hearing the old nickname again, made Arthur smile instinctively. After standing together for another quiet moment, he finally asked, So, where are you heading after this? Tessia's expression became more serious. My squad, along with several other elves from the Trailblazer division, is being deployed to Elenoir. Arthur immediately understood why. Because of the recent Alacrian attacks? She nodded. Captain Jesmia received reports confirming multiple sightings of Alacrian stragglers throughout the forest. Arthur folded his arms thoughtfully. She had a difficult decision to make, especially with a beast horde this large approaching the wall. Eventually, Arthur sat down near the overlook. After a brief pause, he quietly admitted, I'm actually glad you won't be here for tomorrow's battle. Tessia immediately crossed her arms with a playful smirk. Your loss. She proudly lifted her chin. I may not be a match for a lance yet, but I recently broke through to the mid-silver stage. Arthur looked genuinely impressed. Congratulations, Tessia laughed. I can't help but wonder, when will the mighty General Arthur Leywin, who, by the way, is younger than me, finally start treating me like someone capable of taking care of herself? Arthur smiled apologetically. I didn't mean it like that. He looked directly at her. I know you can take care of yourself. His voice softened. Actually, spending today with you made me realize just how much you've changed. Tessia tilted her head. Should I take that as a compliment? Arthur nodded. I meant it as one. He searched for the right words. You've changed. Not your mana, not your strength. He paused. It's more like... Tessia leaned slightly closer. Like what? Arthur froze. His thoughts suddenly spiraled inward. How long had he loved Tessia? Would she still look at him the same way if she learned the truth about him? If she discovered that the soul inside Arthur Leywin belonged to someone who had lived an entirely different life, would she react the way his parents had? Would she see him as a stranger? No, none of that mattered. He shouldn't be thinking about this. He needed to bury those thoughts. Lock them away. Forget them. Tessia watched him struggle to find the words before smiling teasingly. It seems the mighty lance is finally speechless. Arthur laughed quietly. The tension eased for just a moment. Tessia turned back toward the breathtaking view. Thank you for bringing me here. She looked across the beast glades. I've always thought of this place as somewhere filled with danger, bloodshed, and monsters. I never realized it could be this beautiful. Arthur gazed at the same landscape. I've always loved this view. His expression became distant. But this place also reminds me of one of my worst memories. He looked at Tessia. So I thought, maybe coming back here with you would help replace it with a better one. Tessia's smile became softer than ever. Has it? Arthur looked into her emerald eyes. Has it made the memory any better? For a moment, everything around him seemed to disappear. The war, his responsibilities, the thousands of soldiers waiting for tomorrow. None of it mattered. Only Tessia remained. Then another voice echoed inside his own heart. Don't be selfish. Confessing now would only burden her. She was leaving for another mission. A brutal battle awaited both of them. Wouldn't it be kinder to stay silent? Arthur closed his eyes. No, if tomorrow became his last day, he couldn't leave these feelings unspoken. Slowly, he reached into his dimension ring. Pulling out the small gift he had secretly purchased at the marketplace, he gently took Tessia's hand. He placed a delicate necklace into her palm. Tessia looked down in surprise. Her eyes sparkled. It's beautiful. She smiled brightly. Is this, she giggled, a reward for the wonderful tour I gave you today? Arthur slowly shook his head. No, his heart pounded harder with every passing second. He looked directly into her eyes. I bought it because I like you. Tessia froze. Every trace of her playful smile disappeared. For several long seconds, she simply stared at him. Then, still trying to process what she had heard, she laughed nervously. I am sorry. I must have misheard you. She looked down at the necklace before looking back at him. I thought you said, Arthur interrupted her gently. I like you, Tess. Silence. Tessia's cheeks slowly turned crimson. She lowered her gaze before quietly asking, what kind of like? She forced out a shy smile. Like a friend? Or like a sister? Arthur didn't hesitate. He stepped closer. Gently taking both of her hands into his own, he looked straight into her emerald eyes. Every uncertainty, every fear, every doubt vanished. With complete sincerity, he spoke the words he had carried in his heart for so long. I love you, Tessia Aerolith. The world itself seemed to fall silent. Only the sound of the wind remained as Tessia stood completely frozen, her wide emerald eyes locked onto Arthur, unable to believe the confession she had just heard. Tessia stood frozen in place. The confession echoed through her mind again and again, as if her heart refused to believe what it had just heard. The wind gently swept across the overlook, carrying strands of her silver hair through the air, but she barely noticed. Arthur loved her, not as a friend, not as a childhood companion, not as the Princess of Eleanor. He loved her. Arthur watched the storm of emotions playing across her face and, despite all his courage moments ago, suddenly felt nervous. Still holding her hands, he spoke again. I hope, he paused, searching for the right words. I hope you feel the same way. A small smile appeared on his face. And maybe we can start a relationship together. Tessia blinked several times. She looked at him as if she still wasn't convinced this was real. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, You're lying. Arthur immediately shook his head. I'm not. His answer came without hesitation. Then he looked directly into her eyes and asked softly, Do you want me to be? Tessia opened her mouth but couldn't immediately answer. Her face was already turning red. I don't know. She laughed nervously, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. It's just, I always imagined this happening differently. Arthur listened quietly. Tessia's cheeks grew even redder. I thought, she struggled to continue. I thought I'd have to become stronger. Her eyes dropped slightly. And prettier. Then she glanced back at him. And older. A shy smile appeared on her face. I thought I'd have to wow you first. She laughed softly. And sweep you off your feet. Arthur immediately seized the opportunity. Can I still look forward to that part? Tessia's face turned completely crimson. Arthur, she pointed threateningly toward the edge of the mountain. Keep talking like that and I'll sweep you right off the mountainside. Arthur laughed. For the first time in what felt like forever, neither of them were thinking about war. Neither of them were thinking about responsibilities. For just a few precious moments, they were simply Arthur and Tessia. After calming down slightly, Tessia looked at the necklace resting in her palm. Then she extended it toward him. She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she simply smiled. "Can you help me put it on?" Arthur carefully took the necklace. For a moment, Tessia expected him to clasp it around her neck. Instead, he surprised her. Using a small amount of mana, Arthur separated the necklace into 2 matching halves. Holding one piece up, he smiled. "Half for you." Then he held up the other half. "And half for me." Tessia's face somehow managed to become even redder. Her heart felt like it was going to explode. Still, a beautiful smile spread across her face. Using her mana, she gently pulled the second half from Arthur's hand. Then she stepped behind him. "Turn around." Arthur obeyed. "And bend down a little." She folded her arms. "Some of us aren't giants." Arthur chuckled before lowering himself. Carefully, almost reverently, Tessia placed the necklace around his neck. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The matching pendants rested against their chests. A silent promise, a symbol that connected them no matter how far apart they might be. Then, before Arthur could turn back around, Tessia wrapped her arms around him from behind. She rested her forehead against his back. Her voice was soft, gentle, and filled with emotions she had hidden for years. "I love you too." She squeezed him tighter. "Idiot." Arthur closed his eyes. A smile appeared on his face. For a brief moment, everything felt perfect. But Tessia slowly loosened her embrace. Her expression became more serious. Right now, she looked toward the distant horizon. "We're at war." Arthur nodded. Tessia continued quietly. "We both have responsibilities, and there are people counting on us." Arthur turned toward her. "I know." His voice was calm. "There are still many things I want to tell you." He gently took her hand again. "But for now, how about we make a promise?" Tessia tilted her head. "A promise?" Arthur nodded. His grip tightened slightly. "A promise to stay alive." Tessia stared at him. Arthur continued. "A promise that no matter what happens, we'll survive." His eyes never left hers. "So we can have a future together. A real relationship. A home. A family." The words struck deeper than any confession. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, lost in each other's eyes, both imagining a future beyond the war, a future they desperately wanted to reach. Eventually, Tessia smiled. A genuine smile, the kind Arthur wanted to protect forever. "I promise." Arthur smiled back. For the first time in a long while, hope felt real. He opened his mouth to say something else, but suddenly a distant roar echoed across the horizon. Arthur's expression instantly changed. Every instinct in his body screamed at him. His head snapped toward the beast glades. "What?" The smile vanished from his face. "That's impossible." His senses expanded. The vast sea of mana stretching beyond the wall flooded into his awareness. And then he felt it. Thousands. No, tens of thousands. Corrupted mana beasts. Moving, charging, advancing far faster than they should have been. Arthur's eyes widened. The reports were wrong. His voice turned grim. "They're moving much faster than expected." He stared into the distance. Even from here, he could feel the monstrous wave approaching. There was no doubt anymore. The beast horde would reach the wall by dawn. The battle was beginning, much sooner than anyone had prepared for. Far away, deep within the forests of Eleanor, another desperate struggle was unfolding. Cersei sprinted through the dense woods with everything he had left. His lungs burned. His muscles screamed. Branches whipped against his face as he pushed himself forward. "Don't look back." The thought repeated over and over in his mind. Just keep running. Behind him, Fane was buying time. The powerful Alacrian warrior had thrown himself directly into the path of Albald and the pursuing elves. But even Fane had limits. And Albald was a monster. The elf's strength was overwhelming. The distance between them echoed with the sounds of steel clashing against steel. Then a flash of silver. A sharp cut. Blood sprayed through the air. One of Fane's arms spun through the air before crashing onto the forest floor. Albald's blade had severed it in a single strike. Yet somehow, Fane remained standing. Even after losing an arm, even while bleeding heavily, he continued blocking Albald's advance, refusing to let him pass. Then another danger appeared. An elven archer emerged from the trees. The elf ignored Fane entirely. Instead, he drew his bow. His target wasn't the warrior, it was Cersei. The string pulled taut, the arrow locked onto its mark, and then, twang, the arrow shot forward like a streak of light, straight toward Cersei's head. There was no time to dodge, no time to react. Death was only moments away. Then a blur moved between them. Fane, despite his injuries, despite losing an arm, he still managed to intercept the shot. The arrow slammed into him instead. Fane grunted but didn't fall. Instead, he glared towards Cersei. "Idiot." His voice thundered through the forest. "Didn't I tell you to keep running?" Cersei stared at him in shock. Blood poured from Fane's wounds. One of his arms was gone, yet he was still fighting. Still standing, still protecting him. "Fane." But Fanny cut him off immediately. "I don't need that arm to cover you." His voice remained firm despite the pain. "You need to focus." His eyes burned with determination. "Everything we've done, everything we've sacrificed, it all comes down to the final array." He pointed deeper into the forest. "Finish it." Another clash erupted as Albald attacked again. Fane stepped forward to meet him. "Complete the array." His voice echoed behind Circe. "And our mission succeeds." Fane tightened his grip on his spear, despite the blood pouring from his wounds. With only one arm left, he looked over his shoulder toward Circe and shouted, "Can you do it?" Circe forced himself to meet Fane's eyes and nodded without hesitation. "I can." That single answer was all Fane needed. Without another word, he turned back toward the enemy. At that exact moment, Albald burst through the trees like a streak of green lightning, instantly closing the distance between them. His blade flashed as he lunged straight for Fane, refusing to give the Alacrians even a second to breathe. Watching the relentless elf charge forward, Circe's heart sank. If this elf is still here, then Maeve and Cole must have already fallen. The thought struck him like a dagger. His comrades had risked everything to buy him time. Now, he had to make sure their sacrifices meant something. Clenching his fists, Circe whispered to himself, "Our lives are the light that will guide Alakria to victory." His expression hardened with determination. Without hesitating, he pulled a small knife from his belt. Then, dragging the blade across his own palm, he sliced it open. Fresh blood streamed from the wound. Looking down at the array spread across the forest floor, he muttered, "I'll need blood to make this one stronger." He let his blood drip onto the magical formation, feeding it with his own life force. The runes immediately began glowing brighter, but it still wasn't enough. The spell wasn't complete. Still, too weak. Before he could continue, a sharp blast of magic tore through the air. The attack slammed directly into his shoulder. Circe was thrown sideways as blood splattered across the ground. The pain nearly caused him to lose consciousness. At the same instant, Albald launched another devastating attack. Fane tried to intercept it, but this time, even he couldn't stop it completely. The impact hurled him through the forest. His battered body smashed violently into a tree only a few feet away from Circe. Blood poured from his countless wounds. His breathing had become ragged, yet somehow he still forced himself back onto his feet. Even standing at death's door, Fane stepped in front of Circe once again. Without looking back, he spoke one final time. "Finish the array." Then he charged forward, one arm, broken body, no hesitation. Albald and the elven archer attacked him together. Steel clashed, magic exploded. Fane fought alone against both enemies, using every last ounce of strength left inside him to buy Circe a few more precious seconds. Watching the battle unfold, despair consumed Circe. "We've come this far, but I can't go any farther." His body refused to move. His vision blurred. Every breath felt heavier than the last. "I've had enough. I just want to die." Then, another face appeared in his mind. Seth, his little brother, the one waiting for him to come home. Circe's trembling eyes widened. "What about Seth?" His chest tightened. "I don't want to die." His fingers dug into the dirt beneath him. "Even if I can't live, shouldn't he at least get the chance to?" That single thought gave him the strength to move. Slowly, painfully, he began crawling toward the unfinished array. Every movement left another trail of blood behind him. His arms trembled, his body screamed in agony, but he refused to stop. Finally, his shaking hand reached the final rune. Using the last of his blood, he completed the array. As the final symbol lit up, Circe closed his eyes. In his heart, he spoke to the one person he wished he could see again. "Seth, I don't think I'll be able to visit you anymore." A weak smile formed on his lips. "I hope you can forgive your sister for not being able to come back home." His vision slowly faded. "I'll always carry you in my heart." The completed array erupted with brilliant light. The hidden path was finally revealed. The mission was complete. Far ahead, beyond the trees, the magnificent gates leading into the kingdom of Eleanor finally came into view. Circe looked toward them with fading eyes. After sacrificing everything, after losing Maeve, Cole, and now Fane, they had actually done it. Their mission had succeeded. But before he could even process it, a terrifying surge of mana descended from the sky. High above the forest, Lance Aaliyah had sensed their presence. The moment she spotted the intruders, she reacted instantly. Without giving them even a chance to escape, she unleashed a devastating attack from above. A blinding torrent of magic crashed down toward the two Alacrians. The overwhelming force swallowed both Circe and Fane. Yet even as death rushed toward him, Circe smiled. Not because he welcomed death, but because none of it mattered anymore. Their mission had already been accomplished. The explosion engulfed the forest. When the light finally faded, both Fane and Cersei were gone. For them, it had not been too great a price. Because the path had been opened, the enchanted forests of Eleanor, the natural barrier that had protected the kingdom for generations, could no longer hide its people. Every Alacrian sentry who followed the completed array would now be able to trace the same route. One after another, they would guide the invasion force straight through the forest and directly to the heart of the Elven Kingdom. And even now, far beyond the Beast Glades, the Alacrian army had already begun its march. The invasion had begun. The full force of Alacria was advancing, and the true war was finally about to begin. The entire wall had transformed into a fortress preparing for war. Every soldier stood fully armored, weapons in hand, waiting for the order to march into battle. The atmosphere was tense, yet determined. No one spoke unnecessarily. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where an endless tide of corrupted mana beasts would soon appear. Throughout the city built atop the wall, civilians hurried to prepare for the worst. Merchants packed away their belongings. Shopkeepers pulled down their shutters and secured their stores. Families gathered their valuables and cleared the streets, knowing that if the wall were breached, these roads would become a battlefield. No one wanted to abandon their home. But everyone understood that survival came first. Meanwhile, the blacksmiths worked without a moment's rest. The deafening rhythm of hammers striking steel echoed throughout the fortress as sparks flew through the air. Every forge burned at full intensity while armor was repaired, blades were sharpened, and the soldiers received the final adjustments to their equipment before facing the enemy. High atop the massive wall, rows upon rows of archers stood in perfect formation. Each one had an arrow already nocked, waiting for the command to fire. Just behind them, the mages silently gathered, their mana already circulating through their cores as countless spells waited to be unleashed. Slowly, the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon. The sun began to rise, and with every passing moment, the enemy drew closer. Among the archers stood Ellie, bow in hand, Boo sitting faithfully beside her. She quietly unfolded the communication scroll Arthur had sent her earlier. Only a few words were written across it. "I'll be nearby. Stay safe." A small smile appeared on Ellie's face. She carefully folded the scroll before gripping her bow even tighter. She had promised Arthur she would prove herself. Today, she intended to keep that promise. Far below the wall, military encampments stretched across the battlefield. Thousands of soldiers stood assembled, ready to confront the corrupted beast horde head-on before it could reach the fortress itself. Inside the command tent, Arthur quietly stood alone. In his hand rested Dawn's Ballad. The once beautiful blade was now covered in cracks from countless battles. Arthur slowly examined the damaged sword. Despite its condition, he couldn't help but smile faintly. Even like this, it's still a better weapon than anything else I've ever used. His eyes drifted toward the stone embedded in his hand. The mysterious weapon hidden within his rune still refused to manifest. Arthur let out a quiet sigh. "I really wish you'd appear already." Standing nearby, Sylvie noticed exactly where his attention had gone. She smiled knowingly. Now would be as good a time as any. Arthur gave a helpless chuckle. "I was thinking the same thing." Before either of them could continue, a voice interrupted from outside. "Please excuse my intrusion." The entrance flap opened. A young woman stepped inside carrying several finely crafted swords. Captain Trotius Flamesworth looked toward her. "Come in." The young woman nodded respectfully. "I've brought the weapons you asked for, Father." Arthur's eyes shifted toward her. Trotius gestured proudly. "This is my daughter, Senior Flamesworth." He continued, "the master blacksmith of the wall." Hearing her name immediately reminded Arthur of something. He recalled walking through the marketplace with Tessia only yesterday. A little girl named Nat had excitedly run over, telling Tessia that her master had finished a new set of armor for her. Tessia had promised she would visit later that evening. So, Nat's master had been Senior Flamesworth all along. Arthur stepped forward politely. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Although his greeting was sincere, he couldn't ignore the irritation creeping into his thoughts. Tess clearly gets along well with Senior, but somehow, hearing the word daughter come out of Trotius Flamesworth's mouth is enough to annoy me. His opinion of the captain clearly hadn't improved. Trotius turned back toward Arthur. "Your timing couldn't be better." Then he smiled proudly at his daughter. "Senior is one of the finest blacksmiths in all of Sapin." He folded his arms confidently. "I'd even put her craftsmanship on the same level as the master smiths of Darv. Her control over fire attribute mana allows her to forge weapons very few others could replicate." Senior stepped forward and presented Arthur with a slender sword. "I heard from Tessia that you prefer thinner blades." Arthur accepted the weapon. As he carefully inspected its balance, Senior continued, "I know it isn't nearly as finely crafted as your current sword." Her eyes drifted toward the cracked Dawn's Ballad. but having a few backup weapons certainly won't hurt. Arthur gave the blade a few experimental swings. The sword cut smoothly through the air. Golden lightning briefly danced along its edge with each motion, leaving brilliant streaks behind every slash. Trotius and Senor silently watched his every movement, waiting for his verdict. After several more swings, Arthur lowered the blade. A small smile appeared on his face. Not bad. He nodded approvingly. I think it'll do just fine. Senor immediately bowed. I'm honored to hear that. Even so, Arthur noticed the faint disappointment she couldn't quite hide. No craftsman wanted their life's work described as merely not bad. Arthur smiled inwardly. I suppose pride in craftsmanship runs through the entire Flamesworth family, for better or worse. Setting the sword aside, Arthur turned back toward Trotius. Are the ground forces ready to advance the moment I give the signal? Trotius nodded without hesitation. They've all been briefed. Everyone knows the plan. Arthur gave a satisfied nod. Good. With that, he and Sylvie began walking toward the exit. Before they stepped outside, Trotius called after him. General Arthur. Trotius looked him directly in the eyes. Don't worry about us. We'll be waiting for your signal. A rare expression of sincerity crossed the captain's face. Just make sure you come back in one piece. He glanced toward the thousands of soldiers outside. Right now, your presence is what holds this wall together. Arthur silently acknowledged his words before stepping outside. Brilliant morning sunlight immediately washed over him. The cool breeze carried the scent of steel, smoke, and freshly turned earth. Then, a thunderous roar erupted across the battlefield. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers stood before him. The moment they caught sight of their lance, they erupted into deafening cheers. General Arthur. Lance Arthur. For Dicathen. Their voices shook the very ground beneath his feet. Arthur slowly looked across the endless ranks of warriors standing ready to fight beside him. Seeing the determination burning in their eyes, he couldn't help but think to himself, the army's morale looked strong, and with an enemy force, unlike anything they had ever faced, rapidly approaching, they were going to need every bit of that courage. Just as Arthur stepped forward to address the army, he suddenly froze. The confident expression on his face vanished in an instant. His complexion turned deathly pale. Because standing among the thousands of soldiers before him, he recognized a familiar face. His father. Arthur's heart nearly stopped. Father? His thoughts spiraled out of control. If father is here, then mother must be here too. His breathing grew heavier. And if mother came, then the twin horns are probably here as well. A wave of panic crashed over him. How? They were supposed to be in Black Ben's city, far away from this battlefield. That had been the entire reason Arthur felt comfortable coming to the wall. He believed his family would be safe. Instead, they were standing directly in the path of 20,000 corrupted mana beasts. For one terrifying moment, Arthur completely forgot about the army around him. All he wanted to do was fly down there, grab his father by the shoulders, and demand that he leave immediately. He wanted Reynolds to take Alice, the twin horns, everyone, and get as far away from the wall as possible. But he couldn't. Even as a lance, even as a general, he couldn't issue that order. Because the moment Arthur looked into his father's eyes, he understood. Reynolds wasn't standing there as Arthur's father. He was standing there as a soldier, as a man who had chosen to fight for his home, and if Arthur tried to stop him now, Reynolds would never forgive him. Sylvie noticed Arthur's trembling hands. Through their bond, her calm voice echoed inside his mind. Arthur, pull yourself together. The entire army is watching you. Arthur slowly closed his eyes. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to regain control. Then, instead of calling his father back, he raised his hand in a crisp military salute. Across the battlefield, Reynolds immediately returned the salute. The determination burning in his father's eyes never wavered. Then he smiled. Not the smile of a father reassuring his son, but the smile of a soldier telling his commander, "Leave this battlefield to me." Arthur's chest tightened. If everything goes according to plan, most of these soldiers will survive. His eyes remained fixed on Reynolds, and father is one of the strongest among them. That was all he could tell himself. It had to be enough. Just then, Sylvie spread her massive wings. In a brilliant flash of light, she transformed into her enormous dragon form. The moment the soldiers witnessed the black dragon towering above them, another deafening roar erupted across the army. The already soaring morale climbed even higher, but Arthur couldn't share their excitement. Instead, the true weight of the battle finally settled onto his shoulders. His sister, his father, his mother, the twin horns, every single one of them was here. Not just them. The lives of every man and woman standing atop the wall now rested on his decisions. The realization made his hands tremble. His mind drifted back to only a short while earlier. To the moment he and Tessia had first sensed the approaching beast horde. Arthur's expression had immediately darkened. "I'll warn everyone." Then he looked directly at Tessia. "You need to gather your teammates. You have a mission to accomplish." Tessia stared toward the distant horizon where the overwhelming presence of the beast horde continued to grow. "They're more than a day early." Concern filled her voice. "The people here aren't fully prepared. I should stay." Arthur gently shook his head. "That's exactly why I'm here." His voice was calm but firm. "You have your orders." Tessia hesitated only for a moment before nodding. "I'll gather my team and report to Captain Jesmaya before leaving." Arthur gave her an approving smile. "Good then." After a brief pause, he quietly added, "Be careful." Tessia stepped closer. Without warning, she grabbed Arthur by the front of his armor and pulled him toward her. Looking straight into his eyes, she smiled softly. "That's exactly what I was about to tell you, dummy." Before Arthur could respond, she kissed him. For just a brief moment, the war, the responsibilities, the fear, everything disappeared. When they finally pulled apart, Tessia lifted the pendant hanging around her neck, the necklace Arthur had given her. Smiling warmly, she whispered, "Remember our promise." Back in the present, Arthur rode atop Sylvie's back as they soared toward the incoming beast horde. The wind howled around them, yet Arthur remained silent. Sensing the storm of emotions inside him, Sylvie spoke through their bond. "Nothing has changed from the moment you decided to bring Ellie with us." Arthur didn't answer immediately. His hands remained clenched so tightly that they trembled. The weight of thousands of lives pressed down on him with every passing second. Finally, he let out a slow breath. Sylvie was right. The beast horde might have arrived earlier than expected, but the preparations had already been completed. His mother still carried the phoenix worm pendant. Ellie carried one as well. His sister also had the communication scroll that allowed her to contact him if anything went wrong. Everything had been planned as carefully as possible. Yet, something still felt wrong. Arthur narrowed his eyes. The timing, it's all wrong. The early attack, the sudden movements, none of it felt natural. What are the Alacrians really trying to accomplish? Before he could think any further, Sylvie interrupted him. "Arthur," her voice grew more serious. "Focus. You're about to enter the battlefield." Arthur slowly lifted his head. The endless beast horde finally came into view. Thousands upon thousands of corrupted mana beasts stretched across the landscape like a living ocean of monsters. The earth itself trembled beneath their march. Sylvie glanced sideways at Arthur. "Are you ready?" A faint smile appeared on Arthur's face. "Not nearly as much as you are." Far below, one of the gigantic mana beasts let out an earth-shaking roar. Standing atop its massive head was an Alacrian mage. The rider raised his hand high into the air. Then, he pointed straight toward the wall. "Advance." The monstrous horde surged forward. Arthur looked toward Sylvie. A confident grin finally returned to his face. "Why don't we give them a proper welcome?" Sylvie's golden eyes gleamed with excitement. "My thoughts exactly." She opened her jaws. A massive sphere of blazing energy rapidly condensed inside her mouth, growing larger with every passing second. The surrounding air began to distort under its overwhelming power. Then Sylvie unleashed it. The colossal blast tore across the battlefield like a falling star. It slammed directly into the front lines of the beast horde. A deafening explosion erupted. The ground split apart. Entire sections of the earth were blasted into the sky. Countless corrupted beasts were obliterated instantly, their bodies swallowed by the explosion before they could even react. Dust and fire engulfed everything in sight, and with that devastating first strike, the Battle of the Wall had officially begun.